This story begins with the protagonist saying that he had reincarnated in a fantasy world. On the ceiling, there were candle lights instead of LED lights. Looking around, the boy says that this was a world that lagged behind in terms of civilization compared to Earth in the future, mentioning that the house was quite rich. And for an orphan who had died from overworking, it was a decent place to live. There was another reason he thought he was born into a rich household, because that child's biological mother was very beautiful. Fortunately, it seemed there would be no problems in his love life. 3 years later, a boy appears standing on a chair, saying that he had seen the outside world from his window for the first time in his crib. The child, observing the view, is happy, saying that it was really something from another world. Then a maid appeared calling the boy, saying that the place was dangerous. In this reincarnation, he discovered that his family was part of the Grand Duchy, which was a well-known fact in the kingdom. The boy was the son of the Grand Duke in the Kingdom of Lionheart. At 8 years old, he began learning swordsmanship as a future knight. His master was a knight dismissed from the palace named Sir. The other man says he was sure it was the will of the goddess, and that it would be extremely rewarding to teach him, saying his name was Leon. Meanwhile, the protagonist asks the man to take care of him. At 14 years old, the boy seemed to be training, mentioning that it was child abuse. A sacred knight is truly a monster, besides it being extremely difficult to qualify as one. It is said that he needed to complete missions through training and should become a knight of the kingdom through his own experience, be chosen by the Holy Grail and take the holy water. On top of all that, as the son of Dragonia, the boy needed to master everything about how to become a Grand Duke. During a training, his master teaches him that he must always look at his opponent, lessons to become the successor of the Grand Duke, as well as train to become a sacred knight. Lying on the ground, the young man says that if God really exists, he would like to ask for salvation, but he did not believe in any religion. 2 years later, someone was looking for something in the rain. That was the protagonist saying he had wanted the world to be recognized by the goddess and become a holy knight after accepting his mission. In the middle of the night, a village is on fire while its residents cry out for help. At the village entrance, a man says there were many orcs, questioning if that would be their end. Facing the imminent battle, a man calls for the goddess to protect their lives. A scream is heard from behind the orcs, asking how those creatures dared invade the kingdom's territory. One of the orcs is cut in half by the sword belonging to the savior of that village. 4 years pass, and a protagonist has his first meeting with the goddess, who calls him by his name. Leon is surprised that the stories were true and that the beautiful lady was indeed a goddess. The young man receives a mission to prove his honor and faith to the goddess and accepts his mission. Some years pass, and after Leon works like a slave, he finally becomes a sacred knight. Right after becoming a knight, Leon defeats all kinds of monsters, orcs, goblins, and even the evil cult. Eventually, he becomes a war knight of the kingdom, massacring 700,000 orcs without mercy, including women and children. After that battle, the young man looks at the sunset with a sense of relief. Years go by, and His Majesty Lionheart died after a battle against the Archmen sent by the Empire. The orcs were already a big enough headache, but now there were some uncontrolled demons, and because of that, humanity needed to believe in the gods. Besides all that, the kingdom needed to elect a sacred knight to become the successor of King Lionheart, who died on the battlefield with honor. In the midst of all this chaos, the goddess descended to them and chose Leon as the successor to the throne. The brave knight accepts his position, but knew he couldn't disappoint the citizens and the knights who followed him. So he transplants the lion's heart, which was a sacred treasure of the goddess, promising thus to protect the Holy Grail. Thus he becomes the Grand Duke of Dragonia and the king of the kingdom of Lionheart. Many years pass, and there were great wars against the orcs. In one of them, a hunchback goblin evolved into an Archmen. In the midst of the battle, a knight calls out to Leon, mentioning that the Imperial Black Mage School was exposing experiments again. Then the protagonist asks to gather his knights. Again, many years pass, and a man seems to be irritated, saying that he had offered 3 million lives, begging to grant his request. That man was the emperor, who was about to sacrifice himself along with 3 million residents of the capital to fulfill his wish. The sacrifices were made, and an enormous creature emerged, letting out a loud roar. That creature was the Lord of Chaos, a result of all those offered lives. To combat this threat, Leon gathered the knights and took the sacred sword that still had grease from the orcs of his last battles. Fast forward to a place completely plunged into chaos and destruction. Meanwhile, someone is holding a rag doll while thinking about how they tried to end evil with holiness but couldn't stop the wickedness. A knight calls for Leon, who was kneeling there, holding that doll in his hands. Leon calls that man Sir Aaron and says that he could be proud because his father had died with honor. The man in turn agrees with that. Standing up, the protagonist orders the troops to look ahead, questioning if they were hearing the sound of the villains around the land, and of those who stole the lives of the people they loved. Therefore, they should hold on to hatred for eternity. Those fools deceived into thinking that victory was in their hands. As long as they had honor, they wouldn't lose. Drawing his sword, the protagonist says that it was for the goddess. In his thoughts, that goddess says she would be by his side until the end. Then Leon orders the troops to advance. That winter, a battle occurred against countless demons that filled the land. The slaves were used as shields while the civilians died with honor alongside the knights. Leon defeated the demons alone until the end, massacring countless demon lords, showing those bastards the power of a sacred knight. Again, many years pass and the winter hadn't ended yet, and Leon continues in battle. Countless years go by and the protagonist destroys the last demonic portal. There was no more place for those miserable demons to escape. Liam, with a threatening look, says that now they were trapped with him and had no other way out, and he would take their lives one by one. Several years pass again and Leon massacred those demons without any rest. Near a portal, a man was surprised that the boy had defeated the Archman with a single strike. Liam asks him to stand up because it wasn't time to give up and he should get up and keep fighting. The girl asks who he was. Leon says he was the king of Lionheart, the knight of the glorious knights who carried the will of the sacred temples. Showing his peace, he says his name was Leon Dragonia Lionheart. 300 years were needed for the boy to meet Earthlings. A system informs that the boy had none of that because he was over 300 years old and had defeated all the demons. A portal opened in the city of Seoul, and his rank was a different black. The Korean Hunter Association and the World Hunter Association requested that the nation's great guilds participate in the attack. However, the requests were denied because the portal's difficulty was unknown. In the end, the government ordered the Korean Hunter Association to enter first, which was almost an execution order. When they entered, the only thing the girl had seen was a naked man. Behind him, a bloodbath along with numerous bodies. While the girl was distracted, someone calls her name. A guy hands her a coffee asking if she was tired. The girl mentions that no one believed her, and the man says he expected that, because it was a black-ranked demonic portal where there was even an archman. Coming back alive without the guild's help was already a miracle, and defeating all the monsters is almost impossible, all because of just one naked man. Meanwhile, Leon saw the two talking. The girl, in turn, asks if he was a survivor of the portal, which is really a very silly question. There were two people who could live in the realm of the portal. The portals that appeared all over the world in the last 30 years had some similarities. The theme was a world on its way to destruction. Sometimes, some survivors managed to return to Earth, gaining incredible strength in the demonic realm. That's why the government does its best to meet their needs, creating plans to recruit them. Back to that little girl, she thinks they needed to recruit the boy at any cost because he was incredibly strong. The guy says that even an A-rank hunter needs to risk his life when facing a high-rank demon, but the protagonist had killed the Archman with one strike, a monster that the most skilled S-rank hunters feared. Not only did he kill it, but he also completely destroyed it. The girl says that everything would be fine, because from his voice he seemed like a good person. Then the protagonist lets out a big shout. The boy's voice is so powerful that it can even break glass. The girl is surprised because that glass was resistant even to monsters. Leon asks how she dared to stain the glorious name of Lionheart. The other guy asks what she had said before, and the girl says it was just a cultural shock. 15 minutes earlier, Leon was sitting in a chair next to a man. The boy thinks that it was strange. He had worked so much when he was 20 years old that he died of exhaustion. After that, he reincarnated in another world, becoming a knight for over a century. After conquering the demonic world, he went demon hunting for 200 years. In total, 300 years had passed, so it was a relief to have some memory of that place. The other guy starts stuttering when calling the boy. Calmly, Leon thinks it wouldn't be a good idea to say he used to be an earthling, ordering the guy to call him Majesty. The man wonders what that crazy person was talking about. Awkwardly, he starts calling him Majesty, and the protagonist thinks he went along with it, wondering if he was just a good-natured guy or if the government was cautious about survivors like him. Then the man says that the protagonist's world had come into contact with their hunters, asking if he was the one who had killed all those demons. The boy, affirming that it was him, questions if the man had forgotten that, for he had killed countless evil species protecting the honor of the knights, ordering the guide to be his temporary secretary, and he would allow him to record that glorious incident. Irritated, Leon says he was hungry, and the freaked out guy says he would call someone to prepare a meal immediately. Besides that, our boy also wanted to know more about that world, thinking he should find out what had happened while he was away. Stylishly, the bald guy says he would tell, mentioning that the nightmare had started 30 years ago. Portals began to appear around the world. From them, countless demons emerged. After that, they were in a state of emergency. After many lives were lost, they realized that the portals had a completion system. When a portal is left alone, the monsters invade the earth. Standing up, the bald guy says that the food was already ready. Cold and calculating, the boy thinks that it was different, because the demons that invaded his world came from the sky after a heavy rain. However, that place had portals with themes and missions, as if it were to train humans through tests. Returning to the table, the bald guy says the food was ready. However, Leon is surprised. Irritated, he observed the contents of that plate, a broth of boiled bones covered with salt and black pepper. When the boy was a worker on Earth, that was like soul food for him. People are doomed to like the foods they know they like instead of eating new foods, but Leon forces himself to swallow the accumulated saliva in his mouth, questioning what it was, and the bald guy responds that it was a food called sialeontang. The boy thinks that this food was known as the food of the commoners. Furious, our boy asks how he dared stain the glorious name of Lionheart, because he was serving a commoner's dish to a noble. The protagonist was royalty from another world, a representative of the goddess, guardian of the Holy Grail and the Sacred Lance. Leon was the man who had defeated Malice, the Lord of Chaos, the very incarnation of the 300-year war story. After all, he was just a returnee who used to be an Earthling. The first thing he thought when he returned to Earth after 300 years was that everything was in chaos. All this because there wasn't a proper religious faith, and enlightening the minds of the commoners was the duty of the royal family. Even returning to Earth, the boy was still a king. A while later, the bald guy brings a proper meal for the young man. The other man asks the girl to go talk to the protagonist, but she says she didn't know how to speak other languages. Then the guy says to go anyway because he had complimented her before, so at least he wouldn't kick her out. Entering where Leon was, the girl apologizes for bothering him while he was eating. Looking at the girl, he realizes it was that swordswoman from before. Without any ceremony, he asks her to sit down. Sitting in the chair, she asks if the meat was good, and the boy mentions that it wasn't bad because he could feel the chef's sincerity. Besides, the reason for being strict with them wasn't because the food was simple, but because of their attitudes towards a king. When greeting a member of royalty from a foreign nation, it is necessary to treat them with respect. Fearful, she apologizes, saying she didn't know. Leon asks what the girl's name is, and she replies that it is Han. Changing the subject, the boy asks if those creatures had appeared in that world. The girl in turn responds that yes, she had only one mission, which was to get the protagonist to join the Hunter Association. Then the girl asks to let the government take care of him from now on. The reason for the intelligence war in the 21st century was to search for survivors. No matter how much support was promised, they had to prevent them from joining other countries. Leon, in turn, asks if, while he was in that world, he would have to go to the battlefield. Being a knight, it would be fair to go and fight. However, a king cannot be a soldier in the army of another nation, and for that reason, he would create an order of knights in that world. Surprised by that, Hari could only accept. Sometime later, the girl asks what the superiors had said. Then the man says they accepted because they needed any possible support, and it was great that the protagonist had joined another country. Irritated, the girl says that all of this was the fault of the great guilds that kept flaunting money and power. At that moment, an alarm starts ringing. Looking at his phone, he realizes that a dungeon break had happened. Worried, the man thinks that if a dungeon break happened in the agricultural area, the demonic element could halt food production. And he was sure those bastards had a plan in mind, so they needed to stop it quickly. Inside that room, the protagonist heard the commotion. The boy had understood everything they said, assuming they were in trouble. Questioning if, when a dungeon break happened, the ground would get infected or the crops wouldn't grow, mentioning that his world didn't have that. An aura begins to envelop his body, and the protagonist asks if she was okay. Inside a church, a girl with a hood smiles. Meanwhile, a portal was opening somewhere. Near it, there was a group of hunters, and one of them was an S rank called Yongwon. Among them, that man, along with Han, was at the location. Irritated, the guy thinks that Yongwon had let the dungeon break on purpose. Because they did that, they didn't accept their request. The Phoenix Guild had been asking for a tax exemption on portal profits because they received a lot. They already had many benefits in a large guild like that, but just thinking that they had done that because they were rejected. Intervening in the situation, Han says they should close the portal as quickly as possible, and the guy says he knew that. However, he couldn't do anything because his guild members were injured, and it would be difficult to do a raid in that state. So they would try to do it tomorrow, but they didn't know what could happen. Then the girl says that they didn't want to help the country, saying that many things could happen. However, the man didn't care about any of that, saying that he had told her in last year's project. In that world, money and power commanded everything. Then another person appears, saying that the boy was very superficial. Han, in turn, is surprised, realizing that the protagonist was there. The boy asks them not to speak the name of a king so casually and only allow them to call him by his title. Looking at the boy, Yongwon says that he seemed to be from another country, but Leon orders him to shut up. With a threatening look, he asks how trash like him could address the protagonist. Apparently scared, the man wonders what was wrong with the protagonist because he had insulted an S-rank hunter without any problem. Starting to use magic, he asks the boy if he wanted to die, so Han asks him to stop, leaving the man surprised when he hears that the protagonist was a survivor. Bowing to Leon, Yongwon says he was rude, mentioning that he was from a guild called Phoenix, saying that perhaps the protagonist had come from a great portal. Confused, Leon asks what the problem was because he didn't know the details of the portal and should therefore give a brief summary, leaving the two happy because he would help them. Then the girl says that it was a dungeon break, and when one of those happened, a lot of demons would come out, infecting the land, where crops end up not growing. And the Honan Plains were an important place for cultivation, so the situation was very serious. The solution to the problem was to purify the infection and complete the dungeon as quickly as possible. Quickly, the boy asked them to call his army. Tomorrow, the moment the time limit for the monster attack ended, Leon would act personally. However, before that, the king of a foreign nation could not carry out a military activity in another territory as he wished, and for that, he needed the permission of the king of that nation. But Han says that it was okay to act anyway. However, Leon says that there are always rules and a proper procedure to follow. Seeing the orders the boy was giving, Yongwon thinks that the protagonist was worse than him. In the end, they just sent a message to the king, who was actually the president of the country. Apparently nervous, she says she did what the boy had asked, questioning how he would use that. The boy mentions that his land was infected and therefore needed to purify it. Confused, the girl asks if they would do that with just a straw doll. Entering a room, the boy asks if those were the women who had made the straw doll. The other thing Leon had requested was that the women who had made the doll should have already given birth. Then the boy asks to show the dolls they had made. Looking at a doll, Leon is disappointed, saying that it was impossible, asking who would call a deformed body like that a doll, then exploding it. Analyzing doll by doll, the protagonist doesn't find what he wanted. After looking at numerous dolls, a married woman catches the boy's attention, saying that it was incredible. Asking how many times she had given birth, the woman replies that it had been 12 times. Leon mentions that he would normally send knights with a medal as a gift, however he couldn't do that, asking for apologies. Sometime later, our boy was using that doll on a table, affirming that the conditions had been met. Taking a chalice, the boy places it in a magic circle, saying a prayer for the mother of that infertile land, saying that the people of that land were offering a harvest doll. Then light starts coming out of that cup. In a matter of moments, that cup begins to fill up, where it starts to overflow. A new day was beginning. However, the sun rising today would be a special beginning for that world. Yongwon is surprised, realizing that the water from the cup was entering the doll. That doll standing up calls the protagonist a child. Bowing, our boy greets the great mother of the land. Dear Damera, goddess of fertility. Then the doll says it had been a while since they last met, mentioning that the world was being invaded by evil and the land was contaminated. Affirming, the protagonist states that there were also evil species in that land but no deity in that place. So he supposes that those inferior pigs might end up turning her eyes. But the goddess says that greed cannot always be judged as a sin because it is one of the normal characteristics of immortal. When asked what the boy would do with that world, he ends up staying silent, saying that it wasn't difficult to blend in with the swordsman, but the authority of a conqueror is divine. So he will ensure that duty and authority go hand in hand in that world and will teach the ignorant the right way. The goddess, in turn, asks if the boy didn't have a request to make because she was already ready. Then Leon says that the inhabitants of that world were suffering due to an evil energy and asking to purify that land. Raising her arm, the goddess says that he was the leader of her temple and her champion. The land of that world is not from her body. So she will silver divinity in that place and replace that thirsty land with her body. And then everything in that land will be her ally. Amidst that land, a light dazzles even the sky. Everyone around was amazed by the power of that goddess. Leon tells them to look and learn ignorant ones who didn't even know how to educate themselves. From now on, that world will be blessed with her divinity, a newly born and prosperous place. That is a just duty of a living being. This fertile land is proof of her eternal promise. Observing that, Yongwon gets irritated, saying not to be deceived because those crops emerged with magic and therefore were poisonous. However, our boy says that the crops were blessed by divinity, questioning how he dared judge them as poisonous. Even so, the man continues to insult the goddess, calling her a stupid doll. With a threatening look, the protagonist says he forgives ignorance only once and therefore shouldn't stain his goddess with his words. Stopping talking immediately, the guy gets scared, not believing that was happening and his plans were almost being ruined because of that idiot. However, he couldn't let that happen and so he would expose his lies, saying that he still needed proof and hoped they would cooperate for the sake of the people who would eat that. So he would provide an evaluator. Using magic, the guy seems to analyze the crop. However, the man couldn't believe what he was seeing. Observing the statistics of that crop, he realizes it was of rare rank, blessed by the goddess of life. Moreover, it could cure third-degree diseases and even cancer. The people around are surprised by all of this. Then the guy asks someone to get a pot from the chef's house. A while later, that guy is tasting the food from that crop, not believing the flavor. Besides, all his statistics were improving. Disbelieving, the boy asks how mere rice could do all that. Nervous, Han says it was incredible information, so the guy asks her to at least stop chewing before speaking. Another person, while eating, says they received a boost in attributes. Desperate people start grabbing as much as they can from the crop because they could enter the portal stronger, and the knight's motivation had increased greatly. Then the goddess calls for the protagonist, who, with a soft tone in his voice, responds to her call. Answering that he had already fulfilled his duty, he mentions that he would return. Kneeling, Leon says he would never forget the love that was granted to him. Then the goddess says she would tell him one more thing, asking our boy to eat well. Right after, the doll returns to its previous state. Han, in turn, asks what that was, and the boy says it was the divine power of a goddess. Asking if there was no god in that world, the girl says she wasn't sure about that. Leon, in turn, says that a world and a proper life are made with divine power, so they should keep that in mind. Now that the soldiers were satisfied, they should immediately enter the portal. The other guy asked the guild master if it was okay because if they continued at that pace, his plan would fall apart. Irritated, Yongwon wonders where the protagonist had come from, thinking that if it weren't for him, the government would have to grant his wish, and therefore he wished the boy would die in the portal. But at the same moment, he seems to have an idea. mentioning that it wasn't a bad idea, saying that somehow that portal would be attacked. In that place, there was only one A rank, which was that girl, supposing the protagonist was just support, so he should be trash in combat. In other words, they would surely fail. Inside that portal, a hideous creature was crawling through it, one that couldn't be defeated with conventional methods. Then a system warns that the dungeon break was starting with a risk of death. Inside the portal, that group was prepared for battle. The protagonist says that most portals would close if they defeated the boss, liking the possibility of facing a boss. Looking down, he sees a skeleton, thinking they knew he had told them to conquer that dungeon as soon as possible, but there seemed to be more monsters than he thought. Then the girl mentions that as long as the boss was alive, those skeletons would keep regenerating endlessly. Leon supposes that dungeon must be one of the boss. At the same moment, a cistern window appears her hand, warning that a knight commander was advancing with his troops. Shortly after, a hideous creature was in front of them along with an entire army of skeletons. The other man asks if they should distribute the potions, then the other guy orders to distribute them to the higher ranks. And those with elite shooter skills should take care of the long-range mobs first, and those with shields should stop them. Then that army begins to attack. Realizing that those monsters were strong, the boy says those portals were indeed different. However, they weren't so difficult to handle for a B-rank guy like him. Looking back, the boy is surprised because those mere skeletons were using a magic circle to cast a spell. Calling the skeleton's attention, he asked it to cast the spell on him. The skeleton, finishing conjuring the spell, throws it toward that man. Recovering, the boy says it was just a scratch and didn't know how expensive the equipment had been. Above, the skeleton commander was in front of the man, quickly delivering an attack on the boy, who barely manages to defend. However, he is thrown very far away, falling to the ground completely knocked out without his weapons. The protagonist, in turn, calmly observed that battle. The other girl says they needed to save the manager. Besides, they needed to call for reinforcements. Meanwhile, that boss was massacring the other soldiers without any mercy. Han, in turn, begs the protagonist to help them. But the boy says a king never joins a small fight like that, so they should find a way to build their honor. And he couldn't believe the girl was trying to force him to help in a fight against those rotten skeletons. Nervous, the other girl questions what they should do. Realizing that the protagonist had no intention of helping, she thinks she should do something, saying she would take care of the boss on her own and the rest should help the allies of Manager Kim. As she advanced towards the skeletons, they noticed her presence. Then Han places her foot on a skeleton, jumping towards the boss and striking him. However, it has no effect. At that moment, the creature starts to glare at the girl. Surprised, she sees the monster throwing its head to block her vision. Then the boss throws Han away. In a matter of seconds, he advances towards her again, but that was Han's plan. She begins to prepare an attack with her sword, hitting the boss. The girl thinks that should be enough, but it still isn't enough. Then the creature is about to attack Han. A voice from the background says that her skill is impressive and he is sure she must have been a noble knight at some point in her life. That was the protagonist saying that he could mistake a great knight for a mere undead. So the King of Lionheart would give him the right to challenge him. Thus, there was no need for more casualties, for they would finish that fight with a noble duel between knights. Everyone around was surprised because Leon had challenged the boss to a duel, assuming that wouldn't work. However, the boss seems to understand what the boy was saying. Seeing that the boss had dismounted his horse, the protagonist mentions that he is honorable, so he cannot continue with his head down, saying he was sure the monster used a double grip and it wouldn't be a real battle if he used only one weapon. Han, nervous, warns that the creature won't die unless its head is cut off. But for the protagonist, that wasn't important, leaving the girl surprised, wondering how the boy would kill the boss. Then the young man mentions that what decides victory is a knight's honor. Approaching the boss, he says that the first knight of light and justice is summoning that honorable knight to a duel. In an instant, the boss advances towards the boy. However, with just one hand, Leon defends his attack. Then he makes a movement with his hand, throwing the boss's sword to the ground. Quickly, the knight retreats, striking again at the boy, and the protagonist mentions that his steps are very light, raking the boss's sword in half. Everyone around is surprised by the boy's skill. Han, apparently enamored, asks if they had seen that, for he had changed his balance of the guard's weight the moment the attack touched his blade. Besides, no one would ever try to do something so crazy. Pointing his blade at the boss, Leon tells him to try a second time. In his thoughts, the knight mentions that it had been a long time since he was treated as a knight and properly called to a duel. That was just a trick to avoid a difficult situation. Anyone would think that when hearing a suggestion to dismount the horse. Even so, to the boss, that was nonsense. The boy's posture was dignified, besides having the look of a veteran who had experienced countless battles. His eyes shone in search of honor and excellence. In a matter of seconds, the boss advances again towards the protagonist. With no effort, he blocks the attack again, telling him to try a third time. That boy was the pinnacle of an honorable knight, a king of knights who should be challenged and revered. So he didn't want to use his necromancy powers and wished to fight that man as many times as he wanted. As a knight and as a noble, just his blade against his, just like he used to duel against great knights. And when he walked the world with honor, mentioning that he had forgotten that feeling. Fallen to the ground, Leon says it was already the 10th time. saying his swordsmanship was becoming more precise, asking if he had recalled his past memories. Content, the boss mentions that the protagonist allowed him to relive his glorious days. Then the boy asks if he intended to continue being a knight, leaving the boss thoughtful about that, saying he had done horrible things during that period, going from fight to fight without a shred of honor. Kneeling to the protagonist, the monster says that if he could end his journey that way, there would be no greater joy. Liam, in turn, is pleased that the boss had regained his honor. Holding his head, the boy says he would pray for him, and if there was any god he believed in, he hoped that he would let his soul rest. With a smile on his face, he mentions that he wished to meet him again in the banquet hall of the gods. Then a warm light enveloped the two. As a consequence, that knight starts to disintegrate. As that happened, part of his face was revealed, with the young man seeming to be smiling, saying that glory should remain with the king of Lionheart. Sometime later, that guild had already left the portal. The other man is surprised because the protagonist had fulfilled what he had promised. Remembering the magic the boy had performed, Han says it could be some kind of divine power, thinking he could have used that ability earlier. Then Leon appears, saying that if he had used it earlier, that knight would have met his end as a necromancer. A knight must live by honor, and it comes through actions. Actions, in turn, come from willpower, and for that reason, that man receive a deserved end as a noble. Then the boy says he would take the spoils of war. Looking at the sword and that sphere, the two are surprised, mentioning that it seemed to have a lot of mana. However, Liam seemed to dislike it. Throwing the sphere on the ground, he mentions that it was trash. The other two are completely stunned by what the protagonist had done. Then the boy mentions that those kinds of items only bring chaos. With that, the portal mission was completed and the items were successfully recovered. Sometime later, Han was carrying a table with food, mentioning that it had been 4 days since Leon had arrived on Earth. However, in that short period, a lot happened. The first was that the protagonist had a problem paying taxes, saying that a king couldn't pay for that. So if he would buy 90% of those people's taxes, leaving the man surprised by that amount. Then the boy questions why they were worried about being hungry even though they were followers of the goddess. Next, Han says that the rice from before had an extremely high nutritional value, because it cost 150,000 won for every 80 kilograms of rice. Starting to glorify the goddess, the man asks how much money he would have if he gave 90% for the tithe. However, sometime later, the protagonist started causing more problems because he was demanding a luxurious bed, servants, and also a work of art he could admire. Because of that, Han had to look for 5-star hotels until 2 in the morning just to rent a suite. Managing to arrange it, the poor girl begs the boy to go to sleep. Returning to the present, that girl was at the protagonist's door asking to come in. Entering the room completely exhausted, she asks if Liam is okay, saying that it was time for his breakfast, and the boy asks if she had already eaten. Responding that she hadn't, the boy says she shouldn't skip meals. Observing the protagonist's food, she mentions that it looked good, thinking she would eat a hamburger later. The boy, in turn, asks the girl to sit down. Content, she thinks Leon wanted to share his food with her. Then the protagonist questions what she was doing. With a threatening look, he observes the girl, questioning what she was doing instead of ensuring his ribs were safe to eat, but she says she thought the boy had shared with her. Liam, in turn, asks in which country a king would share food with commoners. Sometime later, Han says that the Hunters Association had decided to help with a place to live. It wouldn't be as good for a king, but at least it was comfortable. Our boy, in turn, says he couldn't demand much as a guest, and therefore he would leave those matters to her. Han's about to talk about the spoils of war, but the boy says he had already told her to take care of that. However, he liked the boss's cape, so he wished to keep it. Shortly after, the two arrived at building, and Han mentions that the place was near the Hunters Association, asking the boy if it was to his liking, but Leon remains silent. Observing a statue, he wonders what it was. Arriving at the door of the place, a person seems to notice the protagonist's arrival. Han, thinking it should be a secret, asks who that person was. With a devilish smile, the man says he was from the Dujung group. Then the girl thinks that it was one of the 3 largest monopolistic groups in the nation, asking why one of the directors was waiting for them. Observing the protagonist, the man seems to be plotting something. Approaching the boy, he says he must be that famous survivor, saying it was a pleasure to meet him. Then Leon, all CHAD, asks if a mere merchant wanted a handshake with a king. Sometime later, Han was presenting the room where Leon would stay for a year, saying that the association would take care of his rent and also the bills, so he didn't need to worry about anything and could feel at ease. The girl thinks it was a relief because the information about survivors was super secret. And in a situation where the man's intentions were unknown, it was a relief that the protagonist had ignored him. Asking what the reason could be for him to go after the boy, Leon asserts that there was only one thing a merchant could desire. They were probably trying to profit in some way from the young man. Then the girl says he could be after that rice. Due to the urgency of the situation, control over the information wasn't very good. So a streamer had recorded about those crops, and the government ordered him to delete that post. But when looking at the phone, she realizes the man had posted it again. In that video, Leon was shown as a god blessing that crop. Meanwhile, the man the protagonist had ignored was insulting him, asking if the effects of the rice were real and if there was any guarantee because they had only tested it on rats so far. But the other girl says that to know about the rice, they should know the field's owner. And recently, a dog on the verge of death had recovered in seconds out of nowhere. Moreover, people with chronic inflammations and sinusitis felt better immediately after consuming that rice. Even if there wasn't information about tests on humans, the effect of that rice was clearly real. The man, irritated, questions how the protagonist dared to call him just a merchant. Then the girl says they should get their hands on that rice anyway, mentioning that it had unlimited power. Irritated, the guy says Leon was getting arrogant just because he had that rice and had messed with the wrong person, mentioning that the boy was like other survivors, those who think the world they live in is the best, so he would dominate him with a cultural shock. After returning to Earth, Leon had set 3 goals in his mind. The first was to spread faith and divinity across Earth. There were many gods and followers there, but no divine power. A god should embrace faith by blessing that world, but instead, humans are sickening the lands, which become contaminated as a consequence. To use divine power, a new faith was necessary, therefore people needed to believe in it. The second goal was to reform the knights. In that world, there wasn't an organization of warriors who used divine power. And if the king of Lionheart is considered a demigod, then the Templar Knights would be saints, God's knights who use divine power to bring terror to evil people. And the final goal was to massacre all the evil lurking in those lands, reclaiming divine power and raising the Templar Knights. One of the reasons for spreading faith was to maintain balance and order within the pantheon to obtain Templar Knights. But that didn't matter because he needed to fulfill his duty. Then Han calls for the protagonist, saying that someone wanted to have a meeting with him. But the boy says there was no reason to attend to them. Then a group of people appears in the boy's quarters, thanking him for allowing a meeting with them. With an apparently displeased look, the protagonist observed them. The other man thinks it was for business so he could bow to the boy. Taking a box, he says he'd brought a gift for him. Asking Leon to accept, the man thinks the boy would be surprised by the content of the suitcase. It was a high-rank item that a person like him could never have, and after trying it, he wouldn't be able to go back. Our boy then accepts the gift. Irritated, the guy wonders about the young man's reaction because it seemed like he was doing him a favor. Liam, still sitting in the chair, asks Han to open the gift. Taking the suitcase, it opens by itself instantly. Inside, there were elite weapons that were the pride of the man's group, so he could choose the one he liked the most. Those are some of the only unique rank items in the world, and since Liam is going to become a hunter, it would be very helpful to have one of those. Han thinks the guy was giving away those weapons for free, which even money couldn't buy. But our boy, all Chad, asks where he could use those low-rank weapons. For there was no way to make a beautiful sword without the aura of the stars or a divine blessing. Confused, the man wonders what the young man was talking about. Leon says he was being dishonest, and the man says it was a misunderstanding. The boy says those weapons were good only for killing animals, but he would give them a chance. The man's group, observing the protagonist drawing a sword from a magic circle, is surprised, questioning if that was all they had, stating that he was underestimating their weapons. Looking at Han, the boy asks if she wanted to test one of those weapons. Realizing that the protagonist did not seem to mind, she accepts the offer. Taking the sword, the girl thinks that she had admired it for 4 years, the sword of the master craftsman Park called Dawn. The girl could feel its power, and indeed, it could absorb solar energy. Questioning if she could use it, the protagonist says she should not worry about using a toy. Quickly, she imbues the sword with fire, striking it against the boy's sword. However, one of the swords ends up breaking in half. Everyone around is surprised by what had happened, because the sword that broke was precisely Han's. Leon says it was as he had predicted because those swords were a waste of time. So people shortened the meeting time and now they only have 3 minutes. Discontent, the man is surprised by what had happened to his sword. With no choice, the guy reveals his intentions, saying he wanted to patent the rice grains, so they would pay a fee to the young man. According to his calculations, that rice was worth around 180 billion won, but he was lying because it was worth much less. But it didn't matter because there was no way the protagonist could know the amount of that money, and he would go crazy when explaining how much it was worth. Leah, in turn, questions if the man wanted to buy his rice with money. Then the guy says that's exactly it, and he would just have to sign a contract saying that the Dujong group would have a monopoly over everything. However, without even letting the guy finish speaking, our boy calls him an idiot. With a threatening aura, he asks if he dared insult the deity. Observing that immense aura, the boy is completely intimidated, even thinking about the possibility of dying. Leon, in turn, says the boy had just confessed his sins. Kneeling with tears on his face, he says he didn't know where he had gone wrong. Removing his aura, the protagonist asks how ignorant they could be. The harvest they were talking about was created on the lands blessed by his goddess. She gave that blessing as a reward to the farmers who sweat working in the field. So it wasn't something that could be bought with money, and the only thing they needed as payment was gratitude and faith. However, their infrastructure only sought profit above others. Questioning why the man wanted the divine products of a goddess he didn't even believe in. Sometime later, Han asks if it was okay to let him leave that way, because that man had a great influence, but for Leon, it wasn't worth worrying about because he wasn't the type of person who would be affected. Changing the subject, our boy asks if what he had requested was ready. Han in turn questions if the young man was planning something, and if it were him, things would end up being easier. But the boy asks if she thought it would be him who would take the test, saying he was going to look for useful soldiers to test it, but Han says that's impossible. Even so, Leon tells her to make it possible, leaving the poor girl completely shaken. Meanwhile, somewhere else, a person asks if the boy had gone to that place that year. Then a man says it had been a long time, calling the gentleman manager Kim. The man in turn supposes he was there for the retest, saying that surely the boy worked hard. Questioning how he was doing that year and if he would manage to rank up that time, then the boy says he would do his best. The gentleman asks if he didn't want to join his group. The man thinks that even those without talent end up entering rank C, but he had been stuck in D for 10 years. Manager Kim says he was very hardworking and was sure the boy would become an ace very quickly. However, the man still wished to continue trying to become a hunter because he couldn't give up on his family. Looking to the side, Manager Kim questions if that was a foreigner. Leon, fully dressed, arrives at the place and the people around admire him. Then a person calls the boy. It was Manager Kim, questioning who he was in another language. Irritated, Leon asks who he thought he was talking to, completely ignoring the poor gentleman. Leon looks back and stares again at the other boy, who is intimidated by the protagonist's presence. Manager Kim questions if there was something wrong with him. But the boy is completely immobilized, wondering what that was, because he couldn't breathe and it was as if the man was controlling him. Then someone seems to call a number. It was the number of the man from before, and the girl asks the boy to go to the interview room. Noticing the man leaving, the protagonist still watched him in silence, thinking that he hadn't gone to that place to look for strong people, but still didn't have a single person capable of becoming his soldier. Therefore, it was a pity, and in the first place, the people who took those tests were hunters who had recently awakened. Then that girl calls the number that belonged to the protagonist, who was thinking that he couldn't expect great things right from the start. Sometime later, our boy enters a room. Looking at the young man's number, the guy asks if his name was Lionheart, and the protagonist orders him to call him Majesty. Soon after, the man asks him to place his hand on that device. However, Leon thinks that it is very stupid, asking how a commoner dared to try to test the honor of a knight, but the guy says that only knights and gods can measure the power of a knight. Leon in turn questions how a machine tries to test the honor of a knight, and the man wonders why the boy had come to that place. The protagonist says he had come to that place to find useful soldiers, but even the judges of that place were useless. Mentioning that he hadn't liked anyone, he asks what the next test would be, and the man says it would be a portal test. Inside the portal, the man says they were usually closed, but a few remain open in situations like that. The other guy thinks that this year's evaluations were different from the past, so he needed to have good results. A girl next to him asks if that place didn't seem very popular. Then another gentleman appears, saying that place was very good. However, when he looks back, he seems surprised by something, noticing that the foreigner from before was also in that place. Considering his age, the guy assumes the protagonist was probably also a rookie, wondering if things would be okay. Then the group gathers, saying they should introduce themselves before defining their positions. That guy introduces himself, saying he was just a warrior and his main position was a dealer. The other also introduces himself, saying he had awakened that year and used his spear. Consequently, the girl also introduces herself and primarily used daggers. Apparently discontent, the boy thinks they were rookies who hadn't even discovered their main weapons, asking if they at least went to the training center. Convinced, the guy says they had attended one for 3 months, so the man was now sure they were rookies. The other gentleman says that it was his 15th year, his name was Gangtae, and his weapon was a gauntlet. Observing the gentleman, the man thinks he had little experience compared to his age, and his weapon would be difficult to compensate for the distance of a sword. Looking at the protagonist, the boy asks if he was a foreigner and if he knew how to speak Korean. The boy, in turn, seems to analyze the situation, saying that he didn't know how to fight because he couldn't use a sword made to hunt dragons to kill a chicken. Surprised, the man wonders where the boy had learned to speak Korean. In that test, people just needed to hunt 50 kobolds. Sometimes a null appears in the field, so if he thought the situation was very dangerous, he would interfere. Nervous, the boy still thought that the exam wouldn't go well. Minutes before that, the man asks if the protagonist hadn't brought a weapon. Then the other girl says he could use her weapon, handing him a bow and arrow, saying he could return it later. However, Leon doesn't like that attitude. Throwing the bow on the ground, the young man says a knight doesn't use long-range weapons. Returning to the present, that guy thinks that the test would surely fail. Taking the lead, he says he knew that place, suggesting going there to hunt. Then everyone agrees to go along with the man. However, the other guy says he had seen a village at the end of the field, and there could be many monsters in that place. But the man says it wouldn't be a good idea to go to a place like that with such a small group, and it was almost impossible to get out once they were surrounded. So they would hunt kobolds that live in caves and would set fire to the grass and leaves nearby to smoke out the kobolds. As a result, they would be able to kill the kobolds inside more easily, so the two were surprised by the boy's experience. But the guy thinks that wasn't something to be proud of, mentioning that he had studied all kinds of raid methods alone with a desire to one day enter a high-rank portal. Even so, the only one he had ever entered was that one, so he needed to be promoted that time. Then the other guy seemed desperate. Looking ahead, he notices a group of kobolds surrounding them. Quickly, they start advancing towards the group, which begins forming their defense. In the middle of the battle, the man thinks that it was easy and that they were very stupid. Therefore, it would be easy if they kept coming in a straight line. Then the girl tells the boy to pay attention. However, it was already too late because a kobold was already advancing towards him, grabbing the man and ends up knocking him to the ground. However, the other boy arrives to help him, ordering them not to let their guard down because although they were weak, they were extremely fast. Meanwhile, the battle continued. That old man, despite his age, seemed to have a lot of energy to defeat those monsters. Content, the other guy says they just needed to keep up that pace. Sometime later, the battle ends and the protagonist group successfully annihilates those monsters. The other guy apologizes for what he had done, but the boy says it was okay because it was his first time, saying that they had done a great job. The man in turn thinks that at first he was a bit nervous, but that group wasn't bad after all. However, looking at Leon, the boy thinks it was except for one person, asking why the boy hadn't done anything while they were fighting. Questioning if it was okay for him to do that, then the guy says he would take that into consideration when evaluating. Then the man tells them to keep going because they were almost at the cave. Sometime later, the group arrives at their destination. Grabbing some straw, they place it at the cave entrance. About to light it with his lighter, Leon asks if that was really the best he could do. The guy says he had used it 3 times before and succeeded in all. Leon in turn questions how he could rely on his experience when he had so little. However, irritated, the guy says the protagonist was younger, so he didn't have more experience than him. Lighting the straw, the guy says they should regroup because the kobolds inside would come out in moments. Noticing they were coming out of the cave, the group forms their defense. Then a huge group starts coming out of that cave. As a result, the group starts attacking non-stop. Convinced, the boy thinks his plan was working, and that way, they would get rid of all the monsters. However, the boy starts hearing a frightening sound. Among the trees, a kobold captain appears, and the guy thinks that monster was at least rank C. Questioning why that creature had to appear just now when he was about to rank up. Starting to run, the boy thinks they needed someone experienced on the team, and someone inexperienced going after a captain was suicide, asserting that the boy might be a rookie, but he should still believe in him. However, that boy, observing the monster, becomes paralyzed. Quickly, the kobold advances towards him. The boy, in turn, remains motionless, and the guy orders him to pull himself together. But it doesn't help, and the young man ends up getting hit. Observing, the association employee questions why he was motionless since he had said he would help if things got dangerous. Because if it continued like that, the boy might end up dying. Then, without thinking, the boy advances towards the kobold, using his shield to defend the young man. Quickly, that monster attacks them again. However, he manages to defend with his shield. Again, the boss advances towards him. In a defensive position, the boy wonders if he can really defend, supposing that if the other boy pulled himself together, they might have a chance. Then a voice in the background says that the young man had done well. Next, someone grabs the boss's weapon with just 2 fingers. It was the protagonist asking him to try again. Observing Leon, the boy is surprised by what he had done. Leon, in turn, asks him to raise his shield and try facing the kobold again. However, that boy is still confused by what had happened, and the protagonist tells him to block the attack and review. Nervous, the young man questions if Leon didn't understand the situation because at this very moment they were in danger. Then Leon asks if he dared challenge him after witnessing his abilities, because it was already an honor for a king to instruct a common soldier and yet he hadn't thanked him, ordering him to raise his shield again and block the attack. Then that monster starts going after the protagonist, who in turn with a threatening look stares at that boss, asking if he wanted to die. Then the boss ends up getting scared. Quickly, he attacks the other boy who manages to defend, thinking that his shield almost broke. But Leon says he was using his shield, asking how he could fight using only his strength, so he shouldn't face a stronger enemy that he could handle, questioning how he could succeed in battle just by defending, so he should use his head to think of a strategy. Kicking the boy's leg, Leon tells him not to look away, and the boy thinks he would have died if he had blocked that attack head-on. Leon in turn says he could do better than that. Hearing what the protagonist had said, he wonders if he had some kind of potential even though he was only a rank D, but that was completely impossible. But still, he affirms that this time he could manage. Then the boss charges again. Determined, the boy says he would manage, where he defends the monster's attack, creating an opening. Happy, the man says he had succeeded, but at the same moment he gets kicked by the creature, who ends up falling to the ground and knocked out. Leon asks why he couldn't see everything around, so he still had a long way to go. Sometime later, that test was already over. Returning to the protagonist, talking to a gentleman saying that there was no way a warrior like him could be just a mercenary. Kang Hyuk in turn says he used to wear that mask to disguise his face and body, mentioning that the protagonist had participated in the evaluation, asking if he had achieved anything. But the boy says he hadn't, mentioning that there was at least a possibility of getting a soldier. Besides, he didn't mean to be anxious because he intended to go to another continent. Surprised, the gentleman says the boy already knew what he was thinking, so he was a little nervous because Leon's power was incredible. Therefore, earlier he was impressed because even though it was a rank D dungeon, that was a boss of at least rank C. and the protagonist had treated it as if it were a mere toy. But for our boy, it wasn't even worth calling it toy. Then the gentleman mentions that if the boy was interested in creating a guild, he could certainly help him. Because when you want to establish an organization of people, the most necessary thing is to have fame, and there weren't many ways to achieve that in that era. Mentioning that there was a portal and it turned red because of an incomplete raid, and for a year, no one managed to finish it, even if it was to destroy or to get the Jewel of Wisdom, guarded by a boss called Jagged. Meanwhile, in another place, a red portal is activated, and a group of adventurers enters it. Observing around, they notice that place had a modern civilization that perhaps could be more developed than Earth itself. The other girl says it could be cool if it were a portal to another world, and the other guy says they needed to review their plans to start the group's organization. Looking to the side, he says they would use that building as their base as it was very tall, they could have a good view around. Inside that building, the man asks if the boy was seeing anything, and the boy says he couldn't see any enemies. Then the guy thinks that was very strange because a big city like that should have many monsters or even people. Supposing that could be a good thing because they wouldn't need to face any resistance army or something like that. Calling the group, he asks them to pay attention to what he's going to say, mentioning that they had already entered the portal some time ago but still hadn't found any information about that boss, so they should keep an eye on the surroundings and should choose a team to map the area. But in a matter of seconds, the poor man is hit by a laser beam. Then a kind of machine appears advancing towards the group. Again, that creature fires at them, destroying part of that building. Desperate, the group starts to flee. The other guy thinks that one of his companions was an A-rank tanker, and even so couldn't handle that monster, wondering what that creature was made of. Mentioning that if it continued that way, they could end up dying, asking if they had already found the enemy's location. Then the girl says that building wouldn't hold out for long, and the man orders them to retreat. Quickly, the group starts to leave that building. The girl asks what they would do with the guild leader's body, and the guy says they would retrieve it later, asking her to go ahead and check the exit. Then the girl states that she didn't feel anyone's presence, supposing the exit was safe. But when she steps out, she seems surprised by something. Grabbing her neck, she wonders why it was itching. In a matter of seconds, the poor girl ends up turning into pieces of meat. Reaching the door, the other boy notices several wires in the building. Realizing they were all around the city, they wonder how long they had been there. Drawing his sword, he asks them to cut those wires, mentioning that they should infuse mana into their weapons because those wires were not normal. Meanwhile, a creature was watching that group. Quickly, it uses a kind of wire to attack the man. At the same moment, that place ends up exploding. Amid the destruction, that boy was still alive but missing an arm. Furious, the young man tells the creature to show itself. From the rubble, it appears before the boy. Surprised, the boy asks if it was Jagged. Then an unknown voice questions what he thought. Irritated, the poor man says it had killed his companions. However, without any remorse, it says it had indeed done that. In a matter of moments, it slices the boy, saying it was to protect its city. As a result of that raid, no one survived, and the raid difficulty was increased to red rank. So the raid was paused indefinitely. Meanwhile, somewhere else, a boy says the weather in that place wasn't as bad as when he had seen it in a video. The other guy says they would do as agreed and keep the Jewel of Wisdom. As for the rest of the rewards, they could keep them. Then the system informs that the portal had been occupied by one of Korea's top 10 guilds called Golden Nan. And the group leaders were a guild master named Jungcheol, the vice leader named Yeonha, and the last one named Thisun. Lastly, it was the protagonist's servant. Sipping tea, Leon says it wasn't bad, asking what it was called. The girl says it was called barley tea. Then all the members of that portal are introduced, and the fourth team's raid operation is initiated. Meanwhile, the group had already set up camp near that city. Han, in turn, says she was worried about what would happen in the coming days, supposing that the best-case scenario would be for things to go well without the protagonist intervening in the situation. But if that didn't happen, Leon could become famous. Then Leon says that if the King of Lionheart doesn't need to intervene in the situation, it doesn't mean the situation isn't bad. Questioning what she thought a monarch's duty was in his kingdom, then Han asks if it was to govern. The protagonist says that was obvious and anyone could do that unless the person was arrogant. Again, the girl asks if it was as the King of Knights, recalling that Leon only intervened in the situation when the attack couldn't be blocked. Then our boy says that the reason for being a king was to be the last fortress, mentioning that the fact the king needed to intervene was already a shame for the knights, and that meant the situation was extremely serious. And unfortunately, Leon would have to do it again in place of weak people like them. However, Han says that group had S-rank people as well as mages, so it would be fine. Leon, in turn, admits they were stronger than normal people, but still, they didn't know a real war, mentioning that they seemed very confident even though they had only encountered the enemy 3 times. Questioning how they could call that group an attack team without even analyzing the monster's patterns and responding accordingly. A general should know how to respond according to the situation, and there was no pattern in that. And from what he had heard before, the boss was a talented warlord. Then a flashback appears of a girl apologizing to a machine, saying that it was her end, questioning if it could at least do her a favor one last time. And her last command was to eliminate all unidentified beings that invaded that city. Following the orders, that machine begins to attack that group. With its infrared vision, it observes its targets, firing a kind of laser beam at them. A group of people watch their companions die, asking what that creature was. Meanwhile, that monster seems to be charging another attack, and his system warns that energy was being charged. Then at the same moment, an adventurer appears to intervene in the situation, hitting the boss with his hammer. The system warns that the main part was damaged, and as a result, the internal pressure increased. Therefore, it should eliminate the unidentified being. But the guy says it was too late to try that. And at the same moment, another adventurer appears, attacking that monster again. And the other guy says he could handle the rest. The system warns it was getting overloaded and therefore would start an emergency repair, asking for permission to use restricted resources. Observing that guy from before, the system alerts that the man was a priority to be eliminated. Then the boss begins to flee. The other guy says he will activate a distortion force field. Next, an explosion happens, and that machine still seems to be functioning. The other guy mentions that the trajectory of those bullets was different, and the boy says it was a tool to fight against that machine. The system, in turn, warns that an abnormal phenomenon was observed, observing the city, analyzing each point, ordering to shoot at the respective places. And at the same moment, that man ends up being hit by something. Surprised, the other guy thinks that the machine had already calculated the angle at which the bullets would be deflected, wondering what that creature was. Desperate, the other man asks to deactivate that distortion field because it was very difficult to predict the direction of its bullets. Then the man says he will do that, asking to run when the barrier falls. About to undo the barrier, another guy asks them not to move. At the same moment, several wires surrounded that place, leaving the group surprised, thinking that the machine was not just fleeing but surrounding the entire area, questioning when it had managed to do all that. Quickly, that creature begins to prepare another attack. Desperate, the other man asks how that had happened, because they had gathered in that place because of that force field, but it had been a complete mistake, and therefore they wouldn't be able to dodge that attack. Then the system informs that the charge was complete, activating a countdown to launch the attack. At the same moment, a horse begins to approach those wires, which with its teeth easily breaks them. An unknown person says it had been a long time since they had met, and that was the protagonist stroking the horse. Riding it, the boy asked them to listen to what he had to say. Observing that creature, he says he would grant the glory of having a duel with him, and that desperate group questions if the boy was crazy. Then the system informs that it had established an acceleration in that cannon and its threat was level 0. Meanwhile, Leon, along with his horse, advances towards that machine. Then the boss fires his attack. Determined, the protagonist says that a true knight is not affected by long-range weapons. So without any fear, he goes towards that attack, which he easily manages to dodge, attacking that creature. During that moment, Jad's calculations stopped working, for it was unable to understand what was happening in front of it. The machine had evaluated that situation, assuming the weapon was just a normal spear, a level 0 threat that wasn't even worth doing anything because it would be killed by the cannon immediately. But 3 seconds before, a shout from the specimen created a thin barrier, a different pattern from the abnormal phenomena already recorded. 2 seconds before, there was a direct collision between the bullet and the enemy cannon. That impact should result in the protagonist's death even if he blocked it. But 1 second before, that bullet was easily deflected, and there was no direct collision or blocking of the projectile because it had simply been deflected. That was an ability that was as easy for the knights as breathing, a miracle possessed by the strongest warriors of humanity. It was like a way to impose rules on that world. Returning to the present, the protagonist attacks that creature, throwing it far away. The system informs that it was unable to understand that phenomenon. Among the rubble, that monster was still standing. Again, the system warns that the enemy's threat level was drastically increased to level 5, suggesting abandoning the battlefield. Suddenly, the machine starts to flee the place. Leon, observing that situation, is disappointed, because that boss had just fooled with its tail between its legs. Then a flashback appears of that girl calling the machine Yappy, asking it to protect that place and not let anyone approach. Inside a hideout, that monster was recovering for the battle. Then the boss recovers, returning to the battlefield. Meanwhile, one of the groups was walking through the city. Observing from afar, a boy mentions that among one of the buildings there was a machine gun patrolling the area, ordering the long-distance dealers to cross the building near the boss and the rest to stay because they would distract that creature. But when he looks back, his companions had already turned into mincemeat. Desperate, the poor boy asks what had happened, looking for the location of that machine. Nervous, the boy swore it had been by his side not long ago. Meanwhile, Yappy was watching him with its infrared vision. In a matter of seconds, it reduces the boy to just blood, and the system informs that the elimination of unidentified beings was completed. On the other side, there was another person running desperately, falling on a tombstone, begging the creature not to kill him because he didn't want to die. Even so, without any mercy, the monster advances towards the poor boy. However, when it looks at those tombstones, it remembers its creator, saying that soon she would be buried there just like the others. Therefore, it should protect that city with all its might. Then the system repeatedly warns that it should have logical reasoning, ordering the elimination of that invader. The poor boy observing the situation is confused, wondering if that monster would let him live. At the same moment, Yappy jumps out of that place. The other man asks if the boy is okay, and the boy assumes that the machine was tired because instead of killing him, it spared his life. Therefore, it must have fled when it realized they were coming towards it. Then the other man says that place seemed like a cemetery, stating that it was too clean compared to other places. Meanwhile, the boss walks through the city. The system informs that the enemy force's chance of victory was 93% and therefore it should retreat. Returning to the group, the other guy says that place was very unpleasant and they should leave. Again, the system warns that it had made a final decision to protect the citizens even if they were dead. Sometime later, Yappy returns to that hideout. The system informs that there were still 49 enemies to be eliminated. Then an unknown silhouette observes that creature, saying that it had finally found it. Then the protagonist, looking Chad, appears asking if it had fun with those commoners. Leon values honor. For this reason, it would not be an exaggeration to say he was the embodiment of nobility, hating any kind of ambush. More than anything else, he always sought a fair battle, and it was clear that this did not mean the opponent would also play fair. However, that was no reason for him to abandon his values as a knight, and the embodiment of nobility let nothing break his momentum. This was what made Leon an extremely strong person. That's why he was the chosen one. Observing Yappy, the protagonist remarks that he shouldn't expect honor from a mere machine. The robot then begins to check its equipment. Soon after, it starts firing at the protagonist, who defends himself with his shield. At the same instant, Yappy vanishes, beginning to run all over the place, where it ends up launching some missiles at Leon. Watching all of this, the boy simply smiles, successfully defending against all those attacks. The machine then seems surprised by what it had witnessed, and suddenly, a giant sword appears. The protagonist, mounted on his horse, grabs the sword and charges at the robot. In response, Yappy leaps, starting to fire multiple projectiles at the young man. However, none of that seemed to have any effect. Shortly after, the machine appears to begin retreating, bumping into various parts of the city. Its system alerts that this situation was entirely incomprehensible, questioning how such a specimen could have such speed. In the middle of the city, Yappy comes across a lamppost. It grabs it, saying it would initiate a massive attack. However, Leon did not back down because of this and kept advancing toward the robot. As a result, the two collide, and their attacks end up canceling each other out. Observing this, Leon comments that the robot hadn't done badly. Once again, Yappy starts firing several projectiles at the protagonist, who successfully evades them all. Shortly after, Leon seems to signal to his horse. Then, out of nowhere, it starts climbing the falling rocks. As a result, he gains an altitude higher than that of the robot. Yappy still has 68 projectiles remaining and proceeds to fire them all, using its final rounds as a last-ditch attack. However, it still wasn't enough, because Leon manages to strike the robot, leaving only half of his body intact. The system alerts that a lethal blow occurred and the operational limit had been exceeded. A flashback of its master appears, saying that what was sealed in that place should never be released. Immediately afterward, the robot begins its self-destruction process. A massive light engulfs the entire city, detonating all the explosives from the golden landfill facilities. A gigantic explosion occurs. When the robot opens its eyes, it finds itself inside a storage container reeking of oil. A man tells it to go protect the city, saying it must fulfill its duty. At that instant, the man is attacked by something mysterious and ends up killed. A giant eye is then revealed, watching the robot. At the same moment, it is struck by multiple shots. The system alerts that there is only one objective: to help all its allies. Thus, it must protect them. The city's defense should begin, and as a result, the robots head to the city immediately. They defeat all the enemies and in doing so become great heroes. The story of the defender robots that saved the city from a state of despair brought sweet hope to the citizens who were losing their faith. They became a symbol of hope, being called the Steel Knights. All were eventually redesigned and began protecting the city under the orders of a commander. And as a result, they protected the city every time until there was nothing left to defend. That woman says it was her final request, and thus it must protect the city. Thus, the last remaining battle machine received its final order. No one should approach that unknown entity. Yappy prepared itself, guarding against all nearby threats, no matter what. It was always ready to protect everything. Shortly after, the scene cuts to the robot, which remains in half. Liam feels satisfied because he had fallen into that place, but the blessing of the arrow shield was still functional. Looking to the side, he assumes that what it was protecting was probably the Jewel of Wisdom. That should not exist. Looking again, he sees the robot trying to get up. He asks if it still wishes to fight and how long it has been protecting that place, and whether it fought alone all that time. Liam declares that a devoted knight is loyal, and that all living beings across dimensions owe him a debt for his services. He begins to cast a spell and declares that the robot's mission is complete. Thus, a light starts to envelop the entire city. At the same moment, that jewel seemingly gets destroyed. The protagonist replies that he hoped the robot could rest in peace. Yappy ends up losing his strength, and Leon, noticing the robot's final breath, thanks him for everything. Right after, the scene shifts to the protagonist with the old man from before. The old man says that he had destroyed the jewel, and Leon asks why he was complaining. The old man replies that it was nothing, as it was His Majesty who destroyed the robot and had the right to do whatever he wanted with that jewel. Leon says that he shouldn't feel disappointed because that jewel was like poison. It was created by the demon of wisdom to tempt human beings. In other words, it was a demonic item that initially granted all wishes but then began to demand something in return. It was like feeding a beast to tame it, and it corrodes humans with promises of eternal life. As a consequence, it wouldn't take long for a person to lose their humanity and become a true demon. Leon asks what could happen if these were found in other places, and therefore it was better to destroy them as soon as possible. The old man, desperate, says he would report this to the American government as quickly as possible. Leon, in turn, tells him to do just that, but that they might have already fallen to the demon's temptation. Immediately afterward, the two enter a room where several scientists seem to be analyzing something. Leon asks if this is where that man is resting, and the old man replies yes, that he is safe. Then it is revealed that the robot from before appears to be on some kind of altar. The man asks what the protagonist intends to do. Leon mentions that the robot was an honorable knight and therefore he would bury him and pray for him to go to the banquet hall of the gods. Taking a chalice, Leon says that the robot needs to be blessed before that. Thus, he begins to pray, asking that the robot may rest in peace. At that moment, a sacred light begins to envelop the entire place. The old man is surprised because the robot seems to start moving. At the same moment, it appears to come back to life again. However, it collapses once more. Leon is astonished, thinking that this energy was probably divine power. It had no source of energy, but he believed the divine blessing had worked a miracle. From within the robot, a much smaller robot emerges, which seemingly could be the same, but in a reduced form. Leon says he understands if it is him because the goddess would have chosen him. Then Leon draws his sword, beginning what seems to be a spell. Everyone around remains silent, watching what he is doing. Leon opens his eyes, drawing his sword again. He strikes the air and a crack appears in the wall. The shape of his goddess's face is revealed. The old man, in disbelief, wonders how this could have happened. Everyone around begins to kneel, sensing that the woman amid the light was not human. In fact, she was an incomparable divine existence. Kneeling, Leon greets his goddess, whose name is Ariana. The woman calls him her first knight and asks how she may assist him. Leon responds that the robot was an honorable knight and an example to be followed by all others. He was also someone deserving of her care. Observing the robot, the woman says that the little one had not fulfilled his mission. He had neither proven his honor nor offered his glory to her. The protagonist then says that, as her first knight, he assures her the robot had already done so. If not for his existence, he would have been worthy of the glory of the Lionheart, and therefore he was an exceptional knight. The goddess then says that if Liam describes him this way, there is no reason to question him. However, she needs to be certain of one thing, asking if that Steel Knight from another world would worship the light and proclaim justice by enlisting in her army. Immediately after, the robot seems to accept this. The goddess says he is full of honor and knowledge, but his heart is still like that of a child. For this reason, he should assist Leon in ridding the world of evil. Thus, he too could become a true knight. The robot then begins to face the protagonist, who responds with a smile. At the same moment, the robot approaches the woman. The system announces that it is hacking the language pattern and installing a different language module. Thus, he seemingly begins to speak again. The goddess then says that he had done very well, and that as long as it remained loyal and supported its knight, it would share in his glory. At that moment, a light appears before the robot. The goddess declares that the Templar Knight would now receive the light of justice. Then the scene cuts to the Magic Tower in the United States, where someone says they were deeply sorry for what happened, because they had been unable to carry out the command. The other person asks why they couldn't even accomplish a simple task. They mention teaching wisdom and truth, that they still felt disappointed. The individual responds that there was nothing they could do because the survivor, Leon, was an unforeseen variable. Then the sphere asks if they are filling its ears with useless excuses. It questions what was just said and asks for the newspaper. At that moment, the man turns on the television. The protagonist appears on it in a news broadcast. The sphere seems very surprised by what it sees. It wonders why that man is there and decides to give up, saying it will never do that again. At that moment, the sphere loses its color, and from then on, the jewel never speaks again. Shortly after, the scene cuts to the Korean Hunters Association. Another individual says they will register the robot as a guild member, though it would be difficult to enforce this immediately. However, Leon responds that it does not matter. Immediately after, he leaves the place alongside the robot. At that moment, blood begins to flow from Leon's mouth. His goddess asks what had happened. Leon replies that he is fine, thinking to himself that he was not a Templar Knight in a land lacking divinity, and it had taken a toll on him. Then the machine seems concerned for the protagonist, saying it wasn't his fault, but rather because it wasn't strong enough. The goddess questions why it would be his fault, as all of it was because she herself was too weak. Leon says that no matter the situation, no one could blame a deity, and for that reason, she shouldn't say such things. Then the goddess says she would always be grateful for his loyalty. Even if it was due to the lack of divinity in those lands, the fault lay with her and the other gods for not coming sooner. She asks him to rest in peace and have faith in the gods awaiting them. Shortly after, the scene apparently cuts to the realm of the gods, and that goddess seems to be talking to her siblings. She says they needed to help their devoted follower. The day Leon turned 121 was the day the world ended, leaving only one night. This night expelled all divinity from his world and directed it into his own heart. The gods, embarrassed, retreated to the heart of the holy man and watched the protagonist subdue all the evil monsters for 180 years. For this reason, they let that one person bear the burden of the entire world. However, all the gods still had an unpayable debt to the protagonist. Shortly after, a hooded person asks how her baby is doing, and the woman replies that he is not well at all. She mentions that her knight had pushed himself too hard, and the worried girl asks what they should do. The other man says that recommending a single Templar knight had placed all the pressure on his body. He wonders where the king of Lionheart had gone, who shone with the glory of the gods. Another woman asks for a little dignity in war, as the knight fought for the gods for over 200 years and in the end still triumphed. The man says he knows all of that, but he is furious with himself for being unable to do more. Thus, an awkward silence falls over the place. Another goddess then says that 180 years had passed. It was time to break the silence they had been maintaining. She could no longer bear to see her knight suffer like that. Raising his hand, the dwarf responds that he has an idea. Just as someone had done on the plains, they should give whatever blessings they could to increase faith within society. Another man asks if he wants them to do missionary work, and the dwarf says they should show miracles to humans, because, from what they had observed through their follower, that world was known for something called the internet, and so they would use it to their advantage. Another god asks why the protagonist hadn't thought of this idea, given that he used to be a citizen of that world. However, the dwarf responds that he lived in that world before the internet became widespread. Another goddess mentions that the news about the protagonist took 20 years to take root. In response, the dwarf simply smiles, saying that this is where his new Templar knight would come into play. The scene then cuts to another man asking his manager to take a look at something. He mentions that such content was on YouTube, questioning if it had really been allowed. The boy, observing it, is surprised, wondering what it could be. He is even more shocked by what he is seeing, as the video is very peculiar and different. The man asks who had made it, and the bald guy replies that it could have been the protagonist, supposing it might even be real, but it couldn't be, as she was terrible with computers. The biggest problem was that those videos weren't clickbait, but completely genuine, wondering what they should do about it. Shortly after, the boy starts to leave, and the bald guy asks where he's going. The man replies that he's going to speak with the protagonist. The scene then cuts to the rooftop where the protagonist is. Meanwhile, that robot appears to be working on a computer. The robot says that the creation of subtitles has been completed. Because of this, it should proceed with the upload. Shortly after, Ram appears, asking if he was done using her computer and what he had done. The robot says that the marketing plan's name is Noise, and that Phase 1 has been completed. Thus, it would proceed to Phase 2 and hack the network in progress. Ram, observing all this, stays silent, assuming that the robot might be playing games on her computer. A while later, the man arrives at the protagonist's residence, mentioning that the video needed to be taken down. Ram, observing the guy, looks confused and offers him some tea. After finishing his tea, the man says the video must be taken down, asking who uploaded it. The protagonist replies that it was the robot, leaving the boy shocked, as that killer machine had done something like that, wondering how it could have managed that. Levin asks what he means by taking the video down. The boy says that, as he already knows, the rice grains in those plains are completely different from the ones cultivated in this world. Simply consuming them is enough to make someone healthy and cure diseases. As soon as people find out about that rice field, the entire world will go after it. Those plains could become filled with thieves, who might not even be ordinary thieves. When the Food Association allows planting, it will help as much as they can, so they should wait until then. Leon replies that he understands and is certain they have their prosperous systems of laws. However, that concern is unnecessary because the goddess's plantation could never be stolen. The man then is surprised, wondering how Leon could be so confident. The scene then cuts to the protagonist's plains. A group of people seems to be stationed there. Looking at the information on a phone, an unknown person says that the rice grain must be real. Even so, he is surprised because he thought the security there would be heavy, but there's no one around. Thus, the only thing they would need to do is grab the seeds and set the place on fire. Another man says that since they've been paid, they should get the job done and fetch the gas tanks. Then the group starts to enter the plantation, walking toward a specific spot. However, one of the soldiers is startled, saying there's someone there. He grabs his knife to defend himself, but isn't necessary, as it's just a scarecrow. The man then apologizes for the misunderstanding. Even so, he finds it very strange because it seemed like the scarecrow moved. Although he knows it's just a scarecrow, he's still afraid because it's very creepy. Shortly after, another man tells him to look behind, as there are many scarecrows like that one. The man, irritated, calls him an idiot, asking how he could call himself a demon soldier if he's scared of mere scarecrows. He says they should stop fooling around and feel the direction of the wind since they need to burn as large an area as possible in a short time. Then the group begins to pour gasoline on the plantation, throwing several tanks across the area. The man says that since people say this stuff is valuable, they'll keep some of the crops for themselves. At that moment, the man becomes startled, wondering where the scarecrows went as they were just behind them moments ago. Moreover, one of their companions has also disappeared. That guy, observing everything, becomes shocked, wondering if those scarecrows had always been so close to them. At that instant, one of them appears behind the guide, who stares at it dumbfounded. Desperate, the man says they should run, but within seconds, one of their friends attacks the scarecrow, saying the thing was really moving and they weren't normal scarecrows, because, in truth, they were all monsters. Another soldier wonders what they should do as they are already completely surrounded by those monsters. Lying on the ground, one man wonders what those scarecrows were as he had never seen anything like them. The other man, desperate, says he doesn't know either, thinking they had left in such a rush that most of his subordinates weren't there. He assumes that from the start he found that request very strange. Shortly after, the other man points ahead, asking if that was a silo by any chance. Excited, the other man thinks he has found what he wanted because if the rice story is true, it would make him very rich. He orders them to load as much rice as possible into the cars. For this reason, they should start immediately. As he approaches the house, an explosion suddenly occurs. One of his companions gets caught in the middle of it. Then it is revealed that the protagonist had planted landmines in that location. The other man, desperate, asks who would commit such an atrocity. At that moment, the robot appears, stating that the entry permission was invalid. Thus, it must exterminate all intruders. Later, as day breaks, all the soldiers had already been captured. As a result, the Viper Squad was successfully imprisoned. Following the arrest of the Human Demonic Association, the value of the Rice Pantheon was blessed and increased significantly. Liam started going around spreading the word about the Pantheon for the sake of rice circulation. However, a small incident occurred, but it was left in the past. In the end, the internet was buzzing about the Pantheon. Leon, sitting down, wonders if this was what the gods had planned, thinking they seemed to have adapted to modern society better than he had. Then, Han appears, mentioning good news. The evaluation of the rice had come in, and it was about 230 million won. Leon states that the price must be affordable, and Han, incredulous, asks why, as it was very expensive. The young man explains that the market determines the price of the item. However, if the price was too high, commoners wouldn't be able to afford it. For that reason, the blessing of the deity should be accessible to all human beings. He mentions that he met with the president earlier to discuss preaching to farmers about the deity's blessing. However, the president said the government had to maintain religious neutrality. Even so, it was still necessary to find a way to gather more faith enough to summon the power of Lionheart. Han, in turn, asks if that will be alright, mentioning that she had requested the portal as he had asked. But clearing it with the people she had selected was practically impossible. In response, Leon just smiles, saying they'll see what happens. Shortly after, the scene cuts to another man asking if he is, by any chance, Mr. Gu. Happy to see him again, the man asks if he came to that place because of the message. The man responds that he indeed came for that reason, thinking that at best, they are all rank C or even rank D hunters. Looking to the side, a group of people notices Hannah's present. She is a magical swordswoman of Ranka who achieved the highest record during last year's test. The young man observing Han seems very irritated. At that moment, Leon appears beside her. The man thinks that from the start, he believed the protagonist wasn't an ordinary person, but came from a completely different world. Shortly after, the young man seems to begin an announcement. Welcoming everyone, he mentions that the reason for inviting them there was to recruit soldiers into his guild, and those who qualified would be granted the honor of joining his army. Another man then explains the entry test. The test consisted of completing the yellow portal at Sanjan Station. Everyone around panics, wondering how they could possibly accomplish that, asking if Leon wanted to kill them because the test was practically impossible. The reaction of the hunters was expected as portal rankings are categorized by color. It starts with red, then orange, followed by yellow, green, and blue. For hunters like them, entering a yellow portal was equivalent to certain death. Thus, everyone around becomes very upset, mentioning that the test was practically a suicide mission. Many people start leaving the place frustrated, saying they had wasted their time. Another man, watching everything, wonders if Leon would leave it like that. Later, countless people had left, and as a result, only a few remained for the announcement. Meanwhile, Leon silently observes everything, and shortly after, he calls out to one of the people who stayed. He asks why the man decided to stay. The man responds that he thought there might be some meaning behind it. Afterward, that guy begins questioning everyone about why they stayed in that place. Finally, it's the man's turn, and Leon asks why he stayed. The man thinks that this guild was created by someone who was basically an S rank. Because of that, he had to seize the opportunity, saying he didn't believe the protagonist would send them to their deaths, and that's why he stayed. Leon says it's great to have such an attitude, mentioning that the boy is very energetic. With that said, he was there to assemble the soldiers, and the work of a good soldier is to obey their master. For that reason, they will accept their knight's orders without question and will trust in the honor and power of a knight. And that was all they needed to know. In other words, they just needed to listen. Then Leon tells them to get ready because they would enter the portal immediately. Shortly after, the scene cuts to the portal beneath the staircase, and Leon's entire group seems prepared for it. Another man observing the equipment mentions that it's a bit heavy, but even so, the equipment is excellent. He wonders if they aren't all very rare since they must cost at least 10 million. However, he is surprised because the protagonist isn't wearing any equipment. Looking over at the boy from earlier, he calls out to Han, asking why Leon isn't wearing any armor. Han responds that his skin is tougher than those armors. This leaves the man surprised because the protagonist is truly powerful, and he feels certain that nothing bad will happen. Shortly after, the scene cuts to inside the portal and a goblin seems to be defeated. The soldiers, watching this, become desperate, wondering what had just happened as Leon is easily finishing off those monsters, saying that they weren't honorable warriors and would now crawl and die like insects on the ground, as this was relentless justice. A while later, the battle seems to be over and the boys' group is already heading to a specific location. One of the soldiers is pleased because it seems they will fight in the fresh air. The system announces that they are mercenaries in a foreign territory and that there is a war occurring between two tribes on this vast plain. For this reason, they must choose a side and help them win. Another soldier supposes that this is a mission to assist some type of NPC, and as a consequence, they'll have to choose a side to help them win. However, the problem is determining which side would be easier for them. Another soldier points ahead, asking if that isn't a monster. A silhouette seems to be approaching them, and several monsters appear, heading toward the group. As a result, they end up surrounding them all. The orc asks who they are and states that this is the territory of the Battle Axe tribe. The soldiers, watching this, remain silent and Leon doesn't seem pleased at all. Han then asks if they should proceed with the mission for now, and the protagonist tells him to do as he wishes. Han in turn thanks the boy and then shifts his gaze toward the orcs, saying they are mercenaries and are there because they might receive a reward for helping the tribe. The orc is surprised, saying they must be outsiders his chief mentioned, and for that reason, they should follow him. Shortly after, the scene cuts to the monster's home and Leon's group seems to be entering the place. The monster mentions that they seem weaker than expected, but even so, it's fine. Because of that, they should assist his tribe in the middle of the war, and the winner takes everything. Extremely irritated, the protagonist says he can't listen to this anymore, and the orc asks who that man is. Approaching the monster, Leon asks if he just talked about honor and how a bunch of savages like him dares to desire something they don't even deserve. Furious, the other monster asks if Leon is insulting them, but at that moment, the orc is killed. Leon states that they aren't honorable warriors and will now crawl and die like insects on the ground. What he's doing at this moment is relentless justice. The scene then shifts back to the present and the protagonist seems furious, while the orcs are desperate as their chief has just been killed. Quickly, they start advancing toward Liam's group. Liam, in turn, orders them to raise their shields and form a circle to block their attack. Shortly after, the group does as the protagonist instructed and one of the orcs tries to attack them. However, it has no effect as their shields are extremely strong. At that moment, a system screen appears for one of the soldiers displaying the numerous defensive effects embedded in the shield. A soldier, surprised while observing all these effects, wonders what this could be as the equipment is incredibly powerful. Leon orders them to raise their shields and press the monsters back, waiting for the right moment to strike. At that instant, one of the orcs is struck by one of the soldiers. Thus, a massive battle ensues. Meanwhile, Leon hears one of the monsters pleading to the god of warriors. Irritated, he asks how these beasts dare cry out to a god. He orders his group to cut out their tongues and take their heads, insulting the pagan god. At that moment, Leon calls for his horse and charges toward the orcs, where he appears to begin casting a spell. Drawing two of his swords, he declares that he will kill them all. In a matter of seconds, all the orcs are already on the ground. Leon, pleased, raises his sword and calls for a triumphant cheer as the victory is honorable. Shortly after, Han calls out to the protagonist, asking why he did all that. However, the young man looks confused, questioning whether he needed a reason to kill those monsters. He states that helping the orcs is nonsense, and that he would rather throw himself into the fire than help those savages, because they deserve no respect as their very existence is evil, and they don't deserve to live. They might appear fierce, but one cannot compare the savagery of a beast to the bravery of a knight. For that reason, they should not be treated as if they were human, as they are nothing more than vile beasts. However, Ham remains optimistic, mentioning that there might be a good orc somewhere in the world. In response, Leon simply smiles, asking her to listen carefully, declaring that a good orc is a dead orc. When the gates opened on Earth, countless surviving orcs settled there, and the Earthlings welcomed them with open arms. However, humanity wasn't prepared for what followed as the orcs failed to integrate and became demonic humans. The orcs ended up becoming a problem, even on Earth. Sometime later, the robot announces that its destination has been reached and that if its duty is fulfilled, efficient annihilation is possible. Han, wearing a type of cloth on her head, says she will leave it to the robot. The robot then states it will initiate a core overload, with its operational generation capacity at 99.9%. At that moment, a light envelops the small robot, indicating that its core has been overloaded and the cooling system is stable. Immediately after, the robot leaps into the air, retrieving something unknown from the lake. Han, meanwhile, asks if this is right, and Leon questions what she means. She implies that dumping radioactive material into the river to kill the orcs might go against the honor of a knight. In response, Leon simply smiles and asks both of them to listen to what he has to say. He explains that fighting these green beasts isn't a war and no battle is more like pest control. For this reason, a good orc is a dead orc. Shortly after, the scene shifts to one of the monsters amidst a battle, and another of its companions remarks that their chief has just crushed the other chief's skull. The monster says that he died fighting bravely and that the god of warriors will surely send him to the eternal battlefield. For that, they should toast to victory. He then scoops some water from the river to drink. However, he is surprised as the water has a strange taste, assuming it might be due to blood. Shortly after, the monster returns to his cabin and some time later appears to be writhing in pain. He begins calling for the healer. However, he notices that all the monsters are suffering the same way. Confused, the chief wonders what could be happening as he has never seen anything like it before. Another orc says it's neither a curse nor a spell, wondering what it could be. Shortly after, a voice emerges stating it is honoring the legacy of Lionheart. At that moment, Leon appears and strikes down the other monster. He orders his group to eliminate all the pests and leave none alive. Thus, all his soldiers charge toward the orcs and a massacre begins. Sometime later, the system announces that the Battle Axe tribe has been completely annihilated. As a result, all orc species would become their enemies from that day forward. They became a common enemy, so all orcs in the hidden mission area should be eliminated. Looking at the system screen, Han announces that the mission has changed. This leaves Leon surprised, mentioning that finally there's a mission better than the previous one. He informs the soldiers that this is their time to defend light and justice. But at that moment, one of the orcs still appears to be alive and Leon silently observes the situation. The remaining orc asks if it was them who cursed the river's water, calling them absolute cowards. He questions if they dare to call themselves warriors, stating they shouldn't even speak of honor because just looking at them is a disgrace. Liam then becomes extremely furious, saying that even if he gouged out their eyes, it would still be a grave sin that could never be repaid. For that reason, he will at least give them a chance to take their own lives. At that instant, the orc seems to begin casting a spell, declaring that he will never forgive them. Leon then grabs his sword, remarking how interesting it is that this beast can control chains. He throws his sword at the monster, hitting it directly, yet it still doesn't seem to be enough. The orc claims it's already too late because their chief is now coming. Soon after, a black sphere begins to absorb all the bodies. Han, desperate, asks what that is, and Leon replies that it's an offering and, as expected of beasts, they are utterly uncivilized. Shortly afterward, something unknown emerges from the black sphere. The system announces that the hidden mission has been initiated. Above the black sphere, a giant arm along with an eye appears. The system declares the objective to eliminate Gorok, the orc god of sorcery. At the same moment, the monster seems to make a hand gesture. It begins analyzing the protagonist, saying that this creature must not be forgiven under any circumstances. For that reason, it must be annihilated immediately. The monster then casts a laser spell aimed at Leon. The creature mentions a coexistence similar to his own and shields the protagonist, questioning which god is aiding the boy. At that moment, Leon appears to be extremely furious, asking how it dares compare itself to his god just because it's playing captain to a band of beasts. He then grabs his sword again, stating that Leon's god is art and could not tolerate the monster's existence. The clash of their attacks seems imminent, but within seconds, the monster's arm becomes detached. The monster is shocked, feeling great pain even though the attack wasn't on its original body. Another orc, watching this, is astonished, noticing that their chief is in despair and assumes that must be the sacred sword of light. He wonders if this is the protagonist, the orc hunter and demon slayer, the knight who was the sole survivor of the nightmare world. Desperate, the orc announces that he will retreat for now, leaving only his subordinate with Leon. He declares that Leon will pay for this reckless audacity. Leon approaches the orc, stating that this is the best it can expect from its god, as it is merely a being from a world of filthy beasts like them. Enraged, the orc asks what Leon has done and vows to avenge all its companions. But within seconds, the protagonist finishes off the orc, who collapses lifeless to the ground. Leon, irritated, states that at least it tried, but they still aren't beings deserving of life. The system then announces that all missions have been completed. Another man observing the scene is surprised, thinking they had gained resistance to physical attacks, something only tanks typically achieve. Another soldier comments that it's incredible, but a shame and only applies to orcs. Leon then orders everyone to collect the loot, urging them to move quickly since it is the right of the victor. Another soldier suggests focusing on the items of those with higher ranks like great warriors or advanced levels, and emphasizes collecting all the healer's equipment. Afterward, Han calls out to the protagonist, asking what they should do with the remaining object. Liam acknowledges it, saying it's the hand of the self-proclaimed god in that place. At that moment, the robot appears and Leon asks if it has anything it wishes to say. The robot replies that the message will be received. A hologram of another god appears, stating that he can sense a considerable amount of mana coming from the severed hand. For this reason, he advises using the Holy Grail to absorb it, which would grant them more power. Grasping his chalice, Leon questions if it is true, then approaches the hand, placing the chalice near it. The hand seemingly begins to be absorbed. At that moment, Leon receives his power, However, Leon still appears irritated, thinking he can feel a power similar to divine power, yet he cannot appreciate its existence as he doesn't revere other creations either. Thus, he considers it merely an evil force that should be completely annihilated. Shortly after, his goddess calls out to Leon. Leon remarks that she's calling him without even preparing a ritual, questioning why she made such an effort for this. The goddess responds that it's fine as it barely affects her, and she came because he needs to make a decision. She explains that she believes it might be possible to recover the power of a sacred item using that other power, and therefore she will abide by the protagonist's choice. Hearing what the goddess says, Leon remains silent, contemplating that he possesses 4 sacred items in total. One of them is the sacred lance along with the sword, and he also has the Holy Grail along with his heart. At the moment, the sacred power of the sword feels excessive. Thus, he makes his decision, declaring he will restore the power of the Holy Grail. Immediately, the chalice begins to float. Moments later, Leon retrieves it, seemingly very pleased. Shortly after, Han calls out to him, saying he needs to see something and asking where the robot had gone. At that moment, they hear shouting, and another soldier asks what's going on, calling for help. It's revealed that the robot has tied up the soldier. Leon then appears on the scene. As the soldier is about to speak, Leon commands silence, saying they should measure their words. He warns that if the soldier doesn't want his tongue cut out, he should pay attention. The man attempts to speak again. Leon commands silence once more, asking how he dares address a knight improperly. Leon then questions the robot about what happened. The robot replies that the man is a loot thief. Leon orders the group to search the man's belongings, asking them to investigate everything. After searching, they find a mysterious bag. The woman wonders if it contains the heart of the warrior orc. She notes that it's the most valuable item inside the orc portal. She questions why he would do such a thing, as misappropriating loot is a serious crime. The man tries to defend himself, claiming he didn't steal it and had no intention to do so. Within seconds, Leon draws his sword and severs the man's arm. The soldiers coldly observe the situation. Leon responds, acknowledging that aligning his laws with common sense may differ. However, from that moment onward, the man is part of the Lionheart King's army. This means they do not follow the world's laws, but rather his laws. These are his laws, and anyone who disagrees should raise their hand. Those who steal will have their hands cut off. These are the laws of his kingdom. It was difficult for people from modern Earth to accept his rules. However, the buffs and abilities they gained by joining his army were significant. Because of this, the benefits were too great for them to walk away. Shortly after, one of the soldiers calls for Leon. The young man asks him to state his name while removing his helmet. The soldier replies that his name is Gull. Leon then asks why he called out to him, and Gull asks if it's possible to allow the thief to regain his arm. Liam questions if he truly wants the arm restored, and Gold responds affirmatively. The protagonist explains that it would undermine the purpose of the punishment, as restoring what was lost contradicts the reason for the penalty. Gold replies that he understands this, but they still live amid ideals different from Leon's. Since Leon previously spoke about laws, it would be gracious if he gave the thief another chance. Liam acknowledges that this makes sense. The soldier apologizes for what happened. At that moment, Leon takes out a chalice, stating that the man should be grateful to have such a rational companion. A light begins to emanate from the chalice, and an unknown liquid is poured out. As a result, the man's arm is regenerated. The other soldier is astonished, noting that not even rank S healers can regenerate an arm, wondering how someone could possess such immense power. With a threatening look, Leon demands the man leave immediately, stating he would forgive him this time out of respect for the laws of that world. He declares that those who wish to remain in his army should stay, and those who don't should take their share of the spoils and leave. On the other side, the soldiers think this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that they must seize no matter what. Liam then announces that training would begin, believing they were perfectly capable of enduring it. He orders everyone to gather the spoils as they would depart immediately. Afterward, Han calls out to the protagonist, asking what the next training session would be. Liam responds with only a smile, mentioning it would be physical training. The scene then cuts to the boys' fields. A group of people appears to be near a building. That boy from earlier, who had been in the middle of the protagonist's battle, is also there. An older man asks if he participated in a portal raid. The boy responds affirmatively, saying he was eager to do something. The older man advises him to be careful not to overdo it, reminding him it's always good to rest sometimes. Han then appears atop the building, announcing that Leon, the king of Leon and Art, along with a knightly robot, was arriving. At that moment, Leon appears, congratulating them on passing the simple test. He mentions they are still far too weak to be part of his army, but that could be improved. While watching them fight, he identified several issues, one of the most important being their physical condition. Therefore, he decided to start with physical training, and from now on, they would undergo the rigorous regimen outlined in the training manual of his royal army. Physical training was muscle training, requiring them to push their bodies to the limit and surpass it. One of his Templar knights named Gratis, a giant slayer, created the training manual. Gratis once said that humans grow stronger as they are beaten down. The boy then asks how a soldier defending the kingdom should train and is told they must work harder than a farmer. However, for more effective training, Gratis shared these wise words. to beat and break the soldiers' bodies, then heal them, because not only would their muscles become stronger, but their visual perception would also improve. Leon then points a finger at all his subordinates, declaring that from that moment on, they should crush one another. The boy, observing from below, remarks that this is madness, but acknowledges it isn't entirely wrong. Even so, if they proceed that way, their bodies won't endure it. Liam then summons his chalice once more, stating they should consider themselves fortunate because the person before them is the guardian of the Holy Grail. Noticing the boy, the older man seems to realize something as his wounds somehow begin healing on their own. The protagonist declares that all warriors near the Holy Grail would be completely healed. By drinking from the water, it would regenerate damaged muscles and set bones back in place. For this reason, they would have 5 hours to break everything in their path. Additionally, there are no allies, so they should take hits while also attacking anyone in sight. And if anyone remains standing after those 5 hours, a protagonist will personally beat them. As he starts to leave, Han says she will handle the rest along with the robot. The soldiers, witnessing everything, are still in despair, unable to believe they actually have to do this. The robot then announces that fraudulent behavior has been detected, ordering them to start fighting immediately or lethal force would be used. At that moment, one man seems to lose his mind and begins punching people like a madman. Chaos erupts and many begin fighting. In the midst of it all, the boy is still processing everything, declaring that this is utter insanity. At that moment, he is punched by someone. This moment transitions into a look at the daily routine of the hunters who chose to become Leon's knights. At 9 in the morning, Greta's army training begins. For lunch, they are only served salted water mixed with sugar. The soldiers, looking at it, wonder what it could be. Liam explains that it is lunch, water with salt and sugar. At 1 in the afternoon, tactical training begins with people being flung into the air. By 8 in the evening, the rest period begins, which in reality is a remarkable training session as they endure it all thanks to Han's care. However, this is all part of the protagonist's plan, though the hunters don't need to know that. Time passes and dawn breaks. The young boy from earlier was still training. He assumed that the shield was heavier than he had thought and required significant strength to wield the sword. Additionally, the stances he could adopt while in shield formation were highly restrictive. At that moment, the protagonist appears in the area. He instructs him to continue his training and correct his posture, trying to thrust again. The boy follows his master's instructions, striking at the air once more. However, Leon comments that he did it wrong. He takes the boy's shield, pointing out that he has a habit of lowering his shield when he thrusts. Leon states that he is certain he has mentioned this before. He adds that the shield must also be used to protect the shoulder and the right side of his companion. He advises that the shield should not be lowered unless visibility is compromised. A misplaced shield creates a gap, and a gap creates an opening. The boy then asks if their tactics are meant to allow shielded soldiers to block the enemy while knights advance to attack them. Leon confirms this, because the hammer and anvil strategy is the correct approach and the one he employs. However, he explains that the current opponents are not monsters, and he doubts there are any creatures that can be defeated with such a method. Liam remains silent, observing the boy's remarks. He asks if the boy dares to challenge him or plans to teach him how to fight creatures from another world. The boy clarifies that this is not his intention. In fact, it is precisely what he's trying to learn. The protagonist explains that the monsters he encountered in portals were also numerous in his world. There were giants towering over 20 meters tall, trolls with endless regeneration, even gigantic spiders, and massive dragon. Therefore, it is necessary to have various hunting methods to combat these monsters, as well as the ability to adapt to any situation. All of this can only be obtained through real-life experience. He asks the boy if he, by chance, has decades of experience fighting monsters while serving a goddess. After hearing all this, the boy remains silent. The protagonist states that this is why he teaches his soldiers only one thing: the importance of balance. It is an extremely vital quality for a knight. This increases their chances of survival, and all they need to do is enhance their singular talent. However, the boy responds that he aspires to achieve much more than that. Liam asks if the boy wishes to become a knight. The boy responds that, as a mere commoner, he would never have that ability. He questions if knights are not aristocrats. The protagonist advises him not to associate his kingdom with the logical rules of his own world, because being a knight is not something exclusive to aristocrats. It's a path of hardship voluntarily undertaken as a noble duty, to protect the people and act with courage. Someone who pledges eternal loyalty to the deities and the people. For this reason, anyone can become a knight if they make that divine promise, and if they have the courage and character to assume such a duty. That alone is enough to earn Leon's respect. Hearing the protagonist's words, the boy feels more motivated. He begins to think that he truly wants to become a knight as well. Sometime later, the scene shifts to the magic tower. A man is overjoyed as his entity has returned. The sphere commands him to bow immediately. It states that they will teach knowledge and truth, but is obvious that they must be revered and offered tributes. The sphere instructs him to invoke the spatial transfer magic into the crystal. It declares that the crystal will be detonated in space in case of an emergency. The man questions the reasoning, as he thought the crystal was for descending to Earth. The sphere then asks if he is insane. It questions why it would voluntarily end its own existence. It states that it has no intention of setting foot on the planet, where that monster resides. Thus, it must devise a way to eradicate the threat. This is the best moment as Leon currently has no army. For this reason, it insists on entering the same portal as the protagonist. That way, Leon can be eliminated once and for all. The scene shifts to a yellow portal. Han questions if Leon truly plans to raid a portal with just these rookie soldiers. Additionally, she wants to know why she and the robot were excluded from the raid. Another man remarks that it seems he will have to do all the work. The protagonist begins a speech. He declares that they have all proven their worth during the 4 weeks of training. For this reason, he won't speak much. Now is their final chance to demonstrate everything they have learned. Thus, they will enter and raid the portal. They would generally not dare to challenge portals of this kind. However, when they arrive at that place, they will understand what it means to be a soldier of the King of Leon in art. Thus, they will stand before the deities they could serve. For that reason, they should proceed at once. As a result of all this, 49 hunters with an average rank of D, along with 1 hunter from the association, entered the portal. However, Han and the robot seemed not to be joining this time. The girl reassures the robot not to worry since they are with the protagonist. For that reason, nothing bad would happen. But at that moment, the robot warns that there's a problem. It detected a total of 51 people. In reality, 52 had entered the portal. This meant that an unknown person had infiltrated the area. As an emergency response, the robot enters the portal as well. Han follows to assist the robot. However, she crashes hard against the portal. Another man observes and notes that the portal is fluctuating because the mana level is shifting. The portal begins to change color. It transitions to red. The man, in turn, is shocked. He wonders how the yellow portal suddenly turned red. Han, observing this, remains silent. She supposes it might be a floating portal. The scene then cuts to a castle. In its midst, a massive battle is taking place. At that moment, the yellow portal emerges. Leon's soldiers are watching the scene. They wonder if they have accidentally entered a demonic portal. Leon, seeing all of this, appears very irritated. He orders the squad to raise their shields and form a formation. The group immediately complies with the protagonist's command. Leon then orders everyone to advance. One of the men is confused, wondering if they are truly advancing even though it's a demonic portal. At that moment, the entire group moves toward their objective. The man remains surprised, wondering if they aren't afraid. Shortly after, a system screen appears before the man. He is astonished, realizing that the effects are truly absurd. Meanwhile, the monsters notice the group. They begin rushing toward them. However, the soldiers successfully block them all. Thus, the battle begins. Another man is surprised, noting that even a rank B hunter would struggle against such monsters. Yet the group is holding their ground for sheer willpower. He wonders what has happened to them over the past 4 weeks. The protagonist orders them to press the enemy and continue without giving them any chance to counterattack. He insists they exploit every opening they find. As a result, the army begins overwhelming the monsters. Looking up, another boy is astonished. He mentions that it is likely a demon troll. He wonders if they'll be able to block its attack. Moreover, the troll is much heavier than its level suggests. At that moment, the troll attacks one of the soldiers. The soldier seems to activate some sort of skill. He successfully parries the attack. He mentions that compared to His Majesty's attack, this one is very light. Thus, they successfully block the troll's strike. At that moment, the robot appears, declaring it will respond to the medium-level entity. It initiates a sequence of attacks aimed at the troll. Mounted on his horse, Leon is surprised, wondering why the robot is there. He acknowledges that the robot executed a fine block. Leon then slices the monster apart. With a cold gaze, he observes the other soldiers. They seem extremely desperate, as their leader was easily killed. As a result, the entire group begins fleeing to save their lives. The soldiers of that world appear astonished, noting that all the monsters are retreating. With tears in their eyes, the soldiers rejoice, relieved to have survived the ordeal. Finally, they thank the protagonist for helping them. They mention that he has aided the kingdom of Espero. The system announces that the kingdom is under attack by a demon and that the invasion must be repelled. The remaining time is 1 week. The soldiers, seeing this, are shocked, wondering if it refers to an Arctiman. Another soldier is surprised, remarking that he thought the portal was yellow before. Another soldier informs the protagonist of terrible news. He states that the portal they were supposed to exit from has vanished. Leon, in turn, asks them not to act rashly. He begins analyzing the area. The robot announces that something unexpected has occurred due to the intrusion of an outsider. Leon asks if anyone can explain this situation, and one of the soldiers raises his hand, mentioning that it was a floating portal. A phenomenon where the difficulty of a portal increases drastically within seconds. Because of this, they couldn't leave until they completed it. Analyzing the situation, the protagonist thinks it wasn't a coincidence. He declares they wouldn't change their plans, they would complete the portal. He is the king of Leon. Rick had already subdued 2 demon kings and over 30 archdemons. He asks if, by any chance, they were doubting his abilities. Hearing this, all his soldiers become excited, feeling inspired by having such an incredible leader. However, Leon still couldn't guarantee victory against a demon king, because a knight needed to be steadfast and reliable, no matter what happened. For this reason, they needed to place their hope in him. As he analyzes the location, he discovers something unusual. Then the scene shifts to the purple sphere. which begins laughing as it observes the protagonist. It mentions that he had grown weaker and in the end was merely a human. The man asks if he can begin the ritual to summon it. However, the sphere declines, because there is no reason to do so and there's a creature that the demons of lust have been working on for over 100 years. When that thing awakens as a demon king that will be capable of killing him. The kingdom of Sparrow is a beautiful place, a peaceful realm that prides itself on its millennia-long history. However, it was now in a precarious situation. Demons constantly invaded the city, spreading chaos. Only the palace remained standing. The last survivors of the palace clung to their final ray of hope and fought for their lives. Leon remarks that all portals have their own scenarios. However, a knight explains that this portal is different because it has a time limit. Dungeon breaks usually occur when the monsters within a portal are neglected, but in time-limited missions, the portal will close as long as the mission's conditions are met. After understanding the situation, the protagonist states that he doesn't plan to interfere, but given the urgency, he asks if it would be a problem if he fought alongside Sir Spinner. The man responds that it's fine, because the president of the association had already taken this into account. However, the conversation wasn't over yet as Leon still had something to ask. He questions the men about their thoughts on hidden missions. The men are startled upon hearing this and ask what His Majesty plans to do. With a cold gaze, Leon replies that he is thinking of killing the Demon King. At night, the boy remarks that, as expected, the demonic energy of that troll hadn't produced good results. While holding a chalice, he says he believes that Mount will only guarantee a brief connection with the pantheon. Leon then begins a conversation with Ariana. The voice asks if the young man had also sensed it, to which he replies that it took him some time to realize, but he felt a different kind of energy within the portal. Ariana explains that he couldn't sense it easily due to his human body. The energy had infiltrated very naturally into that world. The boy believes it must be a powerful entity, strong enough that even he couldn't detect it beforehand, likely a demon king or a lord-level being. Ariana notes that it's strange because such a strong existence should have a more potent energy. She adds that another deity from the pantheon wanted her to convey something to him. She explains that Plu wishes to investigate that world and believes she must have sensed something. Leon states that they'll need energy for her to descend. And so the conversation with Ariana concludes. Afterward, the protagonist and his followers arrive at the mansion. The butler, Farco, welcomes them. He assures them he will serve them to the best of his abilities. As they walk through the palace, Leon comments that the owner of the place seems to have an excellent sense of art. Farco explains that the Palace of Sparrow is a chronicle of the kingdom's long history, from the first queen to the current one. That place has served countless queens. Everyone is surprised, assuming it must be a matriarchal society. Leon becomes irritated after hearing his subordinates' remarks. He scolds them, saying they are bold to gossip about royalty despite being commoners. Shortly after, he apologizes to the butler, explaining that he brought those ignorant individuals due to the urgency of the situation. Farco smiles and assures him it's all right. They then arrive at the audience chamber. The man invites them in, saying the queen is waiting for them. Upon entering the room, the boy is asked if he contributed to the battle at the palace gates. The man who asked the question is Duke Artyom, who decides to grant the boy the position of knight for his accomplishments during the last battle. He then asks the young man to say a few words in praise of the queen. Leon remains silent. He then walks toward the queen, saying he will greet her first. However, he is stopped. The chancellor states that despite his great achievements, he is still an outsider and cannot approach the queen in such a manner. The boy's subordinates observe the situation and think the man is right. They wonder if Leon will get angry at how the chancellor is yelling. Leon says he can no longer restrain himself. He decides to address the queen directly. He adds that he must do his duty, even if it seems rude. Artyom becomes furious and orders the captain to apprehend Leon. However, Leon grabs the chancellor's head. He breaks the chancellor's neck immediately. This leaves his subordinates in shock. The knights surround Leon, demanding to know the meaning of his actions, but the boy remains silent. He then asks the chancellor how long he intends to hide his true identity. Leon orders the demon to reveal itself. Suddenly, a demon emerges from Artyom's body and from several other individuals in the hall. Leon tells the people not to panic. He urges them to advance and fight as one. One of the demons attempts to attack Leon, but Leon easily defends himself. He then rips the arm off the creature and finishes it by cutting off its head. The queen's knight also helps kill the demons. He's enraged upon discovering that they had infiltrated the castle. The demons move toward the people, but the man defends them. He then orders his subordinates to kill all the demons. His subordinates begin assisting him. After the battle ends, Leon sheathes his weapon. He decides to speak with the queen, but he is stopped by the knight. Leon says he understands the knight's loyalty but questions why he did not prioritize the royalty during an emergency. The man replies that his loyalty lies solely with the queen. Leon then disarms the knight using only his fingers. He states that he is the one in charge of questioning and judging. The same applies to the queen, and the knight must know his place. The knight responds that the queen is not in a condition to judge at the moment, and since the chancellor is dead, the authority now lies with him. Leon falls silent upon hearing this. He then states that the energy of the corrupted is filling the castle. The knight must act quickly to eliminate them all. The knight asks if this is true, and Leon replies that a king never lies. The man then asks Leon what he wants, to which he replies that he wants to command the soldiers and the authority to eliminate the demons. Leon then kneels before the queen, declaring that he will take care of the situation since she is in a precarious state. In the central square of the kingdom of Sparrow, Leon addresses the commoners, declaring that he has been granted full authority by Her Majesty. He states that among them are those possessed by demons and that he is certain they plan to start a revolution along with the infiltration of the castle. However, he assures them there is a way to identify those who are possessed. He then demonstrates the method. Leon declares that from now on, anyone who is not a demon must throw themselves into the flames to prove their innocence. He proceeds to throw 2 people into the fire as an example. The crowd is horrified by what they are witnessing. Immediately after, everyone sees that one of the individuals thrown into the flames suffers no harm. Only the body of the soldier burns. Leon explains that the sacred flames only burn those who are evil. He urges the people to thank the deity of fire and shout its name in glory while running into the flames. However, the commoners remain fearful. Leon becomes irritated and orders them to move immediately, or they will die by his sword. The people begin running desperately into the flames. Thus, the demons are revealed. Leon states that their stench is everywhere and declares he will punish them by shredding their souls. The demons say the human should know his place. The boy screams in rage at the creatures. The force of his scream causes their ears to bleed. Leon declares he will not allow the demons to act as though they are human. They will die screaming in pain, and their laments will echo throughout the world. The demons are terrified, realizing Leon became enraged simply because they dared to walk on 2 legs. A man observes the entire situation from a distance using magic and remarks that it seems the infiltration plan has failed. One of the demons is captured and displayed in front of the entire population as the protagonist declares that they should not be afraid. For as long as he exists, these demonic species will never threaten anyone. These vile creatures plant negative emotions in the minds of people. The demon becomes enraged, claiming that this isn't over and that all these people will be destroyed. However, Leon strikes the demon to silence him. He then states that it is because of that filthy creature that these people have succumbed to seduction and fear. He blames it for numerous problems in life. The demon tries to defend himself, saying none of it is his fault, but the young man once again orders him to shut up. The commoners begin blaming the creature for all their troubles. Leon explains that demons are monsters that in some way bring misfortune upon them. Everything that has ever gone wrong in their lives is the fault of these beings. While holding a torch, the young man declares that they should not be afraid because the deity of fire granted him divine flames. He then calls a boy to the stage. Leon hands the torch to the child and asks him to punish the demon until it pays for its sins. Seeing the boy hesitate, Leon gives him a piercing look and asks if he feels pity. The boy denies it, saying his father died because of those demons. As he approaches the creature, the demon threatens the boy, saying that if he dares touch him, he will hunt him to the ends of hell to kill him. However, the boy remains unfazed, punching the demon square in the face. He then strikes the demon's head with a torch, calling him his father's enemy. Enraged, the demon curses them, claiming they will be doomed to corruption. Once again, Leon commands him to be silent. Balters, the demon of pleasure and corruption, is imprisoned. Reflecting on how, in his 34 years as a demon, he tortured and corrupted countless humans. Shortly after, a small robot appears in front of his cell. This confuses Balters as he realizes he cannot corrupt a machine. The robot requests that the demon provide information. Balters laughs, declaring he would never obey someone inferior to him. The small machine turns and reports that the prisoner did not cooperate. Several soldiers then arrive. However, the demon remains unafraid, saying they can kill him if they wish. One of the guards brings a basin, and the creature asks what it is. The robot explains that it contains water mixed with 15% holy water. Upon hearing this, the demon grows fearful. The machine reiterates the need for information and states that the water will retrieve the information. The soldiers then submerge the demon into the water. Balters screams in agony. When they pull him out, his face is burned. The creature curses and insults everyone around him. Seeing his lack of cooperation, the machine submerges him again in the holy water. This makes Balters scream for mercy. When pulled out again, the demon insists he knows nothing, but the machine deems this uncooperative and submerges him once more. By the end of the torture, the demon provides 30,564 characters of information. However, the robot remarks that this is 9,013 characters below the average from other captives, and that he can provide more. Balters questions how it could know how much the others spoke. The machine responds that failing to provide sufficient information justifies the prisoner's execution. Frightened, the demon decides to reveal everything he knows. The robot then informs Leon that all information from the 32 creatures has been gathered with a response similarity of over 89%. The protagonist commends Sir Spinner for a job well done. He then inquires about what was done with the demons after interrogation, and the robot reports that they were all eliminated. Leon smiles, stating that this is excellent, for the sound of justice is always pleasing to hear. He then falls silent, dropping his glass of wine. Spinner detects several changes in his body. Leon rises, visibly upset, and declares that he cannot accept the fact that these vile creatures live on the same land as him. He then asks the robot what they should do about it. Spinner responds that they should eliminate them all. Leon likes that plan. They break a window. Upon landing on the ground, Leon declares it's time for a nighttime stroll. The man walks among the demons. He asks his purple orb if it's safe for him to walk there. The orb advises him not to look directly at the demons, as mortals are easily corrupted. The demon then appears, questioning why that human is in his place of revelry. He suggests the human must not know what fear is. The old man is startled by the demon's malevolent energy. His orb tells the androgynous demon not to be arrogant. The creature recognizes this fear as one without character or common sense. The goblin who had experienced sudden success. The acorn states that it has an irresistible offer for the demon. The creature laughs and tells the sphere to know its place. It questions whether the goblin believes it could stand against him, considering most of his demons and his lord were already dead. The acorn comments that the demon's people were also dead. It adds that it wasn't just his lord who perished in the Great Ascension 180 years ago, and that it knows the ruthless events that occurred there. 180 years ago, to dominate the world, 5 archdemons advanced together for the first time, but the results were disastrous. 3 demon lords were defeated, and all their subordinates were killed by Leon. More than 10 million demons lost their lives. That goblin was one of the few survivors of that paradisiacal place. The demon asks if the goblin knows what truly happened there. The sphere states it has a proposal to make, but Androgen says he isn't interested and will handle it on his own. The goblin mentions hearing rumors that Androgen is fulfilling an order from the most illustrious archdemon. The demon responds that it is almost complete since she is just a mere mortal. As they leave, the old man asks the sphere if they are finished there, and it responds that this is the most effective method they have. It states the odds of victory are 7-3, with 7 favoring Androgen and 3 favoring the boy. The old man questions if teaming up with 2 others and an S-rank mage would improve their chances, but the goblin refuses to leave its sphere. The sphere then suggests they head to the corpse collectors near the palace forest. It explains that those demons are known for their attack power. Upon arriving, they encounter a creature, and the old man asks if it's one of them. The acorn confirms it's a corpse collector. However, there's something wrong with the demon as it's severely injured. The goblin then instructs the old man to hide. Suddenly, something emerges from the trees. It ensnares the demon. The creature begins screaming for help. Seeing this, the goblin and the old man are terrified. Moments later, Leon appears, asking if Spinner has finished his part. The small robot responds that there are likely more still alive. The protagonist states there must still be more demons. The acorn explains to the old man that it hid their presence using stealth abilities. The old man questions how that's possible, as he didn't hear the boy approach. The sphere explains that it is the divine law of silence from the Templar Knights, capable of silencing even the gallop of horses. Leon used this law to kill all the demons in the forest. Shortly after, the protagonist senses something strange, noting an unpleasant energy in the air. The old man becomes nervous as Leon gets very close to him. Then Spinner starts beeping and Leon asks what happened. The robot explains that the satellite detected a target. Leon decides to head to the location. After Leon departs, the old man feels relieved, saying it was a close call. Back in the city, Leon uses a bucket of water to clean himself. He then comments that demons of pleasure and corruption are perverts with a distorted sense of desire. He wonders why so many of those demons are present in this portal, including some of high rank and elite status, leading him to believe there must also be an archman. Then someone appears behind him. They remark that he must be tired. They suggest he take a moment to rest. A beautiful woman greets the knight. She asks if she should call him the King of Lionheart. Leon closes his eyes, noting that the woman is truly beautiful. She exudes sensuality effortlessly, symbolizing destruction and the cause of conflicts. An ordinary person wouldn't notice their own downfall as they drown in her beauty. The woman introduces herself as Beatrice Sparrow, the queen of that small kingdom. The protagonist introduces himself, stating he is the King of Lionheart. Leon reflects on how he hadn't realized this earlier. The queen tells him he doesn't need to be so cautious. She only wanted to greet the person who saved her kingdom. However, Leon responds that this is not an appropriate time for a noblewoman like her to make visits. The woman remains silent. She then mentions that she's being watched. Leon asks who is doing this, but the queen remains silent. But then she says it was the general and his knights. The protagonist is surprised upon hearing this and thinks about how the general didn't seem like someone capable of such acts. Beatrice says there's no time to lose and that she has a favor to ask of him. The boy replies that he will decide whether to accept it after hearing the request. The queen then asks him to kill the general and his knights, and promises that if he does so, she will give him her kingdom as a reward. The protagonist falls silent after hearing the request. The queen steps closer to him and tells him to investigate the castles underground. She says there is something there that the general is hiding. Afterward, the general arrives with his subordinates, calling for His Majesty Lionheart. He apologizes for disturbing him in the middle of the night, but says he must open the door. Upon opening it, he finds the boy alone. Leon asks what kind of insolence this is, and the general explains that the situation is urgent. The protagonist then says that he has spoken with the queen, and questions whether the general will not ask why his sovereign left in the middle of the night. However, the man responds that she has always been like that. The boy says that the general left the royalty unguarded while demons crawled across the kingdom. The man replies that demons do not attack at night, but Leon retorts that such claims are nonsense. He states that those creatures don't care about time and that the general should already know this. Leon thinks that an idiot like him should never have become a general. The general apologizes for his rudeness and says he is leaving. But before he can, Leon remarks that the queen had told him that he was keeping her captive. The general becomes irritated and says that this is not a matter for an outsider to concern himself with. And then he closes the door. Leon believes there's something he doesn't know about this place. To uncover the truth, he decides to investigate the underground. He calls for Spinner and asks him to check something for him. The demons approach the kingdom with the intent to torture and kill everyone. And Androgen promises that the first to scale the walls will be rewarded with 100 slaves. Suddenly, a spear flies toward them, striking the demons directly. The souls of the monsters begin to leave their bodies, drawn into Leon's chalice. The boy declares that these beings do not understand death, but he will teach them the value of life. He invites the demons to advance toward him, declaring that their worst nightmare is here. Someone calls for General Ricardo, saying they thought he was on the battlefield, but the man replies that the outsider will take care of everything. He states that the real problem is the seal and asks if it's functioning properly. His subordinate confirms that it is. Meanwhile, Spinner observes the conversation. Ricardo says they are close and just need a little more patience, and then a century of resentment will be fulfilled. The demons are defeated, and some remnants are taken as prisoners. One of them stumbles and falls to the ground. As the night approaches, he tells the creature to be careful, but realizes it's a beautiful woman who pleads for him to untie her. She promises to give him something in return if he does. Man steps closer to the woman. However, his resistance to corruption activates, revealing that the beautiful woman is actually a demon. Realizing he was being deceived, the knight strikes the creature. The demon asks how a normal human resisted her seduction. The man thinks he almost fell into that trap. Shortly after, Leon appears mounted on a white horse. He asks who is causing trouble. The knight points to the demon. Furious, the protagonist demands how it dared to seduce one of his soldiers with such a disgusting form, and the creature begs for forgiveness. However, the boy kicks the monster's face, saying he doesn't need the apologies of a demon. The remaining creatures watch in fear, thinking the protagonist is more demonic than a demon. Leon and his subordinates return to the kingdom. One of his men remarks that something feels off. They have returned with a great victory, but the people's reaction is lukewarm. Leon explains that even a lesser demon can easily seduce and corrupt a human. The war against demons is eternal, which is why only a few elites rejoice in victory. That is the nature of the war against these creatures. Therefore, he states they must make the citizens themselves hang the demons. The knight is shocked but obeys the boy. Leon says they have returned victorious, but there is no one to welcome them. At the castle entrance, two men stand guard. They notice Leon arriving with his men. The guards attempt to stop him, saying he doesn't have authorization to approach. However, Leon ignores them, kicking both the guards and the door. He tells his subordinates to move forward. While descending the stairs, one soldier asks if it's a problem to invade like this, and another responds that it's easier to ignore such matters. The knight leading the way calls the others to see something. Upon reaching the bottom step, they encounter a bed, and one of the men questions why there's such a place in the basement. Leon wonders if this is what the queen mentioned and states it's clear they are hiding something. He decides to approach and see what it is. Pulling back the curtains, he finds the queen sleeping. The boy's subordinates are mesmerized by her beauty. Leon tells them to resist and not succumb to the dark energy, but they don't listen to him. The protagonist remarks that this time his aura alone won't suffice. He decides to knock out all of his men. However, one of his subordinates stabs himself to resist the temptation. Leon, in turn, takes his chalice and asks the young man to take a deep breath. His mind clears immediately. Ricardo arrives and is amazed that Leon wasn't seduced by Her Majesty. After seeing that none of Ricardo's men were tempted, Leon finally understands what he is witnessing. The general tries to explain that it's because they are used to it, but Leon dismisses it as nonsense. He states that the queen's allure is akin to a curse, not something one can grow accustomed to. Leon further mentions that he has encountered this type of power before, the Lady of Pleasure, a seductive force that tempts all living beings and a demonic pleasure that leads individuals astray. Leon says he despises demons more than anyone, but does not feel such energy coming from the queen. Ricardo silently observes the protagonist's entire speech. Leon then asks why none of them seem surprised. He drops a purple petal into his chalice. He invokes the blessing of the deity of dreams and death. A beautiful woman appears. She announces that she will heed the prayers of the King of Lionheart. Leon greets Plu. He states that, according to his prayers, he descended to her and the goddess acknowledges it. She says the demons of corruption have created chaos. In this endless dream, they are forming a corrupt consciousness. Dreams are something one must wake from eventually. She uses her magic and commands them to reveal their true forms. It is then revealed that Ricardo is actually a Death Knight. Leon understands why he hadn't noticed before. The skeletons begin advancing, declaring that the queen's rest must not be disturbed. One of Leon's knights warns that enemies are also approaching from the rear. The protagonist thinks Ricardo is not an evil, corrupted being. Leon then draws his sword and declares that if that's the case, the dream of this portal begins with the queen. The Death Knight charges at Leon, but Leon defends himself. A second skeleton tries to attack him. With great difficulty, Leon manages to dodge. Leon then states that this is a one-on-one combat. He questions whether they plan to betray the honor of a knight. However, he orders all his subordinates to advance, saying Ricardo betrayed his honor long ago. Fearlessly, Leon asks if Ricardo thinks he can block him while attacking from both sides. When Ricardo tries to attack, one skeleton uses its shield to defend its companion. Leon grabs the skeleton's head and slams it into the ground. The protagonist thinks that, as Ricardo is now undead, he must have become weaker. Leon then plunges his sword into the ground, declaring that with distorted pride and honor, Ricardo will not protect anything. Seeing this, the Death Knight grows concerned for his queen. Ricardo states that with just one strike, all of Leon's subordinates were defeated. Leon points his sword at the undead knight. He commands him to awaken from this futile dream. But Leon senses something is wrong. While all others became unfaithful, the apostles did not. He questions why the queen asked him to kill him. Leon begins to suspect that she may be the true villain. He then asks the Death Knight to tell him the story. The queen was already on the brink of ruin and could do nothing but accept it, even if this is a trap set by the demon. 5 years later, after endless pleasures and tortures, more corrupted individuals descended into madness. During the day, the queen watched as demons killed her people, and at night, the corrupted would come to whisper to her. The first years were manageable, but her opponent was the archdemon of pleasure. The demon's trap was cunning and cruel, leaving no loopholes in the contract she had already accepted. Those who committed suicide to escape the contract would become wandering spirits in the underworld. And once the 100-year contract ended, they would all become servants of corruption. Because of this, Beatrice gradually descended into madness. As she watched her kingdom crumble, the essence of corruption planted within her body continually seduced her. 50 years later, a decision was made. Ricardo gathered his men and declared that those who were still alive would not be able to resist the seduction. Thus, they would all take their own lives to protect the queen and square their loyalty. They then became wandering spirits in the underworld. And at the end of the 100-year contract, they turned into servants of corruption for violating the demon's terms. The skeleton reveals that they killed themselves and became Death Knights. In doing so, they sealed their own queen. This seal remained active for 80 years. All they could do was make her sleep for half a day. After hearing the skeleton's account, Leon states that he understands. This happened because the queen herself asked them to kill her. Soon after, one of the goddesses calls the protagonist. She asks if he had felt it. The boy replies that he has. He says that a terrifying creature has been watching him. Liam assumes it must be demons. He commands the soldiers of King Onler to rise and asks how long they intend to keep sleeping. At that moment, the soldiers awaken, asking what happened. Shortly after, the protagonist grabs one of them. He tells them they must fulfill their duty. Then the goddess asks the skeleton if they should finish their conversation. Above the castle, the protagonist's soldiers notice that Leon is there. They mention that demons have breached the castle walls. Another man observing the scene appears astonished. He sees that many of those monsters are in the area. Leon silently observes it all. The protagonist's group begins to march. Another man orders them to raise their shields. He states that His Majesty instructed them to hold their positions. Therefore, they must stop the enemies at all costs. If they succeed, the protagonist will handle the rest. A different monster commands his slaves to work. He orders them to advance with pleasure. The system alerts that their pain is turning into pleasure. Quickly, they charge toward the group. The robot announces that the weapons are unlocked and the battle must begin. Leon, determined, orders Thoros to charge at once. He quickly mounts his horse. Thus, the battle begins. The soldiers grow frustrated as it is extremely difficult, yet they must endure. One soldier becomes overwhelmed. Countless monsters charge toward Leon. The man, in disbelief, declares that they are doomed. But at that moment, a massive light engulfs the battlefield. The protagonist, in rage, emerges once more. He declares that this is for his kingdom. A demon of pleasure is strong because of its numbers. They are not skilled in combat, but with that kind of buff, they become far more troublesome for the protagonist to handle. Leon states that this is a trick used by archdemons. He thinks he needs more stored power, wondering if he will be able to achieve it with the power he currently has. But in that moment, he takes a deep breath. Determined, he declares that he absolutely must succeed. He summons his sword once again. At the same time, the knights appear, urging the advance. The protagonist's troop, along with the queen, pushes forward. They successfully charge toward all the monsters. At that moment, another general greets the protagonist. Leon, smiling, remarks that he must have awakened from his dream. The general says that his loyalty to the queen remains steadfast. He mentions that they have already experienced many losses. However, if Leon can bring about change, it will be wonderful. Therefore, they will do everything they can to help the protagonist. With a smile, Leon says he will meet their expectations. Amidst it all, the protagonist stands as a symbol of hope. Even in times when the world had fallen into the hands of demons, and even when the gods flood into his heart, Leon then transforms into a different form. He calls upon the deity of the fire ward to answer his summon. A massive explosion engulfs the battlefield. Another god remarks that Leon continues to sacrifice himself. If not for him, that flame might have been extinguished. Leon states that you will always stand by their side until they can stand on their own. Witnessing the protagonist's overwhelming power, the monsters seem very afraid. Shortly after, Leon draws his sword. He declares that he is the greatest might of the deity of war and fire. Therefore, his might calls upon him. It is all for the purpose of eradicating the evil that resides in this place. At that moment, a golden bull begins to materialize. Leon mounts it immediately. At the same time, his horse vanishes. The boy thanks his horse for its service and allows it to rest. Without hesitation, Leon draws one of his swords. He instructs all the soldiers to follow him. He declares that he will lead them to victory. A soldier observing this remarks how dangerous it is. He claims that taking the vanguard alone is madness. Nonetheless, the protagonist charges toward the monsters. The monsters say they must kill Leon immediately. Leon, seeing this, is surprised. He asks if they don't understand the concept of cavalry. Charging forward is like holding a sword against a lance. Shortly after, the bull charges at one of the monsters. The system announces that the strongest attacker is being utilized. Thus, multiple monsters are eliminated at once. Another general, watching this, is astonished. The protagonist is wiping out all his troops with extreme ease. The man, bewildered, wonders what kind of power this is. He questions why they can't hold him off for even a second. He orders his forces to fire the magical cannons and obliterate Leon at once. The monsters begin their barrage. Leon declares that there is no honor in those cowardly long-range weapons. He successfully defends against all the attacks. He charges once more at the monsters. At that moment, the general charges directly at Leon. He demands that Leon die immediately. He lands a successful hit. However, it seems to have no effect. The general realizes he cannot sense Leon and wonders where he has gone. Suddenly, Leon appears above him. Leon dives for the monster, who narrowly evades the attack. The general yells at his subordinates, asking why they haven't killed Leon yet. Leon then draws his sword again. He asks the monster to hold on a moment and endure for just a minute. The monster, desperate, thinks to itself that Leon is just one person, yet so immensely powerful. It wonders if the knights of that destroyed nation were truly such monstrous beings. The monster asks if Leon was responsible for the death of Dotaran. Hearing the name, Leon becomes thoughtful. He asks if the monster is referring to that sickly demon with the enormous belly. Leon confirms that he killed Dotaran and cut his inferior minions into pieces. For that reason, the monster's turn would come soon. However, Leon notes that this monster has a few more limbs to cut. Hearing Leon's words, the monster becomes enraged. It declares that no matter what happens, it will end Leon's life. The monster hurls one of its weapons at Leon. Leon responds that the attack isn't powered by the monster's own strength. Instead, it relies on magical energy. That's why they are all extremely weak. Leon then throws his sword. It strikes the monster's shoulder. The monster is shocked that Leon repelled all its attacks and severed its arm. Leon reiterates what he said before. He will slice it across its entire body. In seconds, Leon charges at the monster again. However, the monster merely smiles. At that moment, the monster activates its desire ability, which grants it a significant buff. Leon's soldiers, observing this, remark that it's incredibly dangerous. Even so, Leon successfully lands a strike on the monster. The monster is stunned, wondering how Leon escaped the illusion of its desire. Leon responds that not even the Lady of Pleasure could tempt him. He asks how someone like the monster could manage it. The monster, observing Leon, thinks something is wrong. All beings should have some kind of desire. Regardless, the monster decides it needs to flee. However, escaping won't be so easy as the golden bull is already charging at it. The bull successfully knocks the monster to the ground. Leon steps onto the monster's chest. The monster accuses Leon of being a coward since a divine entity interfered in the fight. It states that knights should be fair. Leon agrees, saying it's true that it's not honorable to have a third party interfere in a duel. However, he declares that there is no honor for demons. Because this isn't a duel, it's an extermination. As it nears death, the monster remarks that the protagonist is extremely prejudiced. At the same moment, Leon strikes his attack. As a result, the demon of pleasure and corruption was slain. The kingdom prospered in its early days, and the people enjoyed abundance and peace. Everyone believed that this peace would last forever, until the demon invasion began. The wise magical queen already knew this would happen. The spirit of those inferior beings would eventually reach her kingdom. At first, they achieved consecutive victories. These victories gave hope to all the people, but this hope did not last long. The queen realized that the demons reappeared even after death. The girl said that this war was lost from the start. No matter how many victories they achieved or how many demons they defeated, in the end, they would always return. She questioned how unfair that world was. Destruction was approaching little by little. Sitting on her throne, a hooded man appeared. He said he would make a deal with her. He asked her to harbor the essence of corruption and relive the kingdom's collapse for 100 years. If she was not corrupted, the invasion of that world would cease. Furthermore, everything would be restored to normal. The girl didn't even have time to question whether she should believe him. She quickly accepted the deal, even though it was a trap from that demon. But even so, it was the only way to protect those she loved. Thus, the fall of the Kingdom of Hope began to oscillate between pleasure and corruption. The radiant citizens, the loyal knights, and the proud queen quickly succumbed to evil. Those who chose this path never returned to normal. In the end, a knight could not contain his desires. He invaded the queen's chamber. The general confined the queen in the underground catacombs. He took his own life to become a ghost. Thus began a decade of regret and devastation, a destiny of ruin that repeated itself without choice. She wished that nightmare would end once and for all. Soon after, the scene shifts to the protagonist analyzing some equipment. He asks if that was the crown and weapon the demon used. He also asks the robot if it liked the material. The robot responds that it was made of a highly resistant metal. Therefore, it would be very useful. Leon mentions that the equipment was corrupted by evil. He believes it imprisons souls. The robot says elimination was possible. Leon says that if that was best, he would leave it to the robot. Shortly after, Leon begins to examine the crown. At the same moment, one of the divinities appears. She asks the boy to show her the crown he took after defeating the demon. The protagonist confesses that he was afraid it might pollute his mind. But the goddess reassures him, saying it's fine. Then Leon shows the crown. The woman says he might not remember. But that was the crown all archdemons of pleasure shared. These sickly sexual demons lured youths into a meaningless illusion. She suggests she could extract some power from the crown. Leon states the item was corrupted and that he intended to get rid of it. However, if the goddess wanted it, he would give it to her. The girl thanks him and mentions that he had done an excellent job once again. For that reason, the pantheon is happy and grateful for his honor. Next, that goddess asks someone else to at least say hi so she can greet them. Thus, another divinity appears. Congratulating the protagonist on his good work, the other goddess says he should learn to be more honest. Shortly after, Leon says he has a request to make to the two of them. He asks to take the souls of all those. The man asks if he means guiding those bodies to the soul paradise, because they were excluded from the cycle of life and death. The other goddess says that was a bit harsh, since the cycle of life and death was her domain. Therefore, it wasn't her job to interfere with it. The man asks what kind of divinity would allow the undead to enter paradise. Thus, an awkward silence begins. Soon after, that divinity ends up calling for Leon. She says that those who oppose the death penalty should escape the cycle in the same way. Shortly after, the other girl appears. She asks to forgive all the knights. However, the soldier asks to take care of himself. The girl, apologizing, says she would like to ask him to reconsider the queen's failure of a ruined nation. However, the goddess says that no one in the pantheon would accept those souls into paradise. Yet there was one more possibility. Their good deeds outweighed the bad, and thus their loyalty touched the gods. Moreover, the king of Leon and Art asked to take care of their souls. For this reason, there is no better approval than that. She will purify the corrupted souls and give them a new chance at life. For this reason, she got a suggestion for the queen of a foreign nation. It was the only way her knights could find rest. She should become their saint and help the king of Leon and Art spread the faith. When all this happens, it will give his knights the chance to reincarnate again. Hearing everything the goddess had said, the girl ends up accepting the proposal. Shortly after, the scene shifts to the protagonist alongside the robot and the queen. The boy seems to be observing something. A group of soldiers was in front of him. Soon after, one of them approaches. The protagonist asks for a report on the damage. The man responds that most of the injured are being treated thanks to the clerics. However, the Night Kings have perished. Sometime later, the protagonist stands before their bodies. He thinks that against a sea of demons, those injuries are considered minimal. Drawing his sword, he says they could at least pray for them. Thus, he draws his sword and places it on the ground. He begins to pray. He says the warriors who were there met honorable deaths. For this reason, their souls should be guided. If there were sins they committed, they should be forgiven. Thus, they could enjoy their celebration with the gods. Shortly after, Leon asks for a list of those who perished. He asks to notify their respective families, because the pantheon will not forget their sacrifice. At the same moment, all the bodies begin to glow. The protagonist says they should leave soon. Then a system screen appears. It informs that the gate to paradise has been opened. The effect of Leon Rurt blessed that soul. For this reason, they will be able to enter paradise. The association sent all available hunters to respond to an unprecedented floating portal. A week after their entry, the protagonist and his group returned. They were successful in the portal. Thus, the association's president registered Beatrice as a new survivor, expressing condolences to the hunters who had fallen. Leon says he was sure he saw the videos Spinner had made. The man replies that he did. It was a floating red portal like an Archman. It was a miracle there weren't more deaths. Hearing what the man said, the protagonist seems displeased. He says he plans to meet the families of the deceased. The man asks if it's on his own initiative. Leon replies that they were his soldiers. Therefore, it's the least he can do. Then the man says he might hear unpleasant things. The protagonist responds that he can understand how the families of the deceased feel. For this reason, he thinks they would feel better hearing the news directly from him. He asks to share the video and gather more hunters, because the demons will invade their world soon. For this reason, they needed more soldiers and knights to prepare. Leon states that he will make a schedule and deliver it as soon as it's ready. Shortly after, the scene shifts to the Pantheon's mansion. The protagonist seems apprehensive as he observes his plantation. He thinks the movements of the demons are very suspicious. For this reason, urgent help was needed. This time he will have to go on his own. At that moment, he seems to be teleported to a kind of abyss. Shortly after, he appears in the middle of a forest. When he opens his eyes, someone welcomes him. A girl says that her humble servants are delighted to greet him. While walking, the protagonist says it's been a long time since he last saw them. He asks how they are finding paradise. The girl replies that everything is great, because thanks to his protection, everything is going well. Observing his companions, Leon mentions that they all seem to be doing well. Another man says he would have come to that place sooner if he knew how good it was. Then another man calls out to the protagonist. He mentions that it has been a long time since he last saw him. Leon apologizes if he is interrupting his rest. The man replies that it's all right. Our boy says there must be new souls that have come to this place. He asks if, by any chance, they have seen them. The man says it has been 180 years since they received those souls. For this reason, they are being maltreated. Thus, he should not worry. Furthermore, he is sure there is some reason for the protagonist to be there. He asks what it could be. Our boy responds that he wishes to greet the gods of the pantheon. He wants to have a meeting to discuss something. However, the situation is very urgent. For this reason, he will need the wisdom of the predecessors. The man says they will need to go to the forest. For this reason, he will lend him his horse. Shortly after, the scene shifts to the protagonist riding a winged horse. Looking down, he notices something. He thinks that one day he will have to run through those fields, but it was clear he couldn't do that without leaving a successor. Shortly after, they arrive at the place they wanted. An unknown voice begins to emanate from among those trees. It says that the protagonist is the legitimate lord of Dragonia and the owner of the sacred relics. Leon then apologizes for entering its territory. That voice says that all living beings are in debt to him, and even the gods should owe him. Because of this, the forest would always welcome him, and Leon says he was touched by its kindness. The voice then asks the reason the protagonist was in that place. The young man replies that he wanted to greet the youngest of them all, who was also his friend. Shortly after, a tree begins to speak, asking what brought him to that place. Liam responds that he needed its help, because as he recalled, he had gone to the army of paradise without planting a sapling. The tree asks if he was recounting events so hastily. The boy responds that in that world, his home and land were under the demon's invasion. That's why he was certain of it after a recent expedition, because they noticed his presence and began their schemes. The tree says it could happen as it did in the Empire. However, it would rot from the inside out. Agreeing to help the protagonist, the tree says he was the only one who could take those things from the kingdom. It asks him to take that branch, trusting that the protagonist would take good care of it. Moreover, it was great to see him after all this time. However, it still wanted to say one more thing. It asked him not to rush and to go to that location. Shortly after, the scene cuts to the entrance of a castle. Another person ends up calling the protagonist, asking if, by chance, he was already leaving. It asked him to at least take that as a gift, because it believed he needed it more than anyone else at that moment, and it knew there was a limit to how much he could carry from that place. However, those are readings from a renowned beast tamer who could tame even monsters. Shortly after, the other man also says he wanted to give a gift. Thus, he hands over an unknown book to him. He says he had heard that Leon was training his army from the very basics. That's why he was sure that it could be very frustrating. Then the other girl also wanted to gift Leon. She asked him to take that necklace. The boy replies that it was a sacred relic of a saint and could only be passed by another saint, asking if he could really keep it. The girl responds that she was certain he would protect it until his sacred sword was reborn. For that reason, he should take it. Content with all the gifts, our protagonist thanks everyone. And because of that, he promises to make good use of all of them. Shortly after, the scene shifts to the real world. Leon seems to be walking through the hallways of a house. Thus, he arrives at a door saying he was the king of Leon Mert, asking if by chance he was allowed to visit. Then it's revealed that Beatrice was on the other side of the door, where she soon opens it, asking if by chance the boy wasn't going to enter. Leon replies that she hadn't given him permission. In response, the girl simply smiles, mentioning that he was too serious. She asks him to enter the room again. Leon, entering her room, apologizes for not having a better place prepared for her. Beatrice responds that it was unnecessary for a queen of a ruined nation. That's why she only hoped he would forgive her rudeness. Leon then asks her not to worry about it, thinking that she probably couldn't do anything about her own aura. He says that the divinity inside her was suppressing the essence of corruption. However, it was not able to remove it completely. Therefore, the balance would probably be maintained as time passed. He asks if, by chance, they could share a farewell drink for the knights. The girl then says that was all she could do. Leah mentions that it had been 2 days since she arrived at that place. He asks how the adaptation was going, and the girl replies that she thought she would need more time, because that place was completely different from her world before. The protagonist says she didn't need to adjust completely, because she should have determination and follow her own laws. For a king needed to have their rules and virtues wherever they went. The criminals of all worlds just need to follow the king's path. Beatrice says that was the kind of thinking of an invader. However, Leon replies that it was different, because threatening the world for desire was the ambition of an individual. However, helping people and teaching them was the enlightenment of the king of Leon Mert. Beatrice thinks she understood that and believed he was capable of fighting demons for hundreds of years. She says it seemed like the enemy he was facing wasn't just the demons. Leon replies that it was true because he had a divine mission given by the divinities, and that's why he was offering that to her. He asks if, by any chance, she would like to join him on that mission. Beatrice, hearing what the protagonist said, smiles. She says she is indebted to him, and as a queen, she cannot refuse his request. However, she still desires something more. She asks how to eliminate the demon of pleasure. Leon says that if it's about killing those disgusting things, he would do anything, because it makes his heart race every time he shows them how he annihilates their souls with the dreaded divine laws. In his kingdom, they used to execute them by throwing them into boiling water, and they kept coming back no matter how many times they were killed. He asks if, by any chance, she has ever hammered them beneath their claws. Thus, the two end up making a toast. The scene shifts to the protagonist's plantation. Meanwhile, the queen seems to be walking towards somewhere. However, she ends up noticing something, because Beatrice, along with Leon, were nearby and the girl asks if they are okay. Then Leon asks her to serve them some tea. Leon says that for now, the girl could work for Queen Beatrice. Moreover, she should dress better when in the presence of the queen. The queen asks if she had said her name was Queen, and the girl replies that she did. The queen says she can feel a strong energy coming from her. Therefore, if it's okay, she would like to take a look. Thus, Leon asks her to try using her sword, because she should have been serving him for a long time by now, and for that reason, he thought she deserved a reward. He asks the queen to show her sword technique because the protagonist will personally observe. Shortly after, Leon hands the girl a sword. She then strikes her attack. Leon says her movements were too wide. He asks if it was to use her skills, and the girl replies that she did it for that reason. Our boy responds that when using a sword, it should be powerful and much faster. Thus, he begins a demonstration. As a consequence, part of the ground ends up breaking. He says it should be much easier, so she should practice it more than 10,000 times a day. Beatrice says she still fails to control the fire, because it dissipates easily, and instead of emanating fire on the sword and attacking as she did before, she should focus the fire on the sword. Thus, as a consequence, it could be used more easily, as if it were a kind of concentrated flame that doesn't dissipate easily. The queen begins to perform sequences of attacks with that flaming sword. She says that when releasing the concentrated flames, it should be done in a deadly strike, and it should be done in such a way as if she were stabbing. As a consequence of the queen's attack, a giant beam of light begins to envelop the sky. The girl says she just needs to concentrate her hand enough so that it's as hot as that, mentioning that it's very easy. Shortly after, the scene shifts to the queen in her room, apparently very tired. She says she has a lot to do, because she has to report to the session chief and also to the association president, in addition to buying various things for the soldiers in training. Desperate, the girl wonders what she should do because the academy didn't teach those kinds of things. Shortly after, that robot ends up appearing, scaring the girl. The machine says it is requesting a division in accounting work to maximize efficiency. The queen then remembers that the robot is a supercomputer. For this reason, she is sure this will be very easy for him. Thus, she begins to explain everything that happened to the robot. Then, the robot starts saying a lot of strange things. The girl, displeased, thinks he didn't understand anything she said. Then the girl says she needs clothes for when she's working as a servant. She asks if, by any chance, there is a maid uniform. The robot says it can fetch an apron similar to those from medieval Europe. The girl replies that it's great, because she's afraid of being reprimanded for looking like a cosplayer. Thus, the robot seems to do what the girl asked. However, Harry didn't know that the data the robot referred to were entirely from online brands. As a consequence, the robot ends up purchasing the most popular item, which apparently was made for couples to have fun, if you know what I mean. Then the scene shifts to another location. A boy seems to be getting off the bus. Kim says more people came than he expected. Another young man says that after seeing that, it was expected. A few days earlier, Leon visited the Hunter Academy, saying that instead of soldiers, he came to find knight candidates. For this reason, he will teach them sword techniques and also spear techniques. Another boy raises his hand, saying he specialized in archery. Leon replies that he is disqualified, because that was the attitude of a soldier. Initially, all the students complained about those teachings, regarding the protagonist's arrogant and audacious attitude. Leon says that if he studied theology, he could teach them the simple divine laws. Shortly after, he seems to begin casting a spell in his hand, and soon they are convinced by his overwhelming power. Returning to the present, Kim says that power had been surreal, and the other boy says that anyone should be allowed to use magic. However, the other girl responds that it wasn't magic, because it couldn't be called anything at all. Kim then is surprised, because that girl was also in that place. She was quite curious about being called a commoner. Showing her phone, Chown asks how she couldn't come over after seeing that, because there was a video about the divine laws and floating portals on that channel. The other boy, observing that, asks if, by chance, that wasn't Han. Kim says that both he and Han had been working hard, asking if by chance she was now working in the Pantheon. The boy responds affirmatively, saying he was sure she was doing an excellent job at that exact moment. Then the scene cuts to Han wearing that maid outfit. Han asks if he's sure that outfit is appropriate, and the robot replies that it has 99% compatibility with the data. Next, the protagonist, along with that other boy, shows up at the door. The boy is delighted because he had heard Han's voice, and for that reason, he wanted to surprise her. The girl, surprised, remembers that they were supposed to have guests that day, and the robot responds that it would greet them if she were busy. Shortly after, that door begins to open. The boy's face appears. Noticing Han in that outfit, the girl starts greeting them, saying they must have had a long journey to get to that place. Seeing his sister like that, the boy is confused. He asks why she's wearing those clothes. She responds that she wasn't wearing them because she wanted to. Then Leon appears, questioning what kind of outfit that was. Calling her sulky, he says she should change immediately. With tears on her face, Han starts to leave. The robot informs that it's time for the second period intern's meal, and for that reason, they should be given salted water. Thus, the robot begins flying off toward the destined location. As a result of all that, the reunion with his respected sister turned out to be the worst. Next, the scene cuts to Jeju Island, and a red portal seemed to be in that place. Then a person appears, saying they had just arrived at that location. The girl says he bought the plane ticket as soon as money was mentioned, and for that reason, he was very greedy. However, the man responds that his guild's finances aren't the best, as she already knew. That's why everything had been taken from them in the Cheonju portal, so they had to make up for it somehow. Next, a man appears, saying it had been a long time since he'd seen them. The other man states that he had disappeared after the government blackmail incident, and that's why he was chosen for that mission. Hearing what the man had said, the other man remains silent, saying that at least he didn't have to witness the death of any of his guild members. Thus, the two begin staring at each other, asking if by chance the payment will be split 50-50. The man then questions what nonsense that was, because it was obvious he wouldn't work that much for so little. The boy questions who else would help, because he was the traitor hunter. Irritated, another man asks him not to cross the line. Thus, they start arguing to determine how the profits will be divided. The other girl, watching that, says it was very foolish, wondering what the reason for all that was. At the same moment, another woman appears. The woman, whose name was Yuri, asks her to stop swearing, because they should at least be united before the dungeon breaks. That's why 3 S-rank hunters and 1 almost at that rank were enough to clear a lower S-rank portal. Thus, everything should be manageable in an easier way. Shortly after, the scene cuts to that man seemingly surprised by something, because inside that dungeon, there was a massive massacre, and the other unknown soldier asks if they dare try to save those insects. That's why an honored Templar Knight of Leon and Art would grant them divine punishment. Then the system announces that the mission to save the defeated knights has begun, and the condition for completion was to defeat that unknown man. The soldier in turn asks if they, by chance, are outsiders. Moreover, he wants to know why they attacked the royal army. For this reason, what your war hammer will do next will depend on your answer. The irritated girl asks what he is talking about. The other man then warns that there seems to be a misunderstanding, because the knight in that place attacked them first, and therefore he had no choice but to defend himself. Shortly after, the man places his hammer on the ground. He says he had warned that his impatience would lead to his ruin, asking how he could use the goddess's name with such reckless actions. The other man apologizes for it. Thus, the soldier ends up asking for forgiveness for his subordinate's actions. The other man replies that he's glad the misunderstanding was resolved, thinking that it was much easier to handle than expected, because things would be much better this way. However, the man still wanted something, saying that an inferior mercenary killing 6 kingdom soldiers was a severe sin, and since 6 of his men had died, it should be repaid in kind, by killing 60 soldiers from his group. Then the scene shifts to the protagonist and Han's residence. Along with his brother and the rest of the group, they seem to be heading toward that location. Kim, observing everything, notices it's just a rural area, and there are no modern facilities in that place. Moreover, he wonders why so many people are only drinking water at the cafeteria. Shortly after, Han announces they have arrived at the location, and Kim seems very surprised by what he's seeing, asking if that's really the place where the soldiers are being trained. For this reason, he's very surprised, wondering if it's actually a real training site. Han explains that everything there has a meaning, because they could all experience this. For this reason, they are very lucky to see it. At that moment, the protagonist appears. He begins a speech, saying that they have visitors, to see if they want to join his army. Thus, they should stop their training and sit down immediately. At that moment, everyone does as the boy instructed, and Han asks the protagonist to take a seat in that place. Liam asks Han to stay with the students, because he needs to start preparing to become the mission knight. Hearing what the boy said, Han accepts his orders. He begins to sit with all of them. The protagonist announces they will begin, stating that he will choose the most talented among them to become his disciples. Those chosen will be personally trained by him. For this reason, it is a great honor. Then Han tells his brother never to be rude to the protagonist. The boy is confused by that command. Shortly after, Leon says he wants to take a look at their abilities, asking everyone to raise their swords and attack him, and the time limit would be until the last one is out. For this reason, they have a holy grail, so they don't need to worry about injuries. At that moment, everyone stands up. Liam, pleased, says that there are 40 of them in total. For this reason, he would be very happy if at least one of them managed to hit him. Soon after, everyone begins to advance toward the boy. However, one of them ends up being thrown into the air. He is very surprised by the attack he received. As a consequence, he ends up unconscious. Shortly after, Leon asks everyone to come all at once, and one by one, they're all easily defeated. Leon, observing them, mentions that they have a long way to go. For this reason, he thought they would at least be at the level of a wandering knight. Han, observing Leon, says that he is strong. But for this reason, it feels like fighting against a boss. Moreover, there wasn't a single opening in him, because every time they tried to attack, nothing worked, and the protagonist could always predict all their movements, easily defeating them one by one. Back to the present, Leon says that it seems they have recovered enough. For this reason, he will continue with his explanation, mentioning that training as a soldier is very simple. For this reason, they should push their bodies without stopping. However, it's different for a knight, because Group 1, which resisted until the end, will need to reach the level of a kingdom knight, and the rest will need to improve at least one level of their skills. Then, another girl raises her hand, saying she doesn't quite understand his standards. Leon replies that in his kingdom, knights are categorized into 5 levels in total. The first level is a wandering knight who has yet to be named. Kingdom knights who prove themselves are named knights, and those who command them are the war knights. The remaining ones are mission knights who roam around, seeking missions from God and leaving his entire life behind, mentioning that he also had to embark on that journey, thus receiving and completing the mission of the goddess Adriana. And that was how he ended up becoming a Templar Knight. Then another boy raises his hand, asking why a Templar Knight held the highest rank. With a smile on his face, Leon replies that it was because he was a guardian of the degree, because that was the title given to the Templar Knight who succeeds the king of Leonberg, attempting to claim that title meant challenging him, and it was clear that any challenger would be killed instantly. For that reason, they should keep it in mind, stating that this would be the only time they could challenge him, because his powers at that moment had been weakened, and at that moment he was more like a Templar Knight. Kim, in turn, asks how strong a Templar Knight was, and the protagonist reflects on that question, saying that the strength of the Templar Knight was extremely difficult for a human to comprehend. Shortly after, the scene cuts to that girl from earlier opening her eyes. Irritated, she says it feels like her head is about to explode. She wonders why she was unconscious until that moment. Then another girl appears, saying she had finally woken up. Introducing herself as Ryuji from the Lumberjack tribe, she calls the girl a hero because she was the one who defended them from the ruthless troops of the kingdom. Then another man appears, happy because his sister was still alive. Her brother asks her what she remembers. She replies that she recalls a pulverized ground, and that she was escaping somehow. The man says she had lost an entire day's memory. However, that was understandable, because after the magic failed, they managed to find a way to escape that place, and the enemy soldiers were on foot, so it was difficult for them to pursue. However, that monster that had appeared was insane, because it chased her relentlessly, and that's when the Lumberjack tribe helped them. As a result, the girl was struck by a hammer while fighting that monster. For that reason, she should be grateful, as she had been on the brink of death for 2 days, and that girl had saved her. Moreover, the healers couldn't recover for some reason. The girl says the Templar Knight could curse others, preventing them from healing. At that moment, the woman touches the girl's shoulder. Observing the scar, she asks what it was. The other woman replies that she had inscribed that magic on her to aid her recovery, because those marks accelerated her healing. Apparently, it was a unique ability of the local tribes, and each of the marks had its specific effect. Shortly after, her brother asks if she, by chance, could stand up, mentioning that the group was about to hold a meeting. Then the scene cuts to an elder on a throne, saying that for years the Crown's army had been killing them. However, it still wasn't enough for them, because they executed their companions in horrendous ways. As a result, they had no option but not to resist, and 3 of their tribes ended up annihilated. Eventually, they sought help from the gods. As a result, those heroes, who were them, answered their call. Another man warns that the soldier was very strong, and another girl mentions they had 3 S-rank hunters and a team of 150 people. The other woman says that soldier had armor that could withstand the charge of a giant buffalo, and his regenerative abilities could be massive. Additionally, his army gained similar powers as long as he was alive. Another man says the only thing that worked on that guy was the bracer. Then another girl wonders if they, by chance, should get items that pierce armor, something that bypassed defenses. The other woman replies that the tribe's marking magic had a very similar effect, because it increased armor penetration by 35%. Additionally, it boosted strength. Another man observing those stats says it's incredible, because with that, they should have a better chance against that monster. Belv then feels satisfied, because it seemed like the preparations were complete. For that reason, the heroes should help them, and if they could do that, they would do everything possible. Then the scene cuts to a horse. After testing and training the academy cadets, Liam took them to a ranch on Jeju Island. Another boy then is surprised, because it was the first time he had seen a horse. At that moment, Leon appears in the place, saying that there were beautiful horses in that location. Moreover, the man should already know he was there to look for a war horse. The man then responds that he will immediately look for that kind of horse. Next, the protagonist seems to begin making an announcement. He says that for a knight, a horse is a lifelong companion, and it's crucial that they bond with their horse as if they were one. At that moment, they should approach one they liked and try to connect with it. Happily, all the cadets go toward the horses they like the most. The protagonist says he's counting on the man's support. The man replies that he will do his best. Meanwhile, Beatrice was walking toward that place very surprised, because there were so many horses there. Shortly after, Leon appears, thanking the queen for agreeing to meet him. A sudden request. He asks if he might have the honor of assisting a noble lady like her. The girl replies affirmatively. At that moment, the scene cuts to the ranch. The protagonist, along with the queen, seems to be selecting a horse. Beatrice then asks if he could recommend one. Thus, they begin choosing their horse. Liam asks Han to choose his course as well. The girl, on her part, seems thoughtful about it, supposing she should choose the white horse. However, the boy replies that the yellow horse was sturdy and muscular. For that reason, she should choose it. Noticing something, the protagonist seems very surprised. He asks Han to get out immediately. Shortly after, Leon extends his hand. He asks the protagonist to let him help her get on that horse. Then Liam begins assisting Beatrice in mounting the horse. At that moment, someone ends up calling for the young man. Leon, in turn, asks what all the noise is about. The man replies that there's an emergency call from the man from earlier, because it's a call from the president of the association. Then the man on the phone greets the protagonist, saying he hopes he's well. He says he would like to request assistance from the protagonist, because it seems a dungeon break is about to occur. Leon replies that helping him is not his responsibility, and he's not there to clean up his mess. However, the man responds that he called because he thought it might catch his attention, because they were discussing the goddess of life and abundance. Hearing what the man said, the protagonist is surprised, and the man continues, saying that the one who claims to be her knight is a portal boss. Sometime later, the scene shifts to that earlier dungeon. The protagonist, along with his group, seem to have entered it. Han, observing the surroundings, seems surprised by something. She mentions that it's all very cruel, because there are several dead people there. Leon, observing everything, seems very irritated. Then a flashback of that man appears, saying that Soldier was one of the survivors of that portal. At that moment, he was sedated for that reason and should wait a little longer. However, the protagonist replies that there's no need for that, and Leon says he will leave it to Beatrice. Thus, the girl seems to begin casting some kind of magic. The protagonist replies that there's no difficulty in that, asking her to create a new space in her dreams, because the creator of the world walking in cycles within the gate is, without a doubt, her. Seeing the man's memories, Beatrice says he was a knight wielding a war hammer. He claimed to be a knight blessed by the goddess of life and fertility. Irritated, the protagonist asks if she can tell the name of that knight. Beatrice replies that his name was Jovrik, and he seemed to refer to himself that way. Returning to the present, Beatrice mentions that much time has passed since the extermination fields were created. She asks if he thinks they were hunters. Liam in turn replies no, because after implementing their burning techniques, they killed everything. Beatrice says he seems to recognize it very well. The protagonist replies that he did something similar while defeating the orcs. He mentions that it's been a long time since they finished there. For that reason, if they follow the traces, they might discover what's happening in that place. Shortly after, the scene cuts to the protagonist's group running, following the tracks. Leon asks the girl to move forward. Beatrice questions if something is happening there. Leon replies that it seems insignificant, because, as he said, incomplete abilities are dangerous. A Templar knight could be in that place. He mentions that the goddess Demara's favored knight was Jovrik, who was a Templar knight 3 generations before his own, and his martial arts were passed down from generation to generation until his. 800 years ago, that man was described as having ascended to the heavens while preparing to hunt a wild tribe. However, that man did not go to paradise because a Templar knight is a saint who naturally receives the love of God. Beatrice, in turn, asks how that could happen. Leon responds that he even tracked the energy of the sacred item. However, he could not find the item or the troops anywhere. For that reason, there were 3 theories. The first was that the man could still be alive. The second was that he lost his soul along the way. Lastly, the worst possibility was that he might have switched sides. It was a matter involving a Templar knight with many powers. So if there were a battle, it would not take place in the mortal realm. As they raided that portal, they would uncover the truth about that story. Shortly after, the scene cuts to the protagonist observing several stakes with many people on them. The boy says that it was an atrocity. For that reason, it was entirely unacceptable. Thus, those criminals deserve to be killed. Observing this, Han wonders if His Majesty is enraged by such atrocities. However, it was expected since it could feel a little strange. But he was still a very just person. Shortly after, the protagonist begins making a declaration. He says that no matter what happens from now on, they should just follow him. Therefore, they shouldn't trust their eyes and minds. Accepting the offers, the protagonist says they already had everything they needed. For that reason, they should keep moving, because they believe they were very close to the destined location. Shortly after, the scene cuts to a battlefield. Those soldiers seem to be experiencing great pleasure from the battle. Han, along with the protagonist, observes this and is shocked. She says that it was a village and clearly they were attacking the villagers. Liam, seeing this, becomes furious. He says that allied forces were in danger and for that reason they should advance. Han, watching Leon, thinks he was furious because he could not tolerate people who killed others for no reason. She says that the boy was too fast, and for that reason they couldn't keep up with him. That already showed how furious the protagonist was. At the same moment, Han notices something, not believing that possibility. At the same moment, Beld notices something as well, because the protagonist was advancing directly toward him. Thus, he attacks the man, saying he would kill all of them. Han, observing this, is surprised, because Leonin finished them all quickly. He says that they were all insects, and that he didn't even want to hear their voices. Shortly after, he begins finishing them off with his sword. He says he would move on to the next prey, who, watching this, wonders if the protagonist had gone mad. Han, seeing this, thinks it's unbelievable, because Liam was siding with the soldiers. She states that it was wrong and for that reason needed to stop them. However, she notices something. Beatrice had intervened in that situation, asking Han to wait a moment. She says she should trust His Majesty because he probably had his reasons. Meanwhile, Leon seemed like a madman, shouting for everyone to die. Han, surprised, asks if he wasn't acting out of mere emotion. Beatrice assumes he was just a little excited. She says they would have no choice but to stand by. If they wanted to challenge him, they wouldn't be able to stop him. Han thinks that even so, the reason they didn't intervene was that they lacked a sense of justice. All the NPCs within the portal are fake, created from past memories, except for a few occasions, such as the Queen's, who is a survivor. The monsters and NPCs inside the portals are nothing more than remnants of memories from some past incident. If they were massacred, hanged, or even executed, it wasn't considered a sin. For that reason, the protagonist always went mad when he saw any of them. Shortly after, the scene cuts to all the soldiers lying on the ground. The protagonist group eventually arrives at the location. Shortly after, they bow before him. One of the soldiers says he is saluting the Templar Knight who was the living saint in that land. Liam, in turn, asks them to stand as they were still on the battlefield. Standing up, the man says his name is Tuzkada, and he is the brother of Lord Vendelic. He was affiliated with the Dawn Knights of Labanine. Leon says that was the city of Lanquil, asking if his brother was the lord of that place. The man then responds that he was the only one whose talent as a knight was recognized. Observing the man, the protagonist thinks he did not remember that person's name. If he had become a Templar Knight, you would probably meet him in paradise. This meant he had probably failed his mission or died amidst that attack. For this reason, he didn't recognize any of those faces. Those honorable knights must have failed to write their names into history. Introducing himself, the protagonist says his name is Leon, and he is the Lord of Dragonia, in addition to being the chosen one of Ariana, the goddess of light and justice. The group is surprised. They say he is surrounded by the presence of the glorious sacred light. Some even consider the possibility it might be a joke. Han, observing this, is shocked. She thinks that in their era, the protagonist must have been someone else. Shortly after, the man says he will trust the protagonist. Liam, in turn, says that as far as he knows, they are there to fight the barbarians. The man replies that he is correct. Our boy states that he was also right in saying the war knight of that place was the Templar Knight of Life and Fertility. He asks if, by chance, his name was Droveric. Somewhat reluctant, the man replies that he is correct. Then the protagonist says he needs to meet that person urgently. He asks where that person is. At that moment, another man begins to speak. He says that currently that man is on his way to fight the barbarians. For this reason, he will probably return soon to massacre all of those cursed vermin. Liam, in turn, says he understands the situation. He thinks that Knight will meet with an accident amidst that war. Shortly after, the scene shifts to a place full of huts. A man seems to be in a tower, observing something, because the group of heroes from earlier had returned. Another man says those are the leaders of the enemies who are personally there. Meanwhile, a group of soldiers seems to be on high alert. Another girl asks if they're sure this is a red portal, because the difficulty seemed like that of a black portal. The woman replies that it is still possible to complete, because all those tribes in that area had united. They had been going around attacking all the others, but they still had more than all of them. At that moment, the girl's mark begins to glow. She thinks that seal is something that could be received by worshipping the beast gods that the local tribes revered. For this reason, with all those attributes, it should be much easier to complete this place. Then that soldier begins observing all those people. He says they are the mercenaries who survived last time. He remarks they may be inferior, but even so, he spared their lives out of mercy. He asks what they are doing there. Preparing his attack, the man says they have returned to defeat him. With a threatening look, the man says he will give them just one more chance. For this reason, they should drop their weapons and leave immediately. He claims he is only being merciful because none of them committed a great sin. Another man then says he is not in a position to talk about sin, because he has done horrible things that could never be imagined. Hearing what the man said, the soldier becomes angry. Shortly after, he raises his hammer. He asserts he has done nothing wrong. He has nothing to be ashamed of because all his actions were just. Moreover, they all cross the line. For this reason, they will receive divine punishment. At that moment, the entire group forms a defensive formation. They say they must block everything at once. At that moment, a green sphere appears above them. A voice says that those who swore to protect the kingdom have left their fates to the gods. That energy is being concentrated in just one point. Another man says the kingdom's knights who obey the honors of the Templar Knights will give all their power to eradicate all evil. Thus, a light begins to surround the man's hammer. He says that in the glory of the royal gods, they should kneel. At the moment that miracle manifests in reality, the attack is delivered. As a consequence, the earth collapses. There are some people chosen by the gods. The power is given to knights who transcend as saints, blessed by the goddess of light and conquest. Divine punishment is a divine law used by an order knight depending on which god the knight serves. But for the Templar Knights of life and fertility, it destroys the land. Another girl asks what that was. Another man in turn is surprised because that attack managed to take out more than 3,000 enemies at once. For this reason, they think they should be thankful it wasn't them in that place. Irritated, he asks if that person was even human, because they were definitely incapable of defeating that person. Then that soldier starts calling on his goddess, asking her to protect all the lands they were stepping on. All of it for those who had lost their way to evil, so they could have the opportunity to purify themselves. With a threatening gaze, the soldier begins to observe the group, telling them to die all at once. Shortly after, the protagonist's group shows up, saying to surround them because they were still the larger group. At the same moment, one of the soldiers is struck by an attack, but that manages to defend it, surprised that a mere mercenary was that strong, supposing it could be because of the magic inscribed on him. However, the hunters ended up ignoring one critical thing, that they may not have walked the honorable path toward the gods. Shortly after, that man ends up being thrown toward the tower, and the voice continues, saying they were still greatly honored heroes who had traveled across the continent, all of it in their attempt to prove their own worth. Cuts to another location with a man ordering them to dismount from their horses and enter formation. The voice continues, saying that for decades they wielded their swords, and a knight who could take pride in his achievements had a few thousand years of experience. Warriors who had massacred the green beasts and the cursed pagans and had also prevented the invasion of outsiders. They had a great amount of experience against beasts that were strong. Returning to the present, the man seemed to be glorifying a place called Pantheon. Another man says that the rearguard soldiers were coming there too, so they would be completely destroyed, and if they wanted to flee, that was their only chance. However, the irritated man questions how they could do that. The young man replies that they could do nothing against a group of knights, much less against their leaders, as they would not be able to resolve this. The frustrated red-haired man says that if they didn't get help from another top 10 guild, the dungeon break would end up happening long before they could request help. The other man says that there was a way to end this smoothly, which was Adriana, the goddess of light and justice. There was also Demira, the goddess of life and fertility, asking if they had ever heard those names. The red-haired man says he was not very interested in religion, asking why the portal had anything to do with religion in the first place. Then the man responds that there was a king of Leonmert, asking if they had never seen his channel, because he was assuming that he was the king of that portal and felt that something was wrong when he heard them talk about God's knights or things like that. Hearing all that explanation, the red-haired man says that the best option was to retreat. But at that very moment, another girl appears, asking if they were leaving and if they were going to abandon her. The red-haired man replies that they would bring help and that for now, they needed to retreat, thinking that there was nothing more pointless than chatting with an NPC. Thus, he asks her to tell the other guild members that they were retreating because they needed to get out of the portal quickly. Right after, the girl says that the monsters would not be defeated again that time, and never once had her kind managed to close that portal. Because of that, those creatures were very disgusting. Even so, she was fine because she would try again. And although that person would be displeased, it was their fault for not being good enough. At that very moment, the girl snaps her fingers and a red lightning bolt appears. In a matter of seconds, one of their companions is killed, and the other man, surprised, asks if they were using dark magic. The man on the ground seems to be in a lot of pain, and the other man replies that the great beast god was blessing them, so soon they too could be blessed. The red-haired man asks what they had done. The other girl, calling them her warriors, warns that there was no reason to resist because that mark was new, so it was only a matter of time before it happened. Now they should obey her orders and kill all the knights because they needed to start again. The frustrated girl says that they had passed through several worlds, but none had managed to kill them. Right after, that group begins to advance against the other knights. The other soldier asks if they had received the pagan's mark, so they should flay where the mark was because that was their weakness. At that very moment, two soldiers appear behind the young man, finally managing to strike him. At the same moment, an explosion occurs, but it was not enough to defeat the man, who thinks that the situation did not look good, and that he needed to send the survivors to the Empire even if he died in the process. Right after, he places his sword on the ground, and apparently a green aura begins to emerge, calling everyone to attack him. Meanwhile, he was giving glory to the king of Lionheart. At that moment, an attack hits the center of that location. The confused man asks who that person was. Then it is revealed that it was the protagonist, saying that he was the king of Lionheart, whose name was Leon Draconia Lionheart. Meanwhile, the other girl appears to be with his majesty's horse, saying that leaving the horse with her and jumping into battle was exactly what her master would do. She asks if the knight's name would be grateful for allowing her to hold his reins. The scene cuts to 5 minutes before all that, and Leon seems frustrated, saying that they are like rats, and even if he kept annihilating them to reduce their numbers, somehow they kept multiplying. The other girl says that defeating children was very dirty, However, the protagonist responds that the king and the knights are not fools, and that the reason for that was because of the marks they had anywhere on their bodies, because it was a symbol of the alliance with the beast god and that they received that mark. Using its power, their soul begins to be slowly corrupted. The red-haired girl says that if that were the case, they would be no different from demons. Liam responds that she should keep that in mind because her peaceful mentality and naive ideals of human rights were not useful in that cruel battle, because what they needed was truth and absolute justice. The scene cuts again to the present with that girl mounted on the protagonist's horse, saying that she should also fulfill her obligations. She then casts a spell, striking all those beasts that were coming at her and ordering them to stay away. The scene cuts to the lower part where an unknown man seemed to be observing the protagonist, who thinks that the enemy's marks were working even with the attacks from the Templar Knights, which meant that something was wrong with the divine law of Lord Javrik. Right after, Leon calls the man, saying that they needed to overcome that difficulty, and the first thing they would do was cut the connection between those fools. Approaching them, he says that he was the king of Leon Mert and that he was there to take them all to paradise. Meanwhile, a soldier seemed very surprised, asking why the Holy Grail was in that place. Liam, taking the chalice, begins to cast a spell, which at that very moment starts to shine intensely. The other soldier, meanwhile, was watching everything in silence, and the other surprised soldiers realized that their wounds were being healed. Moreover, the other people who had the mark were disappearing. The soldier, observing all this, thinks that it was a true divine miracle and wonders how he had not noticed it all this time. Right after, a person begins calling that knight, asking him to go help the king of the knights. The determined soldier thinks that he no longer had any questions or doubts because only obedience remained, and he asks Leon to give his command. Liam, looking to the side, remains silent and then calls the man Javrik, stating that he was glad they were on the same battlefield. And the man responds that he would fight by his side since he was the guardian of the Holy Grail. Leon says that all the dead beasts were gathering in one place and that the host was the one who seemed suspicious. The girl, meanwhile, seems very frustrated, thinking that a knight whose soul is bound was already difficult enough to deal with. Then she ends up summoning another creature again, which then calls Leon by name because it was going to defeat him definitively. Amidst that situation, that girl appears again, saying that she was going to open a path for them. Thus, she begins to cast a spell called Grand Prophecy, and a purple circle emerges, directed at the creatures that end up being struck. Thus, Leon begins to approach that place, calling upon the glorious knights along with the loyal soldiers because it was time to punish the cursed pagans. The scene cuts to another location where that girl from before is running incessantly because she had been defeated by that cursed knight. Thinking that Javrik was already complicated enough, and out of nowhere, another yellow-haired knight had appeared. At that very moment, a voice asks where the girl was going in such a hurry. She then casts a spell to immobilize her and asks if that was called a mana stone. She had heard that it was a new resource containing concentrated mana that could be obtained through hunting in portals. They were everywhere there, as if there were hundreds of thousands or even millions of dead monsters. She wonders if that portal was somehow in a loop. She did not seem to be a demon, but she was acting as if she were one. Because of that, she had several questions to ask, and amidst that situation, the other girl was very pensive, questioning if she knew that she was not an NPC. Continuing to speak, the other girl responds that this was not the kind of power she liked, and using her power of seduction, she says that even so, she did not want to miss opportunities. Right after, an unknown spirit appears, saying that she was disappointing them once again, asking if she could no longer recognize who her true master was. Interfering in the situation, the other girl says that that person belonged to her now, and embracing the girl, she asks what that spirit would do now. Thus, those creatures become very angry and begin to advance against the girl. At that very moment, the sky seems to shatter. The other girl says that the gods are going to descend because that was the portal of the beast god's territory. She knew those were not their true forms, but if all the beast gods descended, that portal would disappear. Amidst that situation, the girl says that this was bad. The scene changes again with Leon saying that the 11th king of Leonhardt used to mention Javrik and the other knights frequently. The man asks if he had met that person, and Leon responds that he had, affirming that he was in the paradise of the gods. The other girl asks if he remembers anything, and Javrik replies that he does not remember because they were only there to kill the barbarians. Liam responds that those people should know the truth. The girl, meanwhile, seems hesitant, but even so, she says that he, along with the other knights, cannot leave this portal because they are all just characters restricted to it. And to close that portal, she needed to kill him along with all the knights. Hearing what the girl had said, the man starts laughing, and right after, he throws his sword on the ground, saying that it seemed like he had not lost even once for a long time. Liam responds that it seemed that way, and besides, if he had lost, they would not have met again. At that very moment, the sky starts shattering again, and a voice begins to emerge from there, saying that it would defeat them all. From that rift in the sky, an unknown spirit appears. Liam asks if there was any way to prevent this. The other girl responds that there was not because that portal was already doomed anyway, and the beast gods would use all their powers to destroy this place. Leon says that he already understood the situation, and therefore, if they needed to fight, they could not leave the Knights of Glory behind. The other girl says that she did not think it was a wise decision to face them head-on. However, the protagonist says that he had no other choice because they would be unleashed upon that world if a dungeon break happened. Meanwhile, Javrik was observing everything, saying that there was a way to resolve this. Then he casts a spell on his hand and directs it toward his stomach. Javrik says that the condition for closing the portal was for him to die, so they should retreat and use his power for the divine because there was no other reason to fight for a portal that would soon disappear. Meanwhile, the protagonist was watching that situation, apparently frustrated. Javrik then moves forward to face his brothers and sisters, saying that the final battle was in their hands, and that the king of Lionheart, who represented the glory of the gods, was there with them. For this reason, they should sacrifice themselves for the good and the future of those who still lived, asking if they were with him. Another man was observing that entire speech and then raised his hand. Meanwhile, Leon was watching everything in silence. Then he stands up, saying that their loyalty embarrassed him because they had left him with a great duty. Javrik says that he had one more request to make and that he should wait a little. Right after, the man begins to make a request to the goddess Demera, asking her to hear his prayer. Raising his hammer up, he says that the one chosen by Demera was loyal to the king of Lionheart, and that through that hammer, he would transmit his powers. A gigantic glow appears, and that light goes directly to another stone that apparently had transformed into another hammer. Javrik then hands it to the protagonist, asking him to keep that hammer until someone worthy of possessing it appeared before him. Liam then takes that hammer, saying that he did not know if there was anyone who could wield it as well as he could. Javrik, amidst that situation, says that it was a great honor to fight alongside him. Liam in turn responds that he would remember his honor, and soon after he begins to leave that place. Javrik, approaching his knights, says that this was his last order, as they should protect the king until the last one fell. Thus, he wished for them to have an honorable life and for the blessings of the gods to be with him. Javrik, meanwhile, was watching Leon leave, and then he looks forward, beginning to face his knights. Raising his hand, he says that he had already killed 10,000 enemies and defeated more than 5 million as a war knight. He had protected his land against 300,000 orcs and was victorious in the battle against the ogre chief. The goddess Demera had protected them, and the goddess Adriana had cared for them, and for that reason, they had brought joy to the gods. And he was the almighty knight of Montreal, and for that, he was called Javrik, the Templar Knight of Life and Fertility. Because of that, on that day, they would die for justice. Thus, the gods should be with them in the midst of that battle, and may honor also be with the king of Lionheart. The scene cuts to the red-haired girl calling the protagonist. However, the young man says that he had already told everyone to leave that place, and the girl responds that she thought she should watch until the end. Leon says that if she wished to stay, she could do whatever she wanted while he watched that war from a distance. The girl asks what they should do, and Leon responds that it was not yet the time because they had definitely not reached the right moment. At that very instant, someone lets out a gigantic roar. The other man asks what was happening. The other girl in the crowd were watching Leon, who seemed frustrated, saying that the Knight Jovic had ascended, and because of that, they would pay for everything they had done, for the beast they worshipped would die in the most violent and deplorable way possible. Leon then begins to move, stating that they were already leaving, thinking that the Templar Knights brought results with the divine laws, and that the words that the Guardian of the Holy Grail had just spoken had some influence. Leon, amidst that situation, says that he would remember that day, and that those words would be materialized through the actions of that night. After all that, days pass, and Leon trains incessantly inside his room. And while doing so, he remembers his past, and he continues training. After a long time, the young man stops training, saying that he was very tired. And then he thinks that he didn't even feel tired while massacring those demons. Because of that, he wanted to know why he was feeling bothered now. Right after, he ends up remembering all his companions. And because of that, he finally understood everything. He was afraid of losing everything dear to him once again. And because of that, he feared a future where he would have to fight alone once more. However, this was a burden he had to carry alone, questioning how he could share it. At that very moment, Han appears in the room, happy that the young man was there, saying that he was quite late. Leon, surprised, says that she usually rested at that time. Han, meanwhile, seems somewhat embarrassed, saying that she felt like she needed to train a little more. Leon, meanwhile, watches the girl in silence. Han responds that she just felt as if many of them had realized they had learned a lot recently. Changing the subject, Leon asks her to draw her sword and show how her training was going. Bowing, Han says that she was very honored. And meanwhile, Leon wonders why she kept talking in that manner. Thus, the two seem to have started a training session, and Leon asks her to try blocking as he instantly disappears. Appearing behind her, he executes an attack, but Han manages to dodge, thinking that the young man was extremely strong. Liam then begins giving his instructions to Han, who listens while taking a beating. Shortly after, Leon lands another attack hitting Han, saying that she should not defend herself only with her arms and sword, and that a step backward should not be forced by the weight of the sword. Then Han counterattacks. However, that attack had no effect, and at that very moment, Leon attacks with his hand, saying that her movements were too wide, asking how many times he had already told her she needed to be fast and precise. And what was the logic behind creating an opening for her enemy? Han, in turn, begins to make an excuse. However, Leon says that wouldn't work again, But she should not think that the only way to win was by using her skills efficiently, questioning what value that would have if she ended up being killed. Observing the girl's expression, Leon asks what the problem was. But Han responds that it was nothing, saying she thought that at some point he would tell her to sacrifice her life if the situation demanded it. Hearing that, Leon remains silent. Then he hits Han on the head with his sword, asking if she had someone to dedicate that honor and glory to. And what was the reason for copying that if she had no one to dedicate it to? Hearing that, Han becomes pensive. Watching all this, Leon smiles. And as he begins to walk away, he says that that was all for today, so they should rest. But at that very moment, the protagonist seems to sense something. The scene cuts to another place with Han saying that she felt as if His Majesty had been lacking energy lately. And Epi says that His Majesty's abnormal biological reaction was due to some kind of pressure. Han asks if he can explain that more simply, and the robot responds that it was basically stress. The girl says that he was right, asking if by any chance he knew what His Majesty liked to do. Starting a search, Epi says that biological entities enjoy entertainment along with games. Therefore, he needed an activity to help improve mood during rest. And games were perfect for de-stressing, summarizing everything. The girl says she couldn't imagine him enjoying playing, questioning if he could think of anything else. The robot responds that games suitable for increasing dopamine in certain organic beings were not part of its database. Hearing what the robot had said, Han wonders why it simply couldn't say it didn't know that. But at that moment, she changes her mind, saying that she thought Leon might like it too. So she begins to explain to the robot, which says that the plan might make sense. However, it was just a coincidence, and for that reason, it didn't want to reach its calculation ability. But the girl says that it would always happen, making the robot very irritated, saying that it seemed like she was mocking it. Thus, the two start arguing. The scene cuts to another location again, and Leon seems to be saying a prayer to his goddess, starting to apologize, but the goddess says that he had fought so much for 200 years without resting. Therefore, he should enjoy some entertainment because it was time to take a break. Leon says that he hadn't heard that word in a long time. And the goddess says that there seemed to be various forms of entertainment in that era, but she wasn't sure if there was anything that could bring joy to her night. However, the best entertainment transcends time, and the truth is that sleeping with a woman was the ultimate pleasure. In her eyes, that queen was a good partner, or even the other redhead. But Leon responds that the girl was too young, asking how she could suggest something like that. The goddess responds that she was a completely grown woman and that humans enjoy themselves and relieve stress through love. And that's why he needed to rebuild the royal family in the end. At that moment, someone knocks on the door. Han then appears, saying that he had to listen to this, but as she was walking toward the protagonist, she ends up falling. Leon says that she got transcendent physical abilities, and yet the way she acted reminded him of an idiot, asking what happened. Han says that she had prepared something for the young man and had received help from Lord Yep's advice. Leon, irritated, says that if she appeared in front of him with that indecent outfit one more time, he would make her run around the neighborhood without any of it. But the girl responds that it wasn't like that at all. The scene cuts to another location where a group of people was observing a portal. Leon then appears at the scene. The other man says that he would explain this situation to His Majesty, and that the association had gathered to help the manager and assistant in Hari with an event she had personally planned. Leon, upon hearing that, seemed confused, and Han then asks him to enter the portal because she was sure he would like it. So the protagonist agrees to do so, and upon entering the portal, he notices that there was a breathtaking landscape. Han says that she would begin explaining that portal. It was called the Sarat portal, and various animals and monsters lived there. Therefore, you should take a look at that catalog. Defeating small animals was worth 1 point, and medium ones were worth 3. Orcs were worth 10 points since they were rarer. Observing all that explanation, Leon asks if it was some kind of hunting, and Han responds that it was indeed a hunt, exactly because she thought that in the place where His Majesty lived, hunting might be common. Leon says that she had prepared a hunting ground for him to de-stress, and for that, it was very kind of her. It had been quite some time since the last time he hunted, and he didn't know if he would do well. Time passes, and an orc seems to be struck by an arrow. Leon was like a madman hunting those fools. The poor orcs were wondering how they were going to kill a member of their tribe. But Leon, attacking all the orcs, asks how a filthy beast like them dared to bare their fangs at him. Seeing all that chaos, Han responds that he was really enjoying himself. She thought that at least that was good. Time passes again, and Leon was putting all of his items into a bag, saying that someone should take them back as a keepsake. Then Han appears, saying that he was really good with a bow and arrow. Leon says that she misunderstood, and that just because he was a knight didn't mean he was bad with other weapons. Hunting was a hobby and a virtue of a noble, especially for wandering knights and mission knights, because they needed to find their own food wherever they were. For that reason, knights had no choice but to become masters of hunting. Han says that even so, he was very skilled, and Leon responds that he was famous as the strongest champion of all time, but he was also the second best hunter of his era. Han says that if he was the second best, she wanted to know who the other Templar knight was. Leon says that he thought he couldn't call her a Templar knight because the goddess of the moon and hunting watched over her, but even so, she was more of a huntress than a knight. She was the head of the temple of hunting and the moon, which basically made her a priestess. Her arrows were like meteors, and if she used her full strength, they could easily pierce through mountains. Han, seeing all that chaos, asks why he only hunted orcs. Liam, apologizing, says that it was necessary to obtain first place in the competition, so he had to hunt those worth the most points. In the end, he ended up obtaining something strange because that item seemed cursed. Observing the item, Han says that it was somewhat rare. Leon, handing over the item, asks her to sell it and give the money to the people who had been tending the animals he had not hunted. Han asks if he was sure because that was worth 10 million, and Leon responds that it would not be enough for him anyway. After that, she should follow him because he could see the footprints of the orcs that had fled since those beasts were still alive and polluting that forest. Hearing all that, Han thinks that the young man was crazy. Liam asks the girl to follow him because he would show her how to use a bow and arrow. Han, hearing all this, says that she would go with him. Besides, she was very happy that he had recovered. Hearing that, Leon is left speechless, wondering how long it had been since someone was kind to him without expecting anything in return. Leon, whispering, says that he was proud of her, and the girl, confused, asks what he had just said. Liam asks her to use the techniques they had practiced to kill at least 3 orcs. Sometime later, the scene cuts to the Pantheon Guild at the training facility. Han, meanwhile, seemed to be carrying a box of weapons, very happy because His Majesty was already feeling much better. Shortly after, a guy stops Han, saying that the tractor broke down, so he had to stop by the supply room, but no one had caused anything since the Naju incident. The scene cuts to another location, and the two seem to be standing in front of a door. The man asks if that was where Jeffrey's hammer was, and Han confirms that it was. The man asks if the hammer had been there the whole time, and Han responds that yes, since there was no one around, they would be able to use it in that state. Entering the room, he says that they would keep it there for now. However, when they look ahead, they realize that the axe had disappeared, and because of that, the protagonist would probably be very pissed. The scene then cuts to a random car. A man stepping out of it asks if that was the place, and the other man responds that they were going to take a look at the most epic and powerful item in the nation. At that moment, Yappy suddenly appears in front of them. The men, recognizing that robot, are surprised because it was really with the Pantheon Guild. The robot asks if he was the challenger of the hammer, and the man responds that he was. Yappy, in turn, welcomes him to that place. Surprised, they think that guy was cooler than they had imagined. But at that very moment, Yappy suddenly disappears. Starting to analyze, he says that there was an entrance fee, saying that they would have to pay. Looking at the price, the men say that it was very expensive, asking why it was 500,000 for civilians but 5 million for rich people. The robot responds that civilians watched and hunters challenged. For that reason, the maintenance fee for sacred relics was much higher. The man thinks that this was not fair, but considering the value of an epic item, it might be worth it. Having no other choice, they end up agreeing to pay the fee. While they are entering the place, someone recognizes them and begins welcoming them. Han, wearing plush armor, says that she was an assistant from Team 3 of the Korean Hunters Management Association. Han, meanwhile, starts thinking that this had started some time ago, and to be precise, on the day the hammer had disappeared, approximately a week ago. Leon, meanwhile, seemed to be saying that that was where the hammer was since several people were trying to lift it like fools. Leon begins to approach the hammer and then easily lifts it, asking what they were planning to do. At that very moment, the hammer starts being consumed by a yellow aura and ends up being thrown to the ground again. The queen says that the hammer was quite expressive, and Leon responds that it seemed like it wanted something. Han asks if the hammer had a consciousness, and Leon replies that a sacred relic like this could indeed have one, especially an item that had been with a priest and a divine being for a long time, potentially developing its own will and becoming difficult to handle. However, when he received the hammer, he did not feel that it had its own consciousness. The chosen one by Demera and loyal to the king of Lionheart, through this hammer, would transmit their powers. And because of that, this was the solution, as the hammer probably wanted an owner for itself. Leon then asks for the association to be informed because whoever is able to lift that hammer will be allowed to keep it. Hearing all this explanation, Han quickly grabs her phone, saying that they would send someone to assess its value. Sometime later, the scene cuts to another location where a man looks surprised, saying that it was epic because it was an extremely rare item. Hunters use special equipment to fight monsters, and for convenience, their ranks were classified as follows. The lowest stage was normal, and the highest was legendary. At first, luxury equipment is made by regular blacksmiths, and they are unique items. Equipment that requires insane effort, a lot of money, and extensive labor is called legendary. And in the last 30 years of history, there were a few items known as epic, which were said to surpass the legendary rank. One of them was the Mountain Master Xuan, the sky-destroying sword of the celestial demon. There was also the 12-ring Krakharara, a massive item from a mage who was said to be the hunter of the disasters that changed the world. The Heart of the Ice Queen, which was still expanding the snowy fields of Siberia. Additionally, the Wandering Demon's Sword, which was still lost in the world after the Black Portal disaster in London. These are items with tremendous power and influence. and they can bring victory even in the most impossible situations. Before everyone's eyes in that place, there was an epic item. Returning to the present, the astonished man asks if he was really going to give it to anyone who could lift it. Then he looks back and Leon says that anyone who could lift the hammer would be able to wield it and keep it. Taking the document, the man says that the hammer's value was unbelievable and that he should take a closer look at it. And looking at the paper, he begins to analyze all the statistics of the item. However, Leon was still not interested, saying that his decision remained unchanged. Therefore, they should report it to the association. Disappointed, the man asks if he could make a quick phone call. The scene cuts to another location, and the man receiving the call says that he was the president of the association. Hearing everything from the other side of the line, he is very surprised, asking if it was really an epic item. A few days pass, and the news that the protagonist was making an epic item available spreads, and this was the reason so many challengers had gathered at the Pantheon Guild. The scene then returns to the present, with Han still wearing that ridiculous outfit, and the man asks where Javrik's hammer was because he wanted to see it. However, the girl says that he had to be careful with his words because when he tried to take it, he should respect it as if he were a knight. The scene cuts to another location, and Han is presenting the hammer to those men. Ku, observing the aura, seems surprised, saying that it was emanating directly from the hammer. Wasting no time, the young man starts trying. However, when he grabs the hammer, he ends up receiving an electric shock. Surprised, he asks if the hammer was capable of doing that. Han replies that yes, it did that to people who were not worthy. And for that reason, it was the hammer that decided, so they did not know what the conditions were. At that moment, that little robot appears on the scene, asking if they were going to pay the tithe. The man thinks that they had already paid the entrance fee and wonders if now they wanted him to donate money. But at that moment, he remembers that it was a sacred relic of the goddess, and without hesitation, he ends up paying. Then, determined, he grabs the hammer. Even so, it was no use as he was unable to wield it. However, he had not been completely defeated yet. Han, surprised, says that the man wasn't even able to grab it before. Meanwhile, Yappy was watching everything, saying that he was still collecting tithes for the construction of the Pantheon Guild. Without wasting time, several people start trying to pay. Han, meanwhile, watches everything in silence, asking if Yappy was sure about this because it seemed like sacrilege. The robot asks if she was questioning his method of fundraising, saying she only needed to follow his plan. Meanwhile, a bunch of people was trying to lift that hammer, and the robot responds that the hammer was basically an immense amount of money waiting to be collected. Thus, Yappy, who was the financial manager of the Pantheon Guild, started putting his financial plans into action. Sometime later, the scene cuts to a house and Han, desperate, says that Starbucks had asked if they could open a branch in Pantheon. Recently, the Pantheon Guild had become quite popular, and many hunters were trying to lift that hammer, and the healing effects of simply being near the guild attracted many people. Meanwhile, that mere robot was collecting money and goods to secure funds for the guild, spreading fame and influence over Pantheon. And all of this was for the benefit of its facilities. Looking around, the girl asks what all of that was. The robot responds that it was a high-intensity forging facility. Han asks if he was sure that was a forge. The robot responds that it was the lowest-level forging facility he could find in his database, and that was all he was capable of doing with Earth's pitiful level of metallurgy. However, Han says that it still seemed great. The robot responds that it was because her brain was made of organic matter. The girl questions if he was the Templar Knight of the divinity of steel and forge, and the robot confirms that he was. Han asks if he could make a sword for her as well. However, the robot ends up refusing the offer. But that wasn't the reason, rather the facility was not yet complete. An additional installation was needed to work with adamantite, and because of that, he still needed to earn more money. Then he starts running like a maniac, entering through a back door, saying that the opening of the minimum level forging facility and the acquisition of initial funds were complete. At that moment, a data window appears. The robot says that on that day, he would once again be a righteous thief. Recently, the global stock market had been facing a major disaster. A ghost-like entity was interfering with stock price manipulation schemes and disrupting the timing of sales. They took all the profits for themselves and disappeared every time. And it was obvious. They didn't even need to say that this entity was the robot itself. The financial asset he had been observing recently was food. In the 21st century, humanity's food situation didn't seem good because there were simply too many lands that had been corrupted by demonic elements. At the beginning of the Great Shift, the powerful nations of East and West Asia responded excellently. But dungeon breaks occurred in large numbers, and in poor nations, other conflicts continued. Even so, Yappy ended up buying all those places, corrupted lands with no value. His first target was the Haijiodang grain industry. After the Shanghai disaster 20 years ago, the corruption level of that place was extremely high. The robot bought a portion of the grain industry and spread the faith of Demira, the goddess of life and fertility, thus purifying the soil. Although it wasn't possible to purify the lands or produce crops at the same scale and speed as Leon, it was still a great improvement. The robot, please, says that the Pantheon Guild would monopolize food resources. However, there was a problem, the possibility of an invasion. A lot of data had been collected, Global policies and wars were pointless expenses of national resources, because portals worldwide were increasing the threat level, and a rational human leader should not engage in the irrational use of armed forces. Even so, that land would rise again. The scene cuts to another location where a group of people is analyzing the news. Han, surprised, asks if a war had broken out, and Yappy, meanwhile, seems very shocked. Sometime later, the robot appears to be arguing with Han, saying that he had private capital and that it was a recently growing asset management method. Because of that, he was going to manage her funds, asking her to register that day. Han asks if he was asking her to invest. The robot responds that he would manage her funds, and considering her weak financial state, she needed a professional to help her manage her money. Han, surprised, says that she had saved quite a lot of money considering her age. However, the robot informs her that she had saved 15% less compared to the average amount stored by other rank hunters, and for that reason, she had a pitiful salary, giving most of her bonuses for clearing portals back to the city. However, Han responds that she was donating all her money to the orphanage where she grew up. The robot replies that financial management was necessary to provide even greater donations. Han immediately says that she didn't need that. Yappy responds that for a human to live in modern civilization, being lazy about studying finances was basically giving up on life, so she should be grateful for learning this. The girl in turn responds that she would offer 2 million won. However, Yappy says it should be 20 million, selling her apartment along with the semi-key in Seoul. Observing that situation, the girl thinks that since it was the robot, she was sure it wasn't anything suspicious, and so she ends up accepting the offer. Yappy says that now she was a silver member, and because he was being nice, he promoted her to bronze level. Bronze members were guaranteed a 100% return, while silver members had 200%, asking if she wanted to level up. The girl responds that it would be great. Yappy says that if she registered 5 more people, he would elevate her to gold level, where the return would be 300%. Hearing that, the girl is very surprised, asking if it was true. In the end, she was just a newcomer to society and naive enough not to realize that it was a classic multi-level marketing scheme. But the problem was that others trusted her will, and Yappy's pyramid scheme quickly spread worldwide. And so we arrive at the current result. Then the scene cuts to another location, where a man appears to be stepping out of a car. Approaching the protagonist, he introduces himself, saying he was from the judicial district, and that they were there to give notices about asset confiscation. Liam, surprised, seemed not to understand anything. However, Yappy remains silent, and shortly after, he begins to realize the consequences of his actions. Sometime later, the scene cuts to Leon, extremely irritated, demanding an immediate explanation of the situation. Yappy, in turn, starts speaking, saying that first he was unable to pay off the loans he took in the name of the Pantheon Guild, and the second problem was that most of the guild employees had gone into debt after investing in him, and as a consequence, private capital hit rock bottom. The desperate woman says that 87 million was all she had since she even sold her apartment to trust him. Moreover, many other people had also lost money. Leah, meanwhile, was watching the people crying in silence, asking how much Yappy had lost. Then he seemed very desperate, saying that he had lost approximately 87 billion, and that it was increasing by 49 billion won every hour, leading to a loss of about 72% of all assets. Meanwhile, people start to panic in that place. Another man soon appears, saying that he found something that seemed valuable in storage, so they were going to take it as compensation. Quickly, Yappy tries to interfere, ordering them not to do that. After that, a huge argument starts, and Liam, observing everything in silence and frustrated, says that those inferior beings were already annoying, ordering them to stop that mess immediately. Then he directs his gaze toward the robot, saying that he trusted it to solve the problem with its level of intelligence, asking how much time it needed for that. Yappy responds that it would only take a day, and Leon says he would leave it to him. Thus, he would act as a financial guarantor for his debts, ordering everyone to return to work. Agreeing to do that, the man is surprised, wondering if he could really solve it in a day. And meanwhile, Yappy seemed very determined to fix everything. The scene cuts to Yappy's base, where an emergency seems to be occurring. The giant robot appears, and the mission code is to recover all the funds that were lost. Sometime later, the scene cuts to northeastern Asia, where an orc, meanwhile, was relaxing. Another monster asks where the enemy was because the people there were very boring. They just went to fight, and they simply ran away. The monster says that all that mattered was that they had eaten enough, so they would wait there before invading the neighboring areas again. Hearing this, the other monster ends up agreeing, saying that soon they would have human meat, feeling very pleased with what was about to happen. Looking up, the leader says that they would finish things there. But at that moment, a red beam suddenly appears in the sky, heading toward their base, which, in a matter of seconds, is completely obliterated. Sometime later, the scene cuts to another location, where a man asks if the divine weapon had been hacked. And besides that, only 3 people in the world had the security code. The other man says that the security key changed every minute, and there were hundreds of thousands of possible combinations, and even if it were the best computer in the world trying to match them all, it would take at least 13 years. Because of that, it was an incomparable feat. Quickly, The man orders them to stop it. However, it was impossible because the security key patterns had been reinforced, and now there were more than 10 billion possible combinations. At that moment, the other man says that Grizzly had been activated, and so they began the countdown, preparing for simultaneous activation. The specific target was the Republic of Gillim. Right after, the other man says that the leader should take a look at this, and the man asks if it was a press conference. The yellow-haired man says that Russia would not tolerate any provocation from other nations and therefore would work alongside the United States. Watching that broadcast, the man is surprised, realizing that it was actually him, which was likely a fake person impersonating him. Meanwhile, the whole group was determined to recover the code. An unknown phrase in multiple languages suddenly appears. Sometime later, the scene cuts to a desperate orc, wondering how things had ended up that way. And now that they were the strongest of the nations, all that remained was an endless war. The soldier asks what they were going to do and if, by any chance, they were screwed. And the orc responds that they would take whatever money was left and escape as quickly as possible, heading toward the plains and increasing their population before starting a new life. As he finishes his explanation, a hand appears above him, which in a matter of seconds, easily defeats him. The other soldier, shocked, asks what that was. Yappy, in his extremely cool robot form, says that the target has been sighted, and that non-human species are called orcs. Thus, his battle mode is activated, ordering them to return his money. But the orc says that he doesn't know who he is, but he is certainly very bold. At that moment, the soldier appears behind Yappy, landing a blow on him. The robot quickly activates his assassination mode, beginning a barrage of shots toward all the orcs. However, the leader still remains standing. In a matter of seconds, the other soldier rushes at Yappy, but he was already prepared, landing a direct shot on that creature. Yappy says that he would initiate a special modification with an ultra-high mass 12-gauge set, and as a consequence, all of his weapons are upgraded, releasing Yappy and increasing the firearm restriction condition. And so, all weapons become available for use. At that moment, he begins firing a massive barrage, easily managing to annihilate all the orcs. However, one entity still remained. The other orc says that it wasn't bad at all, because the ones he had just killed were guys who were ready to be promoted to generals. At that moment, Yappy says that he would resume the assassination, and hearing that, the goblin gets irritated, asking if he even knew what that word meant. Ignoring that, Yappy continues firing incessantly. However, the shots are being dodged. Getting closer, the orc finds an opening, managing to land a blow, but Yappy defends. As a consequence, his arm is distorted. The orc responds that that axe was purely made of adamantite, and that even a dragon wouldn't survive it. He begins a series of attacks toward the robot. Yappy says that his ammunition was insufficient. Because of that, he would have to resort to hand-to-hand combat. At that moment, he lands an attack on the orc. However, unfortunately, it had little effect and the orc quickly counterattacks, asking if he really thought a piece of metal like him had any chance. After all, he was a warrior blessed by the war god Helkin. At that moment, he launches an attack toward the robot's head, who responds that time is insufficient and that the scenario had failed. At that moment, the orc ends up being tied up by several wires, and Yappy, in a matter of seconds, appears behind the orc. And in his small form, he says that useful real-life battle information has been acquired, and that the dataset was even more perfect than before. The orc, confused, asks what that creature was talking about, and Yappy responds that it was the divine tactical law. A blue aura begins to surround him, and in a matter of seconds, that orc is obliterated. Recognizing that axe, the robot responds that it was made of adamantite and therefore should be taken. And removing all witnesses, the assassination was completed. Sometime later, the scene cuts to the television, which announces that the coup incident in the Republic has been resolved. And the newly certified government of the Republic apologized for the chaos that had been caused. Seeing all that news, Han was pleased, saying it was great because the war had finally ended. Checking the profit margin on her phone, Han was surprised because it was over 200%. Meanwhile, Leon was observing something on his tablet, thinking that person had improved a little and that he would soon need to connect them to their gods. Although he first needed to prove his majesty's faith, there was no time to waste. The gods had allowed a simplified process, so he needed to hurry. At that moment, he begins to observe another person, whose name was Xion, a knight who was supposed to adhere to the rule of virtue. Additionally, one of his attributes was greed, and he assumed that the reason this rich kid had enrolled was because of the divine laws. At that moment, a flashback appears in his mind, and the protagonist thinks that it reminded him of someone. Then he notices something. The hammer had just moved, and he quickly begins leaving that place to find out who the person was. Yep, along with Han, was watching the protagonist leave. The scene cuts to another location, where Leon is near the axe, surprised, saying that this was unexpected, because that idea was actually able to lift the hammer. Sometime later, the scene cuts to the empty fields near the plains of Naju. Han, meanwhile, seemed to be with a group of people and several horses, and Leon says that today was the day he would accept a new student. However, the other young man says that all academy students should have already joined guilds. So he was wondering who would be chosen, and Leon responds that he would receive training along with everyone else, beginning the pursuit of the Meg title in the future as well. The young man, in turn, appears mounted on a horse, saying that his name was Dai Sung and that he was a first-generation student of the Men-at-Arms, and that it was a pleasure to meet everyone. The scene cuts to another location, where Mai responds that the Eastern Naval Fleet, the 7 American fleets, and the Japanese Defense Force had already verified. So she believed that the Dragon Palace was indeed real. A portal in the middle of the ocean was called the Dragon Palace, and one had been discovered in Tokyo Bay 20 years ago. At the time, people believed that portals only appeared on land and there were no satellites to observe and search for these portals. The portal in Tokyo Bay was neglected until a dungeon break occurred, leading to the destruction of Tokyo. All nearby beaches became corrupted and ocean creatures turned into monsters. This incident became one of the worst portal disasters in history, initiating cooperation between nations to attack portals. The other man says that Hurricane Nabi, which was heading toward the Pacific Ocean, had changed direction and was now moving toward Alang Island. Because of that, meteorologists expected it to be the worst hurricane of the year. They estimated that the hurricane's speed was 64 meters per second, approximately the same as a hurricane that occurred in 2003. Right after, the man looks back, ordering them to contact His Majesty Leon of the Pantheon Guild immediately. Half an hour later, another man asks if there was no one else there. And the man, recognizing him, says that he was a guild master named Lee and that he had changed quite a lot, because he used to ignore the preliminaries, and the man questions why his guild was a candidate for this when there were much better guilds. The elder responds that it was difficult to find a guild as good as his. However, the man says that they were still suffering losses because of the incident on Jeju Island, thinking that the old man was starting to assert his authority over him, and that it was probably because of the protagonist, and assuming that he was not sending them alone, asking if his wing had abandoned him. But the man responds that Leon was someone he could not evaluate. Frustrated, the red-haired man says that things really weren't going well, and the girl responds that he was reaping what he sowed. Hearing what she had said, the young man remains silent. A flashback appears in his mind, with him thinking that even if his mount was not up to the task, he would serve the king. So he should live a life of honor, and may the gods bless him. Returning to the present, the man says that he wasn't feeling well. Then the bald man looks at his phone, saying that the VIP had arrived. Meanwhile, the red-haired man was confused by this, and the other man seemed to be getting fully prepared. At that moment, Leon, along with Han, appears at the location, and the other man thanks the protagonist for gracing him with his presence. Leon says that he had better have a good reason for calling him there. The man asks the protagonist to follow him because he would explain the situation. Sometime later, everything had been explained to Leon. A portal had appeared in the middle of the ocean, and a hurricane was approaching, making the attack more difficult. Then the man turns on his TV, saying that the United States and Japan had come as allies to help with this. This was an opportunity to further elevate the honor of the king of Leonmert, so he should grandly display his heroic abilities. And while saying this, the elder bows. Leon says that he was certainly good with words, and for that reason, he would accept the task. The value of a king was immense, so they would have to prepare a worthy tribute. The man asks if there was anything he desired. However, the protagonist simply smiles and then says that a king does not count coins, so he should speak with Spinner about that. Accepting to do so, the man thinks that he had basically been given an empty promise. And because of that, he realized that this person was truly difficult to deal with. Sometime later, the scene cuts to Leon outside that building, saying that he would begin announcing the names of those who would participate in the attack, so Han should write them all down. The first was Yepi, and among the students, it would be her along with Jaeuk and Dasam. Additionally, there were other people who were not important enough to be mentioned. Seeing all those participants, Han seemed confused. Then she calls the protagonist, saying that none of the names he had listed were women. Hearing what the girl had said, Leon looks confused, and Han thinks that even though he distinguished a lady from women, he was not the type of person to discriminate against others because of their gender. Then Leon says that the answer was very obvious. It was extremely unlucky to have women on board, leaving Han very surprised by what she had just heard. The scene changes again to a helicopter flying, and the first South Korean fleet arrives at its designated location. When the helicopter lands, some people were waiting, and from inside, the protagonist, along with Han, steps out, approaching those soldiers. Leon asks if he was the commander of that base, and the man, affirming that he was, introduces himself as Lieutenant General Choi of the First Fleet. Therefore, it was an honor to meet him, and his granddaughter had been healed thanks to him during the harvest of the goddess Demira. And for that reason, he would be grateful if he could convey his words to her. Leon says that if he wanted him to thank her for her blessings, then basically, the young man was his brother. The soldier then says that it was an honor, and for that reason, it was true. But changing the subject before starting the meeting, he would like to introduce the Allied forces. Sometime later, the scene cuts to another location. The red-haired man asks if that team was part of the American attack force, and the other man responds that apparently they had returned there as quickly as possible on a cargo plane. The American attack team was known for being passive, which was surprisingly true. The red-haired man asks if that was the master of the American Magic Tower, and the other man responds that it was, wondering why such an important person was there. Observing the surroundings, the old man becomes convinced, thinking that he even seemed famous in Korea. Approaching the soldiers, he says that it was a pleasure to meet them, introducing himself as Sherman, the master of the Magic Tower. also invited to the attack on the portal. At that moment, the man is shocked by what he is seeing because the protagonist was there, which meant he was in deep trouble. Desperate, he asks the great entity what they should do, because that person was right in front of him. Desperate, the entity tells him to calm down because knowing him, he would already be dead if Leon had noticed him. And since they hadn't been discovered yet, he had to have faith in the power of the ring he had been given. Because with that ring, he was able to hide his demonic mana. At that moment, the old man uses the ring and a gigantic glow appears. However, the entity tells him to stay calm, because the ring was wearing out due to Leon's divine power, so he should distance himself from him immediately. However, the old man responds that Leon would find it suspicious if he suddenly did that. Approaching Leon, he says that it was a pleasure to meet him and that he was well known even in the most distant lands. Amidst that situation, the old man thinks that he couldn't shake Leon's hand because he would probably sense his mana if he did. Hearing what the man had said, Leon gives a smile, saying that he seemed to know his place very well. The old man, meanwhile, wonders if Leon was satisfied and wanted to know if he had approved of his behavior. Even so, he should leave that place because he was sure Leon would agree that it was the best thing to do. However, the entity says that it was not the best thing to do because he had no choice but to enter that portal. Sometime later, the scene cuts to Han, who was outside that place, feeling frustrated because His Majesty was not allowing women on board. Looking ahead, she is surprised as she encounters the hunter Daesung and immediately approaches him to talk, asking why he was doing that job when it was something the association should be handling. However, Daesung replies that he should help as well. Han says that he was now a novice knight and was sure that His Majesty wouldn't have him performing inferior tasks like that. However, Daesung says that it wasn't a big deal, and that he felt like he was being treated too well just because he was able to carry that hammer. Han responds that it wasn't just any hammer, and that she hadn't even been able to move it a millimeter. More than 1,000 people had tried to lift that hammer, and he was the only one who had succeeded. Because of that, he was chosen by the goddess. But a man responds that it was impossible. Hearing what the man had said, Ham replies that she bets Leon would say he was a mere commoner, daring to question the decision of a king. Furthermore, he was undermining the judgment of the goddess, so she didn't understand why they were questioning everything instead of working hard on their own bodies. After all, in her time, they worked without even sleeping. While Ham was saying all that, the protagonist was standing right behind her and an awkward silence ensues. Surprised, Han asks if Leon was behind her by any chance, and at that moment, he grabs the girl, saying that it was insolence, asking how she dared to mock and imitate the behavior of a king. Han quickly apologizes, and at that moment, the protagonist calms down, saying that it was ridiculous that she had been blessed. Confused, Han asks when it happened, and Leon responds that she had been blessed by the divinity of the sea and waves, because the goddess Palma had decided to turn her into a saint. For that reason, she would be joining him in the attack on the portal. Han, meanwhile, is confused, thinking that something felt off because the protagonist had that strange expression. And then it finally dawns on her. Leon had said that she was now a saint. Without wasting time, they tie Han up with a rope, and the black-haired man, noticing this, asks how they could treat a saint that way. Then he recognizes that it was Han. Leon then says that having a woman on board brings bad luck, but there was a way to dispel the bad omen, and to solve the whole problem. All they needed was a figurehead. Han says that she had agreed, but this was not what she expected. She then starts calling for her brother for help, but he simply responds that he was sorry because he wasn't going to help her. Then they start taking Han onto the ship, placing her at the top of that place, where she begins observing the sea while another soldier gives the signal to depart. Without wasting time, the ship sets sail toward its destination. Time passes again, and a storm begins to form over the sea. Han, screaming like crazy, says that a hurricane was approaching, and that was Hurricane Nabi, begging incessantly for someone to help her. However, the protagonist tells her to just shut up because she was scaring the fish. Frustrated, he says that it seemed like all the fish were fleeing, and Han says that it was impossible for fish to be gathering around a ship like that. But at that moment, something suddenly bites the fishing line, and surprisingly, a fish appears. Without wasting time, Leon grabs it, saying they should prepare what he had mentioned earlier. Sometime later, that fish is placed on a kind of table. Then Leon kneels before another fish, beginning to pray to the master of the sea, asking her to appear before them and set her feet upon her domain. At that moment, that fish begins to glow and a beam of light spreads throughout the ship. The people on board wonder what it was and whether they had ever seen anything like it before, because if it was a wave, they had never seen one like this. And then, a giant wave covers the entire ship. However, that was apparently the goddess of the sea saying that Leon was her beloved protector of the temple. Leon says that her name was Palma, the divinity of the sea and the waves. And in a matter of seconds, that goddess surprisingly transformed into a shark made of water, saying that this sea was very sensitive, and as Plu had mentioned, she could not feel the presence of any divinities in that land. Frustrated, she notices that the ship didn't even have sails, saying that none of them understood the majesty of the sea. However, the protagonist responds that there was nothing to be done because that world had not yet received the teachings of the sea, imploring her to have mercy on them and watch over them all. But the goddess starts laughing, saying that she had no reason to watch over someone who had no faith in her, and that only through fear and respect would they receive her grace. Changing the subject, Leon asks why she had chosen that girl to be her saint. The goddess responds that she had barely managed to convince the god Pitos, but it was definitely worth it because that girl had a good vessel. However, not as good as the protagonist, as he could carry all the divinities within him. Leon says that he had felt that her fate was full of misfortune, and it seemed he was right. The goddess responds that this was a blessing, asking why he thought it was a misfortune. Leon says that the attention of the gods could be a poison for a human who lacked faith, and the goddess responds that she believed he would take care of that. Right after, the goddess approaches Han, saying that from that day on, she was her new saint, and that she would grant her authority over the waves and the blessing of water, so she should accept it with joy and spread her teachings. Without hesitation, Han accepts, asking if they were going to untie her now. Hearing that, the goddess looks confused and then says that with her saint as a sacrifice, no wave would strike their ship. At that moment, the rain starts getting stronger, and the other man says that the hurricane is approaching. Moreover, the waves were over 10 meters high, so they should get inside the ship. However, unfortunately, they left Han alone in that spot, still tied up. Leon, observing the situation, says that she did not have enough faith. However, the goddess liked her and seemed willing to ignore her lack of faith. Even so, she should calm down and surrender herself to the hands of great nature, because after that, nature would embrace her. Right after, Han says that she wanted to live, and Leon questions whether she didn't find it strange, because even with such a hurricane, no wave was hitting her. Observing the situation, Han is surprised, thinking that now that she had stopped to reflect, the ship wasn't even rocking, and the waves simply disappeared as they approached the ship. Leon says that the goddess Palma was using her as a mediator to pacify all the waves. No one believed in her, so she had no choice but to use the saint as her intermediary. Han, in turn, thinks that the protagonist hadn't tied her up there just out of misogyny, and at that moment, the ropes are released. However, Han is suddenly thrown into the air, and the waves seemingly return. Begging for forgiveness, Han says she was sorry because she wanted to stay tied up. Moreover, she hated that situation. Shortly after, the ship seemed to be nearing their destination. The other man thinks that he thought the ship was going to capsize, but thankfully, they were following the other one. The entity says that Leon used the authority of the sea and the waves, and because of that, the ship blessed by that divinity would always witness a great catch and never be sunk by storms. Right after, the ship's captain starts speaking, saying that he had bad news, because a mercenary-class ship had capsized due to the hurricane and was currently being rescued. The old man says that they had lost a third of their forces even before reaching the portal, but the entity responds that he only needed to focus on the portal because it was the only thing that mattered. The people near the portal say that they would proceed with the mission, so they would send the attack team in boats. Thus, they would enter the portal immediately, initiating the mission with the protagonist apparently leading the way, and the other man says that the Pantheon Guild would go in first. Meanwhile, Han was still tied up. Looking ahead, Han seems surprised, and out of nowhere that gigantic hurricane appears, launching several people toward it. Sometime later, Han was lying on a beach. Then she starts drinking seawater and at that moment wakes up, immediately spitting it out. Thinking that before all of them had been swallowed by that tornado, she wanted to know where they were. However, when she looks to the side, she finds her group, asking everyone to get up. But most of them were not in the best condition, their heads aching after being sucked into that tornado. Han wonders if these were all the people who remained. Moreover, she couldn't see His Majesty and wondered where the robot and the other hunters were. Right after, that goddess appears, asking her to calm down because everyone was safe. Hearing that voice, Han starts looking around to find where it was coming from, and the goddess tells her to look below her. Realizing that the goddess had now turned into a turtle, having sent a kind of messenger to help her, Han says that she was very small, and the goddess becomes irritated, saying that she should respect a divine creature. A flashback appears in her mind. Han asks if the goddess had said that everyone was safe, and if she knew what happened. The goddess says that she had taken them to a safe island with the authority of the waves, but was unable to prevent Han from being separated from the others. That body was very convenient for movement, so the girl should lend her shoulder. Then Han looks to the side. The group instantly goes on high alert as several monsters start approaching them. Surprised, Han thinks that they hadn't even had the chance to recover, and since there was no other option, she would have to get rid of all those monsters. But at that moment, the magic on her blade disappears. Han asks if a saint blessed by the ocean and the waves was actually using fire, and that if she couldn't use fire, she didn't want to be her saint. Right after, the goddess asked to be placed on the ground, and meanwhile, those monsters were still approaching the group. Sometime later, all of those monsters had been defeated. The entity says that things had gotten out of control at first, but everything was fine now that they were away from that monster. So they should leave the rest of the American hunters there to build a shelter because they had work to do. That man looks at a crab, asking it to rise, and the creature immediately follows his command, standing up. Without wasting time, the man asks the crab to guide him to the stone statue. Sometime later, the man asks if that was the stone statue they had talked about before. The entity responds that it was and that he needed to find more of them. At that moment, the old man begins chanting a spell, but a voice tells him to wait. It is revealed that it was the red-haired man asking if the master of the magic tower knew what that was. Noticing the man is pleased that they were safe, saying that he was sure they had seen the mission too and should destroy those things. The current mission was to investigate the island and destroy that statue. The red-haired man thinks that it was the portal of Jeju Island and that the objective of that portal was to defeat Javrik. But there was more to it, and in other words, they didn't know much about those missions, saying that there was still not enough information available for him in that portal, explaining that the statue was probably a trap, and because of that, they should first learn more about it. The old man whispers that it made sense, and the entity suggests retreating for now because they were no match for all those people. With a smile on his face, the old man says that it makes sense, and he was impressed by his wisdom. And because of that, they should return to the beach, as the members of the Maverick Guild were waiting there. The scene then cuts to the beach, where Han had finally defeated all those monsters, asking if no one was hurt, and the black-haired man responds that everyone was safe. Han, in turn, starts checking with the others to see if they were okay as well. Right after, another soldier approaches the girl, saying that they could no longer sense His Majesty's aura. Han says that this was terrible because his buffs were really good, but the young man responds that this wasn't the problem. They had been testing His Majesty's aura earlier to determine its range, and the demonic resentment buff extended for about 30 kilometers. But now none of them were under its effect. Han thinks that this meant the island seemed to be less than 30 kilometers in both length and width, so it was very likely that His Majesty was not on any of those islands. Right after, the goddess says that her connection with him also seemed to have been cut off. Observing the situation, the girl responds that this was terrible because they couldn't even find the rest of the group. She then starts looking at the sea, wondering where the protagonist was. The scene then cuts to the ocean floor where an entire capital city seemed to be submerged. The protagonist appeared to be in that place, and a voice said that it was finally time to wake up from his long slumber, because feasting only with the fish for 5 centuries had made him sick and tired of seafood. So he was curious to know what the Night of the Gods would taste like. Right after, the scene cuts to Yep, who seemed to be unconscious but suddenly wakes up, realizing that there were several crabs surrounding him. The robot, meanwhile, seemed confused, because those creatures were making the same sounds that he emitted. Then he starts making some signals to see if they would obey his commands, and apparently, they were doing the same. The scene cuts to another location, where Ham's group was still trying to communicate with the protagonist. The other girl says she didn't expect the trainees and soldiers to go missing. Looking back, Ham thanks the man for his help earlier. The man in turn greets the Korean hunters, saying that his identifier name was Mistral and that he was part of the Maverick Guild. Hearing that name, Han says it sounded familiar and that his real name was Alan Taylor, the ranks as hunter who was 6th place in the Maverick Guild. The man responds that having an identifier name made no sense if they were just going to call him by his real name. Han then quickly apologizes, saying that it was better to use his identifier and that she didn't know he was part of the invasion team. The man asks if she wasn't notified because he had really left in a hurry. Besides, it seemed that the guild master had been separated from them, and in that case, they only needed to find the missing people. Han says that they had been blessed by the god of the sea, and that if His Majesty wanted to find them, he would have already done so long ago. Amidst that situation, the man seems confused, asking what they were talking about. Right after, a system notification appears, informing them that the first wave was beginning. Surprised, Han asks if they would have to defeat another wave of monsters, and the other man responds that if they kept talking, they would have to deal with it first. The system warns that the first wave of monsters was approaching and that the remaining time was 3 hours. At that moment, creatures start emerging from the ocean, and it was likely going to be a massive challenge for the hunters. Then a giant octopus begins charging toward them. Without wasting time, Han takes her defensive stance and the shield bearers advance to defend the front line. The man, surprised, thinks that they were now without buffs and that since they didn't have His Majesty, they were in trouble. And right after, that defense is easily broken. Han asks if they were okay, but the man responds that they should just keep fighting. The girl thinks that if only she could use fire-type abilities, things would be much easier. At that moment, a group of lizard monsters charges at her, but she swiftly defeats them. Han, invoking her goddess, asks if she wasn't supposed to have some kind of water ability or something like that. But the goddess responds that she watched too much anime, and the frustrated girl replies that the goddess seemed more like an anime character than she did. At that moment, a monster appears behind Han, but a hunter helps her, telling her to keep going but to stay focused. At that moment, Han seems to notice something, and when she looks around, it is revealed that the man had already defeated all the monsters, saying that they weren't that strong. The other girl, surprised, says that he was really strong and that, as expected, he was part of America's top hunter guild. Taylor says that they would get rid of the remaining monsters as well since there weren't many left. Time then passes and the third wave is finally completed. As a result, all the monsters have been defeated. So the video ends here. If you don't want to miss the next part, activate the notification bell, and see you next time on Tob's channel.